Welcome back to Harry's Cosmos. Today's adventure: what if Harry and Hermione inherited the lost magic of the ancient House of Black? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The night the house woke, the hospital wing smelled of Dittany and lake water. Harry lay on top of his blankets because lying under them felt like agreeing to stay, and he had no intention of staying. 3 beds down, Ron slept with his bandaged leg propped on 2 pillows, mouth open, one hand still curled as though holding a rat that was no longer anywhere in the castle. Hermione wasn't sleeping either. He could tell by the quality of her stillness. Sleeping people were loose. Hermione lay like a book placed carefully on a shelf, spine straight, waiting to be opened. "They're going to do it at midnight," Harry said to the ceiling. "Macnair had the axe with him at dinner. He kept touching the handle. I know." Her voice came quiet across the dark ward. "I counted the floors between here and the entrance hall. If we ran, we'd never make it before the doors opened." Dumbledore came up the ward without hurry, and that was the thing about him Harry had never quite got used to. The man was never in a hurry, even when other people's lives were being decided by the minute. The candlelight found the silver in his beard and made small moons of his spectacles. "Sirius Black," Dumbledore said without preamble, "is being held in Professor Flitwick's office on the 7th floor. 13th window from the right of the West Tower. The Ministry's representative arrives with the Dementors at midnight to perform the kiss." Harry sat up so fast the bed frame cracked against the wall. "You believe us, you believe him, then tell them, tell Fudge, I have no proof." The word of 2 13-year-olds and a convicted werewolf against the Ministers need to be seen doing something. Dumbledore's gaze moved to Hermione and rested there with a weight Harry didn't understand. "What we need is more time." "Oh," said Hermione, and then in a completely different voice, "Oh, 3 turns should do it, I think. Miss Granger, you know the law, you know what is at stake." He paused at the doors, one hand on the iron ring, and looked back at them both. "If you succeed, more than one innocent life may be spared tonight. Good luck." The doors closed. Hermione was already out of bed, pulling a fine gold chain from under her collar. A tiny hourglass spun and glittered at the end of it. "Come here," she said quickly. "What is that?" "It's how I've been getting to my classes all year. Professor McGonagall made me swear not to tell anyone. It's called a time turner, and if you ask me a single question in the next 10 seconds, I'll leave without you." She threw the chain over his head as well, so that they stood collared together like 2 horses in one harness, her knuckles at his breastbone, her breath even and quick. "3 turns, don't move. Whatever you see, don't cry out." She turned the hourglass over once, twice, 3 times. The ward dissolved. Sound came apart into ribbons and ran backwards past his ears. The moon peeled off the windows. A flock of hours went by in reverse, beating like wings. Then his shoes struck stone, and they were standing in the entrance hall, and the light through the doors was the deep gold of early evening. Hermione lifted the chain off him and checked the hourglass against her watch. 7:30. "We were going down to Hagrid's at 8, which means we're about to walk out of that door. We can't be seen, Harry, not by anyone, and especially not by ourselves." He got most of the theory in one go because the rest of it didn't matter. Buckbeak, that's what he meant. More than one innocent life. The execution was signed for after dark, and Macnair came up to the castle to fetch the Dementors before it. She was working it through aloud the way she always did, laying the pieces edge to edge until they stopped being pieces. "If Buckbeak simply is there when they come out of Hagrid, they'll assume he slipped his rope. Nobody will blame Hagrid for a knot. Nobody will blame us if nobody sees us. And then Sirius," she stopped herself. "One thing at a time, cupboard." They spent the next hour folded in with the mops, taking turns at the crack in the door, and Harry learned something about her. He filed nowhere at all because there was no time. She could be perfectly still when it counted, stiller than he could, and she did it by holding onto his sleeve. Not tightly, just 2 fingers, the way you'd keep a place in a book. When their own backs had gone down the lawn and into Hagrid's hut, they went from tree to tree along the edge of the forest, and the pumpkin patch received them in its long shadows. Buckbeak was tethered by the fence, orange eyes on the horizon, restless, tearing at the ground with talons the length of Harry's forearm, the bow first. Harry stepped out into the open and bent his back, keeping his gaze on those eyes, and the world narrowed to the 2 of them, boy and beast, while inside the hut a teacup shattered and Hermione's own voice, an hour younger, cried out over the rat in Ron's hands. Buckbeak's knees hit the earth in front of him. "Good," Harry breathed, working at the knot. "Good, come on, they're coming out," Hermione hissed from the fence. "Harry, the back door now." The rope came free. Buckbeak, being a hippogriff, chose that moment to decide the dead ferrets hanging by Hagrid's door were worth dying for, and Harry put his whole weight against the halter, boots dragging furrows, until Hermione got her hands under the beak and pulled with him, and the 3 of them lurched into the trees like one drunken animal as footsteps and voices rounded the side of the hut. They stood in the dark of the forest, both of them holding the rope, shoulders jammed together, while 20 feet away the Minister for Magic said, "Extraordinary, extraordinary, he must have pulled the peg himself." Macnair's voice came after, low and cheated. He swung his axe into the fence in temper. The crack of it went through the trees like something breaking in a body. Beside Harry, Hermione flinched, and her hand found the rope directly above his so that their fingers overlapped on the rough hemp, and neither of them moved them apart. "Committee's satisfied," Fudge was saying. "Well, Hagrid, perhaps a drink. All's well that ends." Buckbeak's breath went warm over both their heads. Above the black lace of the branches, the first stars were coming out, and Harry noticed, without knowing why he noticed, that Hermione was looking up at them too. "Now, Sirius," she said. They worked their way around the forest's hem, with the hippogriff walking behind them like an enormous mistrustful dog, and the castle turned its lit windows slowly past them, and the hours did what the hours had already done. They watched from the trees. The whooping willow froze, their own small figures went down into the earth beneath it. Later, the moon came up over the lake, and the screaming started, and Harry stood with the rope biting his palm while a wolf's voice unstitched the night, and could do nothing because he had already done it. The worst part came at the water. He watched himself across the lake, a distant crumpling figure among 100 sliding black shapes, and the cold reached even here, even to the trees, frost feathering the ferns at his feet. He waited for his father. The stag came from the wrong shore. It came from his own hands. He didn't remember deciding to run out onto the bank. He remembered the word and the weight of every good thing he had ever been given gathered behind it, and the silver animal pouring off his wand and driving the cold before it like a tide going out. Afterwards, Hermione stood next to him at the water's edge, and neither of them said anything for a while. "You conjured that," she said finally, "a corporeal patroness at 13 against 100 of them." "I knew I could do it," he heard how it sounded and shrugged, "because I'd already seen me do it. That's stupid, isn't it? It's the only spell I've ever heard of that runs on a happy memory." She looked out at the settling water, the drowned moon reassembling itself. "I wonder what memory it was." He didn't answer because the honest answer was tonight, and he didn't have anywhere to put that yet. Flitwick's office was 13 windows from the right of the west tower, and Buckbeak flew as though he'd been waiting all year for a reason. Wind roared in Harry's ears, Hermione's arms locked around his waist, the castle wheeled beneath them, all its stones suddenly small. She hated flying. She had climbed up behind him anyway before he could offer her the choice of staying, and when he glanced back at her she had simply said, "Both of us." He'll want to thank both of us, which was so unlike a reason and so exactly like her that he'd laughed into the wind. Sirius sat against the wall of the locked office with his wrists on his knees, and when the window latch burst under Hermione's charm, his head came up like a dog hearing its name. There was no time for the reunion either of them was owed. Harry hauled him over the sill. Sirius took one look at the hippogriff standing on air and let out a bark that was half laugh, half sob, and then they were three on the beast's back, too many Buckbeak laboring, the tower falling away behind them. They put down on the ramparts of the west tower, the whole night country spread out below, the lake a sheet of beaten silver, the forest rolling black to the hills, the lit train at Hogsmeade Station breathing steam. "Go," Harry said, before they checked the office. "Go." Sirius didn't go. He slid down from Buckbeak's back and stood facing the two of them, gaunt in the starlight, prison still hanging on his frame like borrowed clothes, and something in his face had gone very old and very formal, and it stopped both of them where they stood. 12 years, Sirius said. "I was a debt nobody paid. Tonight 2 children paid it." He looked from Harry to Hermione and back, and the wind moved his ruined hair. "My family had words for this. I swore I'd never use a single thing they taught me. I find I want to use this." He took Harry's right hand and Hermione's left and joined them palm to palm between his own 2 hands, so that the 3 of them made a knot of fingers in the cold air, and he spoke. The words were not Latin. They were older, and they did not travel to the ear the way sound travels. They arrived the way cold arrives, or nightfall, everywhere at once and without footsteps. Harry caught the shapes of them and lost them in the same moment, all but a few that burned where they landed, blood and deed and house and remember. The stars leaned closer. That was the only way he could ever describe it afterwards, and he never described it to anyone but her. The great wheel of them stood still over the tower, and every one of them was suddenly a named thing, a watching thing, ranked in courts and families the way lights in windows are, and down the long cold between them came an attention, patient and total, the regard of something that had been asleep with its eyes open for 100 years. The lake below stopped being a mirror of the sky. Deep in its silver stood the reflection of a tree that grew on no shore, black-limbed, vast, hung with leaves of hammered starlight, its roots going down past the bottom of the water into some further night, and on its highest branch a raven turned its head. Iron and snow. The taste filled Harry's mouth, sharp as a struck bell, and through their joined palms he felt a pulse that belonged to neither of them go looking up both their arms, unhurried, like a ledger-keeper running a finger down a column and find what it was looking for and underline it twice. The house remembers its debts. Nobody had said it aloud. It was simply, suddenly, a thing that had been said. Then the stars were only stars, and the lake was only water, and Sirius was swaying on his feet with his teeth chattering, looking down at his own hands in raw astonishment. "That," he said, "was not supposed to do anything. It's a courtesy. It's what you say at funerals and weddings. It hasn't done anything in—" He shook himself all over, dog fashion. "Merlin's teeth, what are you two? You're asking us." Harry's voice came out scraped. His palm still held the print of Hermione's, warm against the cold, and under the warmth something rang on, faint and silver like a glass touched an hour ago. "You did it." I said the words. "The words don't listen to me. They haven't listened to anyone since my great-grandfather's day." Sirius looked at the two of them a moment longer, joined hand to hand on a tower in the dark, and whatever he saw made him step back and bow his head briefly, the way Harry had bowed to Buckbeak. "I'll write to you, that's a promise from Padfoot, not from what just happened. Both of you look after each other. Apparently you've already started." He swung up onto the hippogriff. Buckbeak opened wings like the night unfolding, and man and beast dropped from the ramparts, caught the air, and beat away west, one shadow across the moon, then a speck, then sky. The clock in the courtyard below began to strike. Hermione grabbed his wrist, and her fingers found the exact place the strange pulse had gone in, and they ran. They made the hospital wing corridor as the last stroke faded, slipped through the doors. Dumbledore was in the act of closing and stood gasping under his gaze. He looked at them for a long moment over his spectacles. "Well," he said. "He's gone," Harry managed. "Both of them gone. And no one saw you." "No one, sir," said Hermione. Dumbledore studied them, and Harry watched the survey happen. Hair, faces, hands, and there the pale eyes stopped. Harry became aware that he and Hermione were standing closer than two people usually stood, and that his right hand and her left hung side by side, and that something about them was being read. "Curious," Dumbledore said softly to himself, in the tone of a man finding an entry in a familiar account book that he did not remember writing. Then the twinkle came back up like a lamp being lit, warm and deliberate. "To bed, both of you, before Madame Pomfrey adds me to her ward. You have done a very great thing tonight, greater, perhaps, than you know." In bed, in the dark, Harry lay with his right hand open on the blanket. The silver ringing had sunk down under his skin into the bone, where it did not fade so much as settle, the way a coin settles into the silt of a deep well and is not gone, only keeping. Across the ward, cloth rustled. "Harry," Hermione's whisper, "can you still feel it?" He didn't ask what. "Yeah." A pause, the length of a held breath. "Good," she said. "I'd hate to be imagining it alone." He fell asleep smiling at the ceiling, and the house, patient as winter, followed him down. That night, for the first of many nights, they dreamed the same dream. There was a tree. It stood in a country that had no sun and needed none, because the leaves gave light, thousands upon thousands of them, thin as beaten foil, silver as the inside of a bell, and the light they gave was the light of a winter sky an hour after sunset, blue-silver, clean, cold, without cruelty. The trunk was black. Not painted black, not burnt black, but black the way deep water is black, a color you could fall into, and the bark was grained with fine lines of silver that moved when he wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves, spelling and unspelling. Roots the size of fallen towers went out across the dark ground, and between two of them there was a door. The door was made of stars. Not decorated with stars, made of them, hung in a doorframe of black wood, a small, tidy constellation arranged in a shape that was almost a tree itself, and it was shut. Hermione was there. In the dream this was not surprising. In the dream it would have been surprising if she were not. She stood at his right side with her head tipped back, doing to the tree exactly what she did to a new book, reading it from the top down, and her voice when it came was a dream voice, arriving without sound the way the words on the tower had. "Look at the leaves," she said. "Everyone has a name on it." He looked. She was right. Fine dark script ran along the vein of every silver leaf, too far up to read, name after name after name, a whole nation of names, and here and there among the living silver hung a leaf gone black and curled, its name eaten by tarnish. On the lowest branch, so near he could have touched it, one leaf shone brighter than the rest, new minted, its letters still wet. Beside it, on the same twig, grew a second. The raven turned its head. Its eye was a small door of stars. "Not yet," said the raven, in a voice like a key turning, and the dream closed gently over them both like water. Harry woke at dawn with the taste of iron and snow on his tongue, and his right hand aching pleasantly like a hand that had done a day's honest work. Across the ward, Hermione was sitting bolt upright in bed, hair enormous, staring at him. "A tree," she said, "with a door in it." "Harry, there were two leaves on the low branch, two new ones, together." Ron slept on, arm over his face. Madame Pomfrey's office door was shut. The morning light came in level and gold and turned the dust to slow constellations, and the two of them sat in their separate beds and looked at each other across a distance that no longer felt like a distance at all. "All right," Hermione said in her marshalling voice, the one she used on essays and emergencies alike. "Facts first. 1. Sirius said the rite was a courtesy dead for generations. 2. It wasn't dead. 3. Whatever answered it looked at both of us. Not just you, and don't make that face. I felt it read me, Harry, like a librarian checking whether a book had been shelved wrong. 4. Now we're having each other's dreams." She ticked them off on her fingers, and her eyes had the shine they got when a problem was rich enough to be worth the trouble. "Conclusion, something old belonging to the House of Black has taken an interest in us, and we know almost nothing about it, and the library opens at 8. It's the last week of term. Yes. Imagine if we'd only had a day. The library received them the way it always received Hermione, as a citizen returning home, and received Harry the way it received Harry on sufferance. She went at the genealogies first, Nature's Nobility, a wheezing, self-important volume that gave the House of Black 11 pages of begats and hardly a word of substance. Towger's Purr, the family motto, a crest with 3 ravens. A tree of names that made Hermione go still and pull the candle closer, because the engraved tree in the book was a poor woodcut cousin of the tree they had both stood under in their sleep. Doria Black, she read, her finger stopping on a lower branch, married Charles Potter, 1 son. She looked up. Harry, you're on the tree. Your grandmother was a Black. Everyone's related to everyone, Harry said, because Ron had told him that once. But he leaned in over her shoulder, and the woodcut names sat there, plain ink, Doria to Charles, Charles to a son unnamed, and something in his chest leaned in with him. It was while his sleeve brushed the page that the book misbehaved. Between the printed lines, faint as watermarks, other lines surfaced. Handwriting. Cramped, sloped, private handwriting, rising up through the paper the way things rise through clear water when you stop disturbing the surface, and Hermione made a sound like a kettle deciding against boiling and grabbed his wrist and held his arm where it was. Don't move. Marginalia. Hidden marginalia, someone's warded notes, they're keyed to something and it's you. Don't move. Her nose was an inch from the page. Tree the ministry sees is the tree we show the ministry, she read, slow, the way you read a language you learned from books. The true tree keeps itself. Ask the leaves, not the ledgers. What the blood forgets, the house remembers. She sat back and stared at him. That last part, word for word what we heard on the tower. Who wrote it? She turned the book over, checked the plate inside the cover, and her mouth did something complicated. Property of the Hogwarts Library since 1897. Donated from the personal collection of Phineas Nigellus Black. A breath. Headmaster, 1890-something. He's on the tree too. Harry, his portrait hangs in Dumbledore's office. Around them the library went on rustling its ordinary morning rustle. Harry took his hand slowly off the page, and the handwriting sank away like a fish returning to depth, and the book was only a book. We tell no one, he said, obviously. But she said it gently, and her hand was still on his wrist, and what she meant was not obviously but agreed, the 2 of us, and he heard it the way he was apparently going to be hearing her from now on, twice. Once with his ears and once somewhere behind the breastbone where the coin lay in the silt and rang. The castle spent that last week showing him what it had apparently always been muttering under its breath. He'd never noticed before that the stones had a sound. It wasn't hearing, quite. Passing down a corridor he'd walked 400 times, he now caught the long, bone-deep hum of old wards doing their patient work, warp and weft, the same satisfaction a wall might feel at still being plumb after 7 centuries. Most of the castle sang low and content. The 3rd-floor corridor on the east side did not. It snarled, quietly, a thread of curse work left over from some old unpleasantness, fretting at the masonry like a splinter under a nail, and had apparently been snarling for decades with the whole school walking past deaf. He stopped. Peeves was juggling inkwells at the far end. Nobody else was there. Not knowing in the least what he was doing, only that it was the same motion as gentling a hippogriff, Harry laid his palm flat on the cold stone and thought, unhurried, the way the ledger pulse had been unhurried. All right, enough, you're ours. The snarl went out of the wall like a knot coming undone under warm water. The stones settled into the same contented hum as their neighbors, and somewhere under his hand, one silver thread of the castle's vast weave tucked itself back into place. Peeves dropped all 6 inkwells at once and fled through the ceiling without a single rude word, which Ron, hearing about it later, flatly refused to believe. Harry stood looking at his own hand on the wall. Then he went and found Hermione, who was 3 floors up failing to concentrate on arithmancy revision, and she listened to the whole thing with her quill forgotten and leaking on her notes. You repaired a ward, she said, by touching it. People do doctorates on curse breaking, there are goblin firms, there's a ministry office, and you patted it like a dog. It wanted patting. That sentence is going to keep me awake. She looked down at the ink spreading through her revision, blotted it without real attention, and when she spoke again her voice had gone quieter, the marshalling put away. On the tower, when it looked at us, it didn't feel dark. Everyone says that family was dark, the books say it, Ron says it, and I keep waiting to feel something wrong in this, and instead it feels like, she hunted for it, and for once the word came from somewhere other than a book, like being counted. I've never been counted before, not like that. Harry thought of the survey the thing had made of him, the finger down the column, the double underline. His whole life people had counted him wrongly, the Dursleys counting him as a burden, the wizarding world counting him as a scar in a story. The attention on the tower had counted something else, something that had nothing to do with Voldemort, and had found the account good. Yeah, he said, which between them was becoming a whole language. The leaving feast came and went in a wash of gold plates and Gryffindor red. Dumbledore's end-of-year speech was warm and grave and gave away nothing, but twice Harry looked up from his plate to find the pale blue gaze already on him, thoughtful, arriving from a long way off, and twice it moved on smoothly to rest on Hermione a moment before returning to the hall at large. He was being observed. He'd spent 3 years being observed and had only just this week grown the sense that let him feel it happening, and he understood with a small, cold clarity that the sense was new but the observation was not. He watched us all through the feast, Hermione murmured on the platform at Hogsmeade in the crush and shriek of loading trunks. Interval of roughly 4 minutes. He's not suspicious of something we did. He's monitoring something he already knows about. The rite, or us. Or he saw the same thing on our hands that the ledger underlined. The train exhaled steam over them both. I hate not knowing which. They found a compartment with Ron, and for an hour it was exactly what it had always been. Exploding snap, the trolley, Ron's plans for the Quidditch World Cup laid out with the reverence other people saved for religion. Harry let it wrap around him, the ordinary warmth of it. Then Ron went to find Neville and a lost toad, out of the old habit of first year, and the compartment door clicked shut, and Hermione pulled out a scroll of her own notes and spread them on her knees, and the summer's real work began there on a moving train before summer had even started. 3 questions, she said. Everything we don't know sorts into 3 questions. 1. What exactly did the rite do to us? Is it finished or still going, and can it be undone? She held up a hand before he could speak. I'm not saying we undo it. I'm saying any responsible person establishes the exits before exploring the building. 2. Why both of us. The blood connection explains you. Doria Black explains you. Nothing explains me, and things that happen for no reason frighten me more than things that happen for bad ones. 3. She tapped the last line of her notes where she had written a single word and boxed it. Sirius. He performed a rite he believed was empty, and it wasn't, and the fact that it answered him means the magic recognizes him. He's the last one it recognizes. Whatever we've been pulled into, he's the only living person who was raised inside it. He said he'd write. He'll do better than write. He's a Black who's been given proof that 2 children are carrying his family's magic around in their hands. If the house takes it seriously, so will he. The train ran south through the long evening. Somewhere past Doncaster, a shadow slid along the corridor window, and both of them looked up at the same instant before it appeared. A raven riding the train slipstream a foot from the glass, unbothered, its head turned so that one eye could conduct an inspection. It held there for a quarter of a mile, wings hardly working while neither of them moved. Then it tilted, dropped a single black feather that plastered itself flat to the window, and peeled away north. The feather stayed pressed to the glass by the wind for the rest of the journey, like a signature holding a page down. That, said Hermione at last, was not a crow. King's Cross came in its own time, iron and echo and the smell of cities. Through the barrier the Dursleys stood at their usual distance from everything, Uncle Vernon's mustache already bristling at the trolley, the owl, the whole embarrassing fact of Harry, and for once Harry looked at them and felt the summer ahead of him weigh nothing at all, because it wasn't going to be the same summer. He didn't yet know how. He only knew what the coin under his skin knew. Accounts had been opened. Hermione hugged him quickly at the barrier, a school friend's hug for the audience of parents, and under it she pressed a torn corner of parchment into his hand. Her telephone number, which he already had, and beneath it one line in her fierce small writing. First one to learn anything writes the same night. That's a right too now. 1 week, she said. If nothing's happened in 1 week, I'll have worked through the Black bibliography. I cop it out and we'll make our own thing happen. Nothing needed a week. On the 5th morning of the holidays, over a breakfast he had cooked and was not eating, while Uncle Vernon barricaded himself behind the Daily Mail and Dudley watched television with the devotion of a monk at his office, something knocked at the kitchen window with the firm, doubled rap of a knuckle that expects to be answered. A raven stood on the sill. Not a raven, the raven, or one of the same silent company, its feathers holding that same blue-black depth the dream tree's trunk had held, and in its beak was an envelope of heavy cream parchment that it laid on the sill with the care of a butler presenting a card, before stepping back exactly 1 pace to wait. Uncle Vernon lowered the paper an inch. If that's another ruddy owl, it's not an owl, Harry said, already at the window. The envelope was addressed in ink that was not black but the darkest possible silver, and it did not carry his aunt's address or his cupboard's old cruel address or anything the postman could have read without disquiet. It said, Heir Harry James Potter of the blood of Black, the house is waking, Gringotts at your earliest convenience. Below the words, stamped in wax the color of a winter night, 3 ravens spread their wings around a single silver star, and the seal was still faintly cold to the touch, the cold of a thing pressed there not by a warm hand but by a very old one. The telephone rang in the hall. Uncle Vernon heaved up to answer it, growled, and held the receiver out at arm's length with 2 fingers like a man disposing of a dead mouse. For you, he said. Some girl. Harry took it. Down the line, breathless London traffic behind her voice, Hermione said, Harry, a bird just delivered a letter to our clinic, to my parents' dental clinic. It's addressed to Paper rustled. When she read it out, her voice did what his chest was doing. Hermione Jean Granger, daughter of the house by deed. The raven on the sill looked in through the glass at him, patient as winter. Mine says the house is waking, Harry said. Mine too. A pause, and then Hermione Granger, who checked every source twice and cited 3, said the most reckless sentence he'd ever heard from her, and said it happily. Don't you dare go to Gringotts without me." They talked for 11 minutes, until Uncle Vernon began making the throat noises that preceded eruption, and in 11 minutes Hermione had built the whole expedition. Her parents would drive Saturday, because her mother and father were not going to hand their daughter to a bank that wrote to children in silver ink without meeting it themselves. They would collect Harry from the end of Privet Drive at 9, because arriving at number 4 would cost them 20 minutes of Vernon Dursley that nobody would get back, and in the meantime neither of them would answer the letters, sign anything, or touch the seals again, because the seal had been cold, and cold seals, she had read somewhere, took impressions both ways. "You felt it too then," Harry said, "the cold, like a coin left on a windowsill in January." Down the line a page turned, she had notes going already. "Harry, one more thing, the raven that brought ours is still here, it's sitting on the surgery sign. My father offered it half a sausage roll and it looked at him the way McGonagall looks at Ron's homework." Her voice slid toward laughter and then didn't arrive there, landing somewhere more careful instead. "They're not delivering letters and leaving, are they? They're posted. We're being guarded." Harry looked at the raven on the kitchen sill, which had not moved in 10 minutes and gave every impression of being prepared not to move for 10 years. Past its shoulder lay Privet Drive's summer morning, sprinklers ticking, a car being washed, Mrs. Next Door policing her roses. The bird sat in the middle of all that ordinariness like one word of a different language left in a sentence. "Saturday," he said, 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock. And Harry, the pause had a shape he couldn't read over a telephone. "I keep thinking about what the raven in the dream said, not yet, which means there's a yet. Everything since the tower has been the same 3 words over and over in envelopes and feathers and marginalia, and the words are, get ready. The second letter came at dusk, not by raven." A ragged, cheerful, tropical thing of a bird sailed in over the fence while Harry was deadheading Aunt Petunia's roses under orders, dropped a much-traveled envelope into the wheelbarrow, and went to argue with the bird bath. Inside were 2 sheets. The first was unmistakably Sirius, the handwriting rushing downhill, the ink changing halfway through where he'd found a better quill. "Harry safe, warm, somewhere the ministry's maps go embarrassed and vague. Buckbeak sends his regards, by which I mean he ate a gull in your honor. Now the real business, and I'll say it plainly because you've earned plain speaking. What happened on the tower has been happening ever since. I felt it the whole flight south, like standing in a house where room by room someone is going ahead of you lighting fires that have been cold for a century. The family magic is waking, and it isn't waking for me. I'm the last Black and it knows my name, but a house doesn't wake for a caretaker. It wakes for heirs, that's you, and don't argue because it's also her, and she'll out-argue both of us. Blood brought you to the door, but blood is only how the house finds you. What it weighs is deed, and by deed the 2 of you pulled its last son out of the dark, together. It noticed the together. The old magic always noticed that above everything. It's the one thing about my family I never managed to hate. Gringotts will have written, go. The goblins keep the house's charter and they honor it above the ministry, older contract, better interest. Take her parents. The goblins respect a family that shows up. Sign nothing until the account manager has read you the charter aloud. That's your right, and watching a goblin discover you know your rights is one of life's pleasures. I can't come into the open, but there are ways to be present that don't require a body in a chair, and the goblins know all of them. Look after each other. I said that already. The house heard me the first time. Padfoot, the second sheet, was smaller, older, torn from something bound. On it, in a spikier and far more disciplined hand, was a list of 7 names of stars: Arcturus, Regulus, Bellatrix, Cassiopeia, Alpha, Cygnus, Vega. Beneath the names, Sirius had scrawled, "Found this in my jacket lining. Absolutely did not put it there. My family wrote everything that mattered in star names. It's a cipher and a tongue and a bloody filing system all at once, and I was too busy running away at 16 to learn it properly. She'll want it. Tell her the grammar hides in the order." Harry read the letter twice in the wheelbarrow's shadow, and the evening cooled around him, and the raven on the sill watched him do it. He wrote back at the little desk in the smallest bedroom, Hedwig supervising jealously from her cage, the raven supervising the whole arrangement from the windowsill outside, with the air of a senior official permitting a junior one to work. He wrote it plainly because Sirius had, that they'd go Saturday, that Hermione's parents were coming, that he would sign nothing unheard. He hesitated over the ending, feeling the weight of every letter he'd never had anyone to send, and finished. "The house here has never been mine. If yours wants us, it can have us." Harry, Hedwig took it into the last of the light, indignant at the distance and glad of the purpose, and Harry stood at the window a long time after she'd gone. Below him, Privet Drive put itself to bed. Televisions muttered behind curtains, the street lamps came up amber, number 4 ticked and settled around its occupants, and for the first time Harry heard the sound the Dursleys' house made, now that he had the ears the tower had given him. Hogwarts sang, this house didn't. There was one thin thread of ward over it, old and clever, and worked in something that felt like his mother's handwriting, stretched thin as spider silk across every sill and doorframe, humming a single mild note of protection with nobody home behind it. One thread was all. No hearth to it, no welcome, no weave. A rented spell over an empty room. Somebody had built a shelter out of his mother's dying and then never once come to see whether anything lived in it. The thought arrived cold and complete, and he stood with it in the dark, turning it over, hearing Hermione's voice sorted into questions. Who said it? Who renews it? Who decided this house, this street, these people? He knew the answer to at least the last of those. Curious, the old wizard had said in the hospital wing, reading their joined hands like an entry he didn't remember making. Harry was beginning to suspect the account book was full of entries the two of them had never been shown. Out on the sill, the raven turned its back to him, which he understood without knowing how, to mean it was on watch and he should sleep. He slept and the tree was waiting. This time he and Hermione stood together under the low branch, and the two new leaves hung just overhead, bright as struck coins, close enough now to read, his name on one in letters like fine frost, and on the other hers. The silver grain in the black bark moved in its slow rearrangements, and far up in the crown, among the quarts and generations of leaves, lights were coming on, few and far and patient, like windows in a great dark house where someone has finally, after 100 years, come home and begun going room to room. The raven dropped to the low branch and considered them, first with one eye, then the other, the way ravens audit the world twice. Saturday, it said, in a voice like a key turning. And the door of stars, which in every dream before had been shut, stood open by the width of one silver line. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The ravens led the Grangers drove a sensible green rover that smelled of mints and clean upholstery, and Harry spent the first 10 minutes of the journey answering Mrs. Granger's questions about school with heroic blandness. Hermione, beside him in the back seat with a folder of notes on her knees, kept catching his eye at each careful omission and awarding it a tiny nod, an examiner marking a paper. Correct, correct, technically correct. And this bank, Mr. Granger said at a red light, it wrote to our daughter about a house. Daughters don't usually inherit houses from families they've never met. In my experience, that's either a fairy tale or a scam, and I've read enough of both to know they end differently. Dad. It's a fair question, Harry said, and meant it. Mr. Granger's eyes found his in the mirror, reassessing. I don't understand it either, sir. That's mostly why we're going. The one thing I can tell you is that the family's magic doesn't do things by accident, and it picked her by name. By deed, Hermione corrected quietly to the folder. The wording matters. Everything with these people is wording. The raven rode the whole way on the roof of the car. Mrs. Granger had given up remarking on it somewhere around Watford. It was Gringotts that quieted the Grangers, the white crooked bulk of it, the burnished doors, the warning verse cut into silver, and the goblin guards whose eyes performed one flick of assessment, and then in unison dropped to a respectful angle Harry had never seen a goblin's eyes take before. Heir presumptive, said the elder guard to Harry. Daughter presumptive, to Hermione, whose folder clutch tightened. And to the Grangers, in a tone that had signed treaties, the family of the daughter honors this house by entering it. Gringotts extends floor right and hearth right for the duration of your business. Thank you, said Mrs. Granger faintly. We honor, that is, likewise. The alcove they were shown to was not the marble hall. A door behind a door, a corridor lit by lamps of white stone, a descent that was not by cart but by stair, broad and old, cut with a spiraling frieze of ravens so worn by hands that their wings had gone soft as shadow. The lower they went, the older the stone grew, in Harry's new sense, the one the tower had given him, woke by degrees around him. The bank's wards were nothing like Hogwarts's warm, patient hum. These sang in tight, fierce courses, layer under layer, alloyed like blade steel, and beneath them all, deeper than the deepest vault song, one long, slow note ran in the dark of the rock like a river he could not see, and the note was familiar. It tasted of iron and snow. You can hear that, Hermione said, not a question. Her hand had found his sleeve on the stairs, 2 fingers keeping her place. It's the same as the tower. It goes under the whole building. It goes under rather more than that, heir presumptive, said the goblin waiting at the stair's foot. He was old, worn smooth and hard as the ravens on the stair, and he wore black and iron rings and a chain of office from which hung a single silver star. The office behind him held a desk, chairs enough for everyone, one shelf bearing exactly one book, and no gold anywhere in sight, which in Gringotts, Harry would later learn, was how you knew you had reached the rooms where the real business was done. I am Sharprock, keeper of the Black Charter, as my line has been keeper since the charter was cut. Sit, all of you, the daughter's bloodkin sit at her right by custom, and Gringotts keeps custom even when wizards have forgotten why. He waited while chairs were taken, then folded his hands. Before the reading, one formality. The charter grants sanctuary within these rooms to any of the house's blood, without exception, regardless of the paper wolves the ministry sets loose above ground. Gringotts honors contracts older than governments. Do any present object. Object to what? Said Mr. Granger. The shadows in the corner of the office stood up. Mrs. Granger's teacup did not survive, but Hermione was already moving around the desk and across the room, and she stopped short of the hooded figure with her hands caught up at her collarbone and said, in a voice that wobbled and refused to fall, "You're supposed to be somewhere the maps go embarrassed and vague." "I lied," said Sirius Black, pushing back the hood. 2 weeks of freedom had begun repairs the prison had thought permanent, flesh coming back to the face, the gray eyes lit. Sanctuary S, the one place a black can't be touched, and I'm still head of this family until 10 minutes from now. You didn't think I'd let you two do this part alone. He looked better and he stood carefully, like a man newly out of hospital, and when Harry crossed the room, Sirius gripped his shoulder and then, deciding grips were insufficient, pulled him in entirely. He smelled of wind and travel. Over Harry's head he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Granger, Sirius Black. Everything the newspapers say about me is true except all of it. Your daughter helped prove so, and I'm going to spend a fair portion of a very large fortune making sure both these children are never again anyone's afterthought. I find it's best to be upfront about intentions." "You're the escaped murderer," said Mrs. Granger. "Wrongly convicted, never tried, and house-trained," said Sirius. "Mostly. Sit," said Sharprock with the patience of stone. The charter, the one book, came down off its shelf. It was not large, its boards were black wood sheathed in silver gone dark with centuries, and when Sharprock unclasped it, the office's lamps leaned their flames toward it, all together, like a room full of people turning to hear a will read. "The Charter of the Noble and Most Ancient House of Black," Sharprock read, "cut in the year the wizards of Britain first called themselves a ministry, and older in its clauses than in its cutting. Item, the house holds its seat, its vaults, its rookeries, and its dead, in its own right and no others. Item, the house is not the ministry, to tax, to enter, nor to inherit, whatsoever laws it passes over breakfast. Item, the headship passes by blood, the heirship passes by blood or by naming, and the house itself," here the goblin's voice took on the particular care of a lawyer arriving at the clause that matters, "reserves at all times its own eldest right, predating this charter and merely recorded by it, to recognize its own by deed. What the house writes, no hand unwrites. Gringotts witnesses, Gringotts does not judge." He turned the book to face them. The pages were not paper. They had the soft, dark sheen of raven feathers pressed flat, and they were full, name after name in silver ink, centuries of names, and Harry did not need to be told that this was the ledger, the same ledger whose keeper's finger he had felt run down his arm on the tower and underline something twice. "The rite is short," Sharprock said. "The house has been longer without it than is decent. Lord Presumptive, your hand." Sirius stepped up without ceremony, took the black-handled knife the goblin offered, and opened a line across his palm as casually as opening an envelope. 3 drops fell on the waiting page. The blood did not blot. It sank the way rain sinks into dry earth, and the page drank and considered, and then in the silence script began to rise where the drops had gone in, silver coming up through the dark sheen letter by letter, unhurried, a hand older than any style of writing Harry knew, Sirius Orion of the blood, 12 years unjustly kept from the hearth. The house acknowledges its son. The house regrets, Lord of the House of Black. Sirius made a sound that was meant to be a laugh. "It regrets," he said to nobody, and his free hand pressed flat against his mouth, and Hermione looked away to give him the privacy of it, and Mrs. Granger, dentist of Crawley, silently passed the escaped convict a travel packet of tissues, which he took. "The air," said Sharprock. "The knife was cold and the cut didn't hurt until afterwards, like all the important ones." Harry watched his own 3 drops sink into the featherdark page and had one heartbeat in which to wonder what a book that could regret might say to him, and then the silver rose. Harry James, of the blood of Dorea, by deed confirmed. He paid the house's debt before the house could pay his, heir of the House of Black. And beneath it, before anyone had moved, before Sharprock could speak the next formula or Hermione could be called forward, while her blood was still in her body and her hands still folded in her lap, the silver went on rising, faster now, the old hand writing of its own accord across the whole width of the page, and with Hermione Jean, of no blood of ours and the house Cares nothing. Twice she turned time for us, daughter of the house by deed. Let the 2 be written on one line, for that is how the house received them. The lamps stood their flames perfectly still. Sharprock looked at the page for a long moment, and when he raised his head, the finish of his old face had cracked into something no wizard, Harry suspected, had seen on a keeper in centuries. "In 400 years of my line's keeping," the goblin said, "the ledger has written first 3 times. I have now witnessed one of them." He inclined his head to Hermione, lower than he had inclined it to anyone. "Daughter of the house, it did not ask your blood. I would tell you what that means, but I do not know. There is no precedent. You are the precedent." Hermione's hands stayed folded. She was looking at her own name shining on the raven-dark page, written in a dead family's living silver on the same line as Harry's, and Harry watched her do the thing she always did at the edge of too much, reach for procedure the way other people reach for a rail. "I should," she said. "There are forms, presumably. Consent. I'm a minor, my parents." "The house," said Sharprock, "has already been more courteous with you than with any soul in its history, daughter. It wrote you without taking a drop. But you are correct, and Gringotts requires what the house waived." He produced parchment. "Bloodkin of the daughter. The House of Black petitions to name your child its own, with all rights of vault, hearth, sanctuary, and inheritance, sharing precedence with the heir." It is a naming, not a taking. She remains your daughter in every law, muggle and magical, and no clause in this charter can ever be read against her family, for the house's own first law is that the house does not eat its children's loyalties. It adds, it does not subtract. Gringotts witnesses that reading and binds the house to it. Do you consent? There was a silence in which the Grangers looked at each other, conferring in a language older and faster than speech. When she was 9, Mr. Granger said at last slowly, a girl at school told everyone Hermione had cheated in a math test because no one honest could score what she scored. She came home and didn't cry. She made a chart proving the marks were statistically consistent with her homework. And I remember thinking, the world is going to spend its whole life telling her she's too much, and she's going to spend her whole life bringing charts. He looked at the ledger at the silver line with 2 names on it. That book met her once and wrote her down as sufficient. On the strength of the evidence, it's the first institution she's ever dealt with that got her right on the first attempt. He picked up the quill. We consent, Meredith, with one condition, said Mrs. Granger, and waited until every eye, including the goblins, was on her. Sundays, whatever she becomes, wherever this goes, she has Sunday dinner with us when she's home. Write it in the ledger or don't, but it's binding at my table. The house finds the condition honorable, wrote the ledger before Sharprock could translate, and will keep it. Well, said Mrs. Granger into the general quiet. Good. The business after the naming took 2 hours, and Harry, who had expected vaults and gold and had braced himself to be embarrassed by them, found that the gold was the least of it and the paper was the worst. The rings came first. Not from a vault, from the ledger itself, which Sharprock laid open at its last written page and left alone on the desk. And while the humans watched, the silver ink of their new written line gathered itself at the margin, welled, and ran off the featherdark page in 2 slow drops that did not fall so much as descend, deliberate as everything else the house did, and cooled on the black wood into 2 rings. Harry's was iron-dark, set with a single star sapphire that held its light off-center like a lamp in a far window. Hermione's was finer, silver braided with something darker, and its stone was small and white and steady. The heir's ring and the daughter's ring, Sharprock said. They are not jewelry. They are the house's hand on your shoulder, and other magic will learn to notice it. Wear them or not, as you choose. The house has already made its choice, and a ring is only the announcement. They'll draw attention, Hermione said, turning hers in the light. At school, politically. Daughter, the House of Black has been legally dead for a decade and morally dead for 3. The moment its ledger is known to have written again, attention is not a risk, it is the weather. The goblin's teeth showed briefly in what served him for a smile. The only question a Black asks about weather is how to make it rain on the correct people. Then the paper. Sharprock laid out the estate in the dry voice of inventory. The seat at Grimmauld Place, a house in the fens gone feral, a hunting box in Wales the ministry had never once found on any survey. The rookeries, which were not buildings, Sharprock said, and declined to elaborate in front of witnesses. Vault upon vault of gold that meant nothing to Harry, and visibly, everything to the part of Sirius that remembered being disinherited at 16 with the clothes he stood in. And noted for later among the great vaults and the deep ones, a small entry that Sharprock read out with unusual gentleness. Vault 711, the personal legacy of Doria Black Potter, sealed at her death, keyed to descend to the first of her line to claim the house. A grandmother's letters waiting 11 years for a grandson with charter right to read them. And then one folder, thin, sealed, older than the rest, that the goblin placed on the desk with a care that made the whole room sit forward before he said a word. There is a matter, Sharprock said, that Gringotts has waited 13 years to raise with someone entitled to hear it. The last will and testament of James and Lily Potter, deposited here in trust, was executed upon their deaths and then sealed unread by order of the Wisengamot, under the emergency powers of its chief warlock. He let that sit. The seal binds wizard probate. It has never bound this bank because the Potters, on the advice of Charles Potter, husband of Doria Black, lodged a shadow copy under the Black Charter which the ministry cannot touch, tax, nor enter. Gringotts could not act upon it. A shadow copy waits for a hand with charter right. As of 11 o'clock this morning, 3 such hands are in this room. Harry heard his own voice come out flat and far away. Who's the chief warlock? Then and now, said Sharprock, Albus Dumbledore. Nobody looked at Harry, which was its own kind of looking. Sirius had gone very still in the way that preceded either the dog or the duelist, and it was Hermione who reached over and turned the folder around and said, he should read it himself first, it's his. It was short. James's handwriting was nothing like Harry had imagined, and exactly like his own if his own ever learned to relax, and it said the things we'll say, gold and guardianship and love made procedural, and then in the clause the whole document existed to hold, it said, should we both fall, Harry goes to Sirius. If Sirius cannot, then in order, Alice and Frank Longbottom, Andromeda and Ted Tonks, Minerva McGonagall. Under no circumstances and no eventuality, whatever argument is made and whoever makes it, is our son to be placed with Petunia Dursley, my sister, who has told me to my face what she would think of any child of mine. Lily wrote this line herself and I am co-signing it, Petunia. No. LP Harry read his mother's capital letters, the pen pressed so hard it had nearly gone through, and the office was quiet around him for as long as he needed, which was a while. Petunia. No. Somebody had read this, or had had every means and duty to read it, and had carried him to that doorstep anyway, and left him with a letter and a bottle of milk in one thin clever ward stretched over an empty room, and had then sealed the paper that said no, so that no court, no godfather, and no grown Harry would ever get to hear his mother say it. The seal, Hermione said into the silence, sharp and steady, laying it out the way she laid out everything so that the anger in the room would have rails to run on. Walk me through the legality, Master Sharprock, because this matters. Sealing a will requires grounds. What grounds were entered? Wartime security of the miner's placement, said the goblin. Entered by the chief warlock, reviewed by no one, renewed by procedural default every 3 years since. I will note, because the keeper's duty is precision, sealing a will is lawful. Sealing this will while personally executing a placement the will explicitly forbade is the kind of lawful that charters were cut to outlive. He knew Sirius was the legal guardian, Hermione went on, quiet, relentless, each link set down in order, so he knew the guardianship question would turn on Sirius's guilt. Which means he had the single strongest motive in Britain to want Sirius tried, questioned under veritaserum, examined properly, because if Sirius was innocent the will governed and the will said no, and there was no trial. He was chief warlock and there was no trial. She looked up. I kept thinking we'd find incompetence. This isn't incompetence, it's architecture. It can wait, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. He was surprised himself at how level it came out. Under his skin the coin-deep ringing had not risen or heated. It had done something better, gone taut, like a wire finding its true note, and he thought of Hermione's word on the train, exits established before exploring the building. He's had 13 years and we've had one morning. If we do anything today, he'll know exactly how much we know by tomorrow. I don't want to spend what we just found in one afternoon of shouting at an old man who's better at shouting adjacent politics than everyone in this room put together. He glanced at Hermione and found her already nodding, the fierce mathematical nod she gave a correct proof. We keep the copy, we learn the house, and when he comes to us, and he'll come, we'll know what he is before he decides what we are. Sirius looked at his godson for a moment with an expression that had too many parents' faces in it, James's and Lily's, and buried under those some ancestor with iron rings and patient eyes. Motion carries, he said quietly. Merlin help me, the heir has spoken and the heir is right. Sharprock, copies under charter seal, one to my keeping, one held dark. And now if the accounts are settled and nobody else's decade needs overturning before lunch, he stood, and something came into him that hadn't been there since the tower, an eagerness with grief folded inside it. I believe I'm finally holding enough of my own paperwork to go home. There are 2 people the house needs to meet. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, did its considerable best to not exist. The square held numbers 11 and 13 shoulder to shoulder like conspirators agreeing on a story, and the Grangers, who had parked their sensible rover across from the gardens, watched their daughter and 2 wizards face a wall of sooty brick with the mixed courage of people determined to be modern about things. It's under a Fidelius and half a dozen older skins, Sirius said. I'm keyed to it by blood. You too. He paused and looked down at their hands at the 2 rings. Actually, I haven't the faintest idea what happens with you two. The wards predate every book I was ever beaten with. Try walking toward where the house ought to be. Harry felt it before his foot finished the first step. The same long, slow river note from under Gringotts, here risen close beneath the pavement, close as a floorboard and rising closer, and the air over the gap between numbers 11 and 13 turned and noticed him, noticed both of them with that total, patient, ledger-keeping attention, and this time the attention was not curious. It was certain. The house did not appear. Appearing was what it did for the merely keyed. For the written it received, brick unfolded from brick in a long dark blossoming, story climbing out of story, the tall grim face of the place assembling itself in absolute silence with its windows coming last, each one lighting as it arrived, not the yellow of lamps but the blue silver of the dream tree's leaves, until the whole house stood over them lit like the first evening of winter stars. The door had no knob, no letterbox, and a serpent knocker that, as they watched, shivered, tarnished, and resilvered into a raven. The door opened on darkness, and out of the darkness came a smell of dust and closed years, and a voice like a rusted hinge given speech, croaking in the gloom of the hall. Intruders, blood traitor filth returns, oh, poor mistress, and thieves with him, creature will, the voice stopped. The house elf stood in the hallway in his rag of a tea towel, ancient, bat-eared, bent, and he had gone rigid, staring not at Sirius but at the 2 children on the threshold, at their hands, and every hair in his ears was trembling. The ledger wrote, creature whispered. Creature felt it this morning, creature thought, creature dreamed. The house has an heir. The house has, his eyes moved to Hermione, and his face performed a war older than he was, disgust and doctrine grinding against something far deeper, The bedrock thing an elf's whole existence was cut from, which is bound to the house itself and not to any opinion the house's fools ever held. The bedrock won. It won all at once, catastrophically, and Creature, who had spent a decade cursing at shadows in an empty tomb of a house, folded down onto the floorboards and pressed his forehead against them, and wept like rain finally coming after a 10-year drought. The house was dead, he sobbed into the boards. Creature stayed with the house, and the house was dead, and now it is lit, it is lit. Masters and mistress have come home, and it is lit. Hermione was on her knees in front of him before anyone else moved. She did not touch him. Some instinct or some new knowledge arriving through the ring told her not yet. She simply crouched to his level and said, "It stayed lit somewhere, or it couldn't have relit. That was you. 10 years is a long time to be the last coal, Creature. The house knows its debts, so do we." The old elf raised his head and looked at the girl the ledger had written without asking, and whatever he saw in her, doctrine lost a second time. "The daughter will want the library," Creature said, tears still on his face, with the sudden fanatic energy of a butler who has been given, after 10 years, a house worth serving. "Creature will air it. Creature will air everything." The house tour took the rest of the afternoon because the house kept participating. Lamps lit themselves a room ahead of them and dimmed a room behind, so that they moved through the tall, dark building inside a traveling pool of blue silver, and Harry could feel the wards doing it, the whole vast weave of the place turning over in its sleep and waking layer by layer, a century of stiffness working itself out of magical joints. Doors that Sirius swore had been locked since his grandfather's day stood open, their rooms curtsying with dust. Doors he remembered as ordinary were locked, and 2 of them, under Harry's palm, dropped the ward song to a tone he felt in his back teeth, and he stepped away without being told. Not yet meant not yet. In the drawing room, the tapestry took up one whole wall, and it was mending itself. They stood and watched it. The embroidered tree, gold thread on black cloth going threadbare, was reweaving before their eyes at the speed of a slow hour hand, frayed branches thickening, dulled gold turning to the true silver of the dream, and the scorch marks, the little burnt craters where names had been blasted off by disapproval, were closing like healed skin. Beneath, where each burn had been, names came back. Not forgiven, Harry somehow understood, watching Andromeda Tonks nay Black re-emerge letter by letter with 2 entirely new lines budding beneath her, recorded. The house was done letting its members edit its memory and temper. Sirius stood in front of the space where his own name had been burnt away by his mother's wand, and watched it return, Sirius Orion in silver with Lord above it, and said nothing for so long that Hermione wandered tactfully away to inspect Phineas Nigellus, and Harry, less tactful, stayed at his godfather's shoulder. "She burnt it when I was 16, Sirius said finally. "I told everyone at school it was the proudest day of my life. Was it? It was the loneliest." Those were the same thing for about 20 years. He reached up and touched the silver letters once quickly, like a man checking a healed rib. "Look at it, repairing Bellatrix's line 2, and Narcissa's. It's not saying they're good, you understand. Black's, even the wall hangings, don't do sentiment. It's saying, mine to judge, all of them. It's getting ready to hold a family court, and I don't think anyone alive remembers the rules." Harry looked up at the great silver tree and found, low on a new branch grown clean out of the old pattern's logic, 2 leaves stitched on one twig, his own name, and beside it, joined by a thread of brighter silver, Hermione Jean. The tapestry hadn't even pretended to know where else to put her. The undercroft door they found last because the house saved it for last. The pool of light led them down the kitchen stairs and past the pantries to a wall Sirius flatly declared had been a wall, and was now an arch and a stair. Going down into rock the house had no business standing on, brick giving way to stone that Harry's senses recognized at once. It was the stuff the river note ran through. It was quarried night. The stair ended at a door of black stone grained with moving silver, exactly the grain of the dream tree's bark, and there was no handle, no lock, no hinge. There were 2 handprints, side by side, inlaid flush in silver, one a little larger, one a little smaller. They didn't ask each other. Their hands were up and moving before asking would have meant anything, hers to the smaller print, his to the larger, and the silver was neither warm nor cold, but exactly the temperature of a held hand. The door said no, it said it kindly in the manner of the raven in the dream, a pressure that came up through their palms with a distinct sense of yet in it. Silver light ran out from their fingers along the door's grain, branching like the tapestry tree, like frost mapping a window, filling the whole slab with slow constellations, and out of the stone rose that voice which was not a sound, the same that had said the house remembers its debts, and it said, 2 are written, 2 must stand. When the house is sure of what it keeps, and you are sure of what you are, the undercroft opens. Learn the tongue first, little leaves. What is kept here was not hidden from you. It was hidden for you. The light withdrew into the grain. The door was a door. Hermione kept her palm on the print a moment longer, and her face had the look it wore in the deep stacks of the library, lit from below by something no one else had noticed was shining. "Did you hear the grammar?" she said. "It didn't say when you are ready. It said when you are sure of what you are. It's not testing skill, it's testing self-knowledge. She took her hand down and flexed the fingers. That's a much harder exam. You would know, Harry said. You've never failed either kind. I've never sat this kind. Yeah, he said, looking at the two prints, hers and his, cut into stone by people centuries dead who had somehow known to size them. You have. 3rd of June, we both did. On the 3rd day, the house gave them rooms. It did not ask. They came up from breakfast to find 2 doors on the 2nd landing standing open that had been locked the evening before, and on each door a small silver plate that had not existed at all. The first said heir. The second said daughter. Sirius, following them up with his toast still in hand, read the plates and made a noise into his tea that he refused to explain. Harry's room was not grand, which was the first thing he loved about it. It was high-ceilinged and plain, with a good bed and a better window, and on the sill, waiting, sat a brass telescope polished that morning by hands with too many knuckles. What stopped him was the shelf. A single shelf above the bed, empty except for 2 photographs in black frames that he had never seen and that existed, so far as he knew, nowhere in the world. His grandmother Doria, hair-pinned, chin-high, laughing at something off-frame with a baby on her hip that had to be his father. And beside it, alone, younger than he'd ever imagined her, Lily Evans on a broomstick she was plainly terrified of, shrieking with delight while a black dog ran barking beneath her. The house had gone through its own long memory in the night and picked out, from everything it kept, the 2 women who would have wanted to see him wake up. He sat down on the bed and stayed there for a bit. Across the landing he heard Hermione discover her own room. The wardrobe dismissed, the window approved. Then the bookshelves, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, entirely empty except for 1 hand-bound volume at eye height, and he heard the exact moment she read its spine, because everything went silent the way a forest goes silent when something large moves. When she appeared in his doorway she was holding it against her chest with both arms, the way other girls her age held cats. "A grammar of the Nightborn tongue," she said. "Handwritten. It's the cipher, Harry. It's a primer for the cipher. The house wants me to learn it. It left me a textbook and 40 feet of empty shelf, which is either a promise or a dare. Which one are you taking it as?" "Both." She was already turning back toward her room, and her voice came over her shoulder, bright as struck silver. "Sirius, I need every blank notebook in this house, and I need to know what blacks use instead of index cards." On the 5th day Hedwig arrived, having extracted Harry's new address from him by the simple method of sitting on his shoulder at Privet Drive until he wrote it down, and settled her precedence over the resident Raven in one silent afternoon of feather-to-feather diplomacy. Creature, unprompted, began setting out 2 dishes. She had brought a letter. Ron's handwriting galloped across the page the way Ron did everything, and the letter said that Privet Drive had reportedly lost its resident celebrity, that his mum was in a state about it, that Dumbledore himself had firecalled the Burrow asking whether the Weasleys knew Harry's whereabouts, asking casually, Ron wrote, the way Percy asks casually about promotions. And that if Harry was somewhere better than the Dursleys, then good riddance, and could he please write back before Mrs. Weasley knitted anyone else an anxiety jumper. Also, World Cup, Dad's got tickets. You're both invited, and Hermione, don't pretend you don't like Quidditch. I've seen you scream at referees. Harry read it twice, grinning, and then sat with the middle of it. Before 9 days were up, the old man had been to Surrey, to the ministry, and into the Burrow's kitchen fire, quietly taking the census of everywhere Harry might belong. "He's mapping your exits," Hermione said when he showed her. She de-emerged from the library with ink on both hands and one cheekbone, the grammar's first exercises apparently going well. "Every door you could walk through, he's standing near it being helpful. It's not even sinister exactly. That's what's maddening about it. It's what you do with a dangerous chess piece. I'm not his piece. No." She tapped the letter, leaving a fingerprint of ink beside Ron's signature, which he'll discover in his own time. "Write Ron back, say yes to the cup, and don't say where we are, not because Ron would tell." She hesitated, honest even when it cost. "Because Ron can't shield his thoughts from a Legilimens, and there's exactly one of those who's been asking." Dumbledore came on the 9th day. He had been, they later pieced together, to Privet Drive first, and to the ministry after, where certain files on the House of Black had, with respect, declined to exist for him. So he did the thing his whole career said he would do. He arrived at the front steps of a house he was not supposed to be able to find, alone at tea time, wearing his mildest purple and the smile of a grandfather dropping in unannounced. Harry watched from the drawing-room window as the old wizard came up the pavement. Watched him reach the foot of the steps, watched the wards take his measure. It was not a clash, nothing flared. The house simply attended to him, all of it at once, the whole black-silver weave turning its regard on the man at the gate the way a portrait's eyes follow a visitor around a room, and Albus Dumbledore, who had walked unbothered through wards for 100 years, stopped as though he had met a stair where he expected floor. Harry felt the exchange run through the stones underfoot, wordless, immense, and oddly formal, like 2 very old duelists agreeing there was no need for all that today. This is the chief warlock. He is powerful and clever, and he sealed the will. He does not enter. The doorbell rang anyway. Manners, Harry was learning, were the armor everyone at this level wore. Sirius answered the door himself, and Harry and Hermione stood behind him in the hall in plain sight, which was the point. Sirius. Warmth was real, which was the difficult thing about him, Harry thought. It was always real, and it was always also load-bearing. You look remarkably well, and Harry, Miss Granger, I confess it eases an old man's spirit to find you all safe after Privet Drive gave me a morning of alarm. Albus, said Sirius pleasantly from his own threshold. You came alone, without alerting the Aurors, to the door of Britain's most wanted man. I take it that means you believed me innocent for some while. The pause was small, and it was the whole conversation. I have had hopes and lacked proofs, Dumbledore said. Peter's survival changes everything. I have already set certain wheels turning at the Ministry. With Miss Granger's and Harry's testimony under oath, I believe your name can be cleared by Christmas. It would go faster still if the process were seen to be guided by, shall we say, hands the Wisengamot trusts. Your hands, experienced ones. Sirius leaned against the doorframe, all careless aristocrat, and Harry, standing behind him, watched 12 Years of Azkaban stand very still inside the pose. Here's my difficulty, Albus, your chief warlock. I never had a trial. I've had 13 years to wonder how the one man with power to demand one for me never quite did, and this week I found I could stop wondering. He didn't mention the will. Harry heard him not mention it. The not mentioning stood in the doorway with them like a fourth person. So we'll manage our own legal affairs. The house and I, you'll have the children's testimony through my solicitors. The house, Dumbledore repeated gently, and his gaze went past Sirius and rested on Harry and Hermione, on the hall's blue-silver lamplight, on briefly their rings, and there it was again, the sensation from the leaving feast of being an entry in an account book under review. Sirius, may I speak plainly, as someone who watched this family from outside for 70 years. The magics stirring in this house were retired for reasons, some of them by your own grandfather, who feared what they asked of the family. Old magic is not evil, but it is not modern either. It keeps its own law, it makes claims on children that no guardian can fully see, and it does not answer to any authority I can appeal to if it misuses them. I would be failing every duty I hold if I did not ask, do you know what it wants with them? And that, Harry thought, was the measure of the man, that the question was a good one, was in fact the question, the very one the Door of Stars had set them as homework, and he asked it here on this doorstep, genuinely meaning it, while 13 summers of a cupboard under his stairs stood listening from the hall, and he had not once in 9 days asked anything about that. Hermione's hand brushed Harry's, knuckle to knuckle, steady. It wants them looked after, Sirius said. Novel approach. Good evening, Albus. The door closed with the softness of very good hinges, which was somehow more final than a slam. Through the wood for a moment, Harry felt the old wizard remain on the step, patient as winter himself. Then the presence turned and diminished away down the square, thinking, and the wards eased around the house like a guard dog circling twice and lying back down. That evening, Creature served dinner in the kitchen because Hermione had asked for the kitchen, and the three of them sat at the scrubbed old table over an enormous shepherd's pie, and the talk went from wills to wards to whether the resident raven needed a name or had one it wasn't sharing, and somewhere in the middle of it, unremarked, the great cold hearth at the kitchen's end, dead 10 years, lit itself. The fire was black at the root and silver at the tip, and it gave off the exact warmth of an ordinary fire, and none of them said anything about it at all, because the house had done it the way family does things for family, without announcement, in passing, while everyone's mouths were full. Only Creature stopped in the middle of the room with the water jug in his hands and stood facing the flames, his ears flat with what looked, on an elf, like reverence at a graveside where someone had turned out to be alive after all. Later, on the doorstep, saying good night while the Grangers' car idled at the curb, Hermione looked back down the hall to the kitchen's distant silver flicker. I'll be back Monday, she said. The library first. Sirius says the family wrote everything important in the star cipher, and someone has to crack it before you two hurt yourselves poking things. Sunday's dinner at yours, though, Harry said. It's in the ledger, binding at her table. She laughed, tired and shining on the steps of a house that had been dead in June, and the raven over the door shifted its feet, and the street lamp caught her ring, and Harry stood in the doorway of the first place that had ever wanted both of them and watched until the car turned out of the square. Behind him, the whole house hummed, patient as winter, no longer waiting. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The tongue of stars. Hermione broke the cipher on the 11th of July, at 11:20 at night, and woke the whole house doing it. Harry heard the shout from 2 floors up and arrived in the library at a dead run with his wand out and found no attackers, only Hermione standing at the great table in a fortress of open books, both hands in her hair, staring at 40 feet of her own notes the way you stare at a choir that has just, without warning, stood up and sung. It's not a substitution cipher, she said, without any greeting, at speed. 3 weeks I've been treating it as a substitution cipher. Star name equals concept, Arcturus means guardian, Regulus means little king, sacrifice, whatever, like a phrase book, and it kept almost working, which is the worst thing a wrong theory can do. Sit down. No, don't sit down, look at this. She spun a sheet across the table at him. The grammar's 3rd exercise. 7 star names in a column, and I translated each one and got 7 words that made no sentence. Because they don't make a sentence, Harry, they make a sky. You're going to have to come at me slower than that. Position. Her finger hit the page. It's positional. The names mean nothing fixed. What they mean depends on where they stand relative to each other, the way stars mean nothing alone and everything in constellations. Write Bellatrix above Regulus, and it reads, the warrior guards the king. Write Regulus above Bellatrix, and it reads, the king restrains the warrior. Reverse the column and you negate the whole sentence. The Blacks didn't write words, they wrote arrangements. Every text in this cipher is a constellation, and you read it the way you read the sky, by asking what stands over what rises, what sets, what is ascendant. She was pacing now, 3 steps each way, her voice going like a struck bell. And that's why the family names its children after stars. It's not vanity. Every black is a word, Harry. When Walburga named Sirius, she was writing a sentence into the family's own tree, and when he ran away the sentence changed meaning. The genealogy is a text, the tapestry is a text. The whole family is one continuous document that's been writing itself for 1,000 years, and it knows it. Harry looked down the length of her notes. 20 days of failed almost finally crystallized, and the ringing under his skin turned over. The house, hearing its own tongue named aloud for the first time in a century. So the door downstairs, he said slowly. Learn the tongue first, little leaves. It didn't mean vocabulary. It meant learn to read arrangement, learn to see what stands over what. She stopped pacing and the lamplight caught her, ink on her knuckles, dressing gown cord trailing, 13 books deep at nearly midnight and entirely radiantly certain. The wards, your ward sense, everything you feel in the stones. I'd bet the whole library it's the same grammar. Magic arranged over magic, meaning by position. You've been reading the castle's constellations by touch all along. You just can't name the stars yet. From the doorway, Sirius, who had arrived in dog form, sat down and became a man leaning against the frame in a dressing gown of catastrophic burgundy. My great-aunt Cassiopeia spent 60 years on that grammar, he said. There's a portrait of her on the 4th floor that's refused to speak to anyone since 1972. It just asked me who the girl with the ink is. He examined Hermione for a long moment, warm and unreadable at once. 60 years, and it took you 3 weeks. You know what my family would have done with you? Burnt me off the tapestry, fought duels over which branch got to teach you. He crossed to the table and turned her master chart toward himself with one finger, and whatever he was looking for in it he found because the flippancy dropped like a coat. Right, both of you sit. If the tongue's open, everything's open, and before we go one page further there are things you need to hear from a black who left, because the books won't say them and creature can't. He sat and rubbed his face and started plainly. Towter's purr, you've seen it carved on half the door frames. Everyone alive thinks it means pure blood. My dear mother screamed it up staircases. Believe me, that's how she meant it. It isn't what it means. Hermione, you've got the grammar now. Purity in the old tongue standing alone before anything's arranged over it. What does it read as? Hermione looked at her charts, and Harry watched her trace it, position by position, until her face changed. Unmixed, she said, not unmixed blood, unmixed purpose, undivided. It reads as always whole, always single-hearted. Always true to the purpose, Sirius said. One purpose, the family had one once. It's why there's an Undercroft, it's why the Rookeries, it's why the Skytongue and the Ledger and all of it, and I don't know what the purpose was, because by the time I was born the house had spent 300 years forgetting it, and had rotted down to worshipping the only word of the motto anyone still understood. Pure what? Pure blood, they decided, because blood was the one thing even a fool can inherit. He said it without heat, which made it worse, an autopsy instead of an argument. That's what a great house looks like when it loses its own grammar. All the power, none of the sentence. My cousin Bellatrix is what the word warrior means when there's nothing arranged over it. The library was quiet. One of the lamps moved its flame gently, the house listening the way it always listened when the talk turned toward its own memory. But it kept the purpose written down somewhere, Harry said. Whatever it was, that's what's behind the door. That would be my guess, and I grew up 50 feet above that door being told it was a wine cellar. Sirius stood and gathered his ridiculous dressing gown and paused at the edge of the lamplight, a tired man in the house he'd sworn to die rather than re-enter, hunting for words in a language he'd refused to learn. The house wrote you two on one line, first time in its history. Whatever the old purpose was, it needed both of you for it. Blood indeed, black and bright. He shrugged, embarrassed by his own gravity. Learn fast, I'll teach what I remember, and for the love of Merlin, go to bed, it's midnight and you're 14. 13, said Harry. Worse, said Sirius, and left. The wards came first because the wards, it turned out, wanted to be learned. Sirius's method of instruction was pure marauder. He took Harry down to the kitchen on a wet Tuesday morning, evicted Creature to the pantry over vehement objection, and said, Right. The hearth's the heart of every warding this family ever raised. Castle walls fall, hearth wards don't, that's the old saying. I'm going to hex you gently from the doorway, and you're going to stand on the hearthstone and stop me without a wand. How? No idea, I was never heir, my job's throwing the hexes. He grinned, and it was fully the grin of the boy in his father's wedding photos. The house won't let you be hurt, probably. The first jinx caught Harry entirely amidships and turned his ears bright yellow to applause from the pantry. The second he tried to stop the way instinct said, by bracing, by pulling the ringing under his skin up into something like a wall between himself and the door, hard, defensive, all edges, and the hearthstone under his feet went cold and grudging, and the jinx wobbled through his half-formed nothing and gave him the tail feathers to match the ears. "Building a fist," said Hermione from the table where she was allegedly transcribing grammar and actually watching everything. "Look at what you're doing, you're keying it to keep out. Everything I've translated about hearthwork says the old wards weren't fortifications, Harry, they were households. The formula on the kitchen arch, I read it yesterday, it doesn't say none shall enter, it says all who enter are known. That's a terrible ward, it doesn't stop anything. Doesn't it?" finished the arrangement. "All who enter are known," she lifted a hand, palm up, the gesture she used when leading someone across a proof, "and the house deals with each as it knows them." Harry stood on the hearthstone with his yellow ears and thought about that, thought about the wards at Gringotts, blade steel, layered, and under them the deep river note that wasn't a blade at all. Thought about the front steps 9 days in when the house had not fought Dumbledore, had raised no wall against the strongest wizard alive, had simply known him thoroughly and declined, not a fist, a dormant older than kingdoms. He stopped bracing. He put the ringing down into the hearthstone the other way, open-handed, the way he'd laid his palm on the snarling corridor, and instead of keep out he built it out of the actual contents of his chest, which even he could recognize this summer in this kitchen. Sirius is family. Hermione is family. Creature, the Ravens, the Grangers on Sundays. This table feeds people. This is a house where nobody goes in the cupboard. Everyone who comes to this fire in good faith is safe at it, and everyone who comes to it in bad faith is known, utterly, before their foot crosses the stone. The hearth lit. Not the black-silver evening fire, a deep charge running through the stone and up the chimney and outward along the floor joists, and for one full second Harry felt the whole house through the soles of his feet, every sill and lintel and chimney of it, the way you feel your own body when you wake, and every one of those distant edges turned toward the kitchen the way the lamps turned their flames when the charter was read. Sirius's third hex, a lazy trip jinx, crossed the kitchen threshold and simply stopped being. Not blocked, unhappened, the ward knew Sirius, knew the hex was play, and declined the play with precisely the courtesy of an ant confiscating a firework. Sirius looked at his own wand, delighted. "Padfoot's teaching method vindicated," he announced to the pantry. "You may applaud." Creature emerging did not applaud. He walked to the kitchen arch, laid his long fingers on the stone, and stood there with his eyes shut and his ears down, an old sexton feeling a bell rung properly for the first time in decades. "The hearth is warm through the whole house," he said, hoarse. "Mistress Walburga could not do this. Mistress Walburga's mother could not do this." He turned and gave Harry a look of terrifying proprietary satisfaction. "Creature will make treacle tart. Best review I've ever had," said Harry, whose ears were still yellow. Hermione's art arrived differently, because everything about her did. She'd been noticing the edges of it for weeks, the way you notice a brightening sky without ever catching the moment of dawn. Threads at the corner of her eye when Harry worked the hearthstone, a shimmer over creature like heat off a summer road, the sense that the library's lamps were connected to something the way buttons are connected to coats. She recorded every instance in a notebook labeled Perception, with times and conditions, because she was Hermione, and it was the notebook she was reaching for on the last Sunday of July when the dawn finished happening all at once. The grammar's 9th exercise was 1 sentence long, instructions for how to look at a candle. Look not at the flame, it said, nor at the wick, but at the agreement between them. She looked at the agreement. The candle opened. Behind the small yellow fact of the flame stood the arrangement of it, wax and wick and air and heat holding their old treaty. And behind that treaty stood others, the table's slow contract with the floor S with the joists, the whole patient parliament of the house, ward lines running silver through the walls like veins through a wrist, and behind those, brighter, the roaring cursive of the ward's deep courses, and behind everything, under everything, the river note. No longer a sound, but a visible dark radiance flowing through the foundations, and it was too much. It was all of it at once, every object in the room shouting its whole biography, the air itself cross-hatched with a million small agreements, and she could not find the way to stop looking. The eye that had opened had no lid, and somewhere very far away a chair went over, and her own voice was saying Harry's name in a tone she had never once permitted herself. 2 floors up, Harry felt it hit the middle of his chest like the toll of a bell. The ring, the line the ledger had written them on pulled suddenly wire-tight, and he took the stairs in a way that was not quite falling and not quite shadow, the house hurling doors open ahead of him corridor by corridor. She was on the library floor with her hands over her eyes, and shutting them, he would understand later, had made it worse, because the sight did not use those. He did not know what to do, so he did what he was. He sat down on the floorboards and got hold of her hands and put them against his own face, palms flat along his jaw, and said, "Hermione, look at me, just at me. I'm one thing, look at one thing." "You're not one thing," she said, wild, muffled, half laughing through it, because even drowning she was precise. You're thousands, you're all lit up, you're the worst possible." And then she went silent and very still, and her hands turned on his face, reading it like a page of braille. "Oh," she said, small. "What? There's a thread." Her voice came down and down as she said it, out of panic, into the register she kept for cathedral naves and first editions. "Silver, from me to you. It's not like the others, it doesn't shout, it just holds." The ledger's line, "It's real, it's an actual." She followed it with whatever sense she was following it with, out from his face, down through, and her babbling stopped entirely. And Harry felt the moment her whole drowning attention gathered itself onto that one line and stood on it, a shipwrecked reader finding, in an ocean of roaring text, one sentence she already knew by heart. They sat on the library floor for perhaps 20 minutes, her hands on his face, his on her wrists, saying nothing at all, while she learned to stand on the thread and then to walk it, and then, one agreement at a time, to look at the rest of the shouting world from the safety of it, sorting, dimming, choosing, until the candle was mostly a candle again and the room was mostly a room, and the sight had a lid, and the lid would always be now him. "Every keeper needs an anchor," said Sirius from the doorway, quietly, no burgundy flippancy anywhere in him. He'd been standing there longer than either of them knew, keeping the door, not interrupting, and in his hand was a book from his great-aunt's locked shelf, already open to the page he'd gone hunting for the moment he'd heard her cry out. That's what Cassiopeia's notes call it. The sight of the house always came in pairs, one to see, one to hold the seer. It's why it died out. He set the book down beside them with unusual care. The seeing turns up once in 3 generations, the pair almost never. Hermione looked at the page, then at her own hands on Harry's face, and took them back, brisk and pink, and picked up the fallen chair and said, "Well, I want to interview the portrait that doesn't talk to anyone," in a voice that fooled nobody, least of all the house, which put out every lamp in the library except the 2 above their heads. Sight settled into her over the following days the way a new language settles, by stopping being an event. She learned to carry it lidded and low and to open it in deliberate slices, and once at Harry's request she read him and reported in a voice of clinical revenge that the famous scar parsed as a word crossed out by someone with appalling handwriting, and that the rest of him was arranged almost entirely out of stubbornness. He bowed, she threw a quill at him. August came, and with it the shadow walk. They found the instructions where the house wanted them found, in a slim black book that appeared on Hermione's 40 feet of shelf between one evening and the next morning, titled in the star cipher, a constellation that she translated, frowning, as "The family goes quietly." The frown was for the margins. The same disciplined, spiky hand from Sirius's jacket-lining list had annotated every page, and the annotations were addressed impossibly to a reader the annotator could never have met. "The heir will want a leap, do not let him leap." And later, "The daughter will want to understand before stepping. Do not let her wait too long. Understanding is the second foot." "Regulus," Sirius said when they showed him the hand. He held the book a long time. "That's Regulus's writing, my brother. He died at 18, we never knew how, and mother never spoke of him after except to say he died serving the Dark Lord like a good son. He gave it back with both hands, the way you return something borrowed and broken and mended by someone else. He was annotating the family walking book for 2 children he'd never meet. You'll tell me what that means when you find out." The walk itself was not apparition. "Apparition," Hermione said, reading, "was a wizard forcing space to make an exception. This was the house extending its floor. Where the family's blood has claim," said the book, "all its floors are one floor, laid through the shadow of the world, and its doors are one door. The air does not travel. The air comes home by the short way from any room the house has right into any other. The practice hall was the drawing room to the kitchen, 2 floors and 40 stairs by the long way, 1 step by the short." Harry stood where the book said to stand, in the deep shadow the tapestry cast in the lamplight, which was not, the sight confirmed, entirely ordinary shadow. It pooled toward the corner the way water pools toward a drain, and somewhere at the bottom of its darkness the drawing room's floor and every floor the house had ever owned lay stacked in one place like pages of a shut book. "Intent, claim, and hearth," Hermione read. "You're not pushing through anything. You're remembering that the kitchen is yours, in a tongue the world has to respect. The shadow's just where the world keeps its bindings loose enough to allow it. And if I get it wrong," she checked Regulus's margin, "the house does not drop its children. The between is cold, the crossing 1 heartbeat, a wrong step returns to the hearth. He will still be frightened. Tell him the fear is respectful and correct." She looked up. "Your dead uncle cousin says your fear is respectful and correct. Tell him thanks." Harry stepped into the shadow, cold. Not winter's cold, the cold between stars, the original cold that winter is a rumor of. And in it, for the length of exactly 1 heartbeat, there was no Harry, no body, no breath, only a line of silver holding steady in an immensity of black, and along the line, distant as lit windows across a night country, the warm yellow rooms of everywhere he had the right to be. The kitchen below, the library, the tower bedroom, the front step, the hunting box in Wales he'd never seen, a cottage shape he didn't know, a hall, a rookery loud with sleeping wings, and far off at the line's end, faint, 2 rooms he had no name for yet that glowed all the same, because the house kept the claim warm even where the family had forgotten it. He was the line. The line was home. He picked the kitchen the way you pick a word out of a familiar sentence, and the heartbeat ended. Warm flagstones. Kettle smell, creature laying tea things, glanced over as though Harry had merely used a door, which Harry understood, standing there shaking with starlight in his blood he had. Above him, through the floors, he heard Hermione shriek his name, half fury and half triumph, and the thunder of her feet on the stairs, and he had just enough time to sit down at the table and arrange himself insufferably before she burst in demanding an account of every single second, notebook already open. The between-s cold stayed in him for an hour. She wrote that down too. And because she was Hermione, she stood in the tapestry's shadow herself the next evening, with Harry stationed at the kitchen hearth as anchor exactly per Regulus's marginal orders, and made the walk in one clean step, arriving with her list of observations already half composed, and the two of them spent the following week being, as Sirius put it to Creature over the racket, the only two adolescents in Britain whose idea of joy was doing inventory of a magical transport network with a clipboard. He said it leaning in the kitchen doorway, watching them argue happily over whether the cottage-shaped glow was Wales or somewhere older, and Creature beside him, polishing the same cup for the fourth time, said, Master Regulus would have liked them, which silenced the doorway for some while. Sundays, meanwhile, belonged to Crawley, because the ledger had said so and Mrs. Granger had said so first. Harry had assumed the first time that the invitation was politeness with his name caught in its net, and had spent the drive rehearsing how to be no trouble. It lasted until the door, where Mr. Granger handed him a peeler and a bag of potatoes on the grounds that in this house the guests earned their gravy, and the assumption never recovered. By August the routine had roots, potatoes with Mr. Granger and the radio cricket, which Harry did not understand and had come to love for the voices alone. Hermione and her mother conducting a fortnight's conversation in 40 minutes at the kitchen table, the roast, the argument about whether magic could improve Yorkshire pudding, tabled weekly at the same point by Mrs. Granger's ruling that some things were finished technologies. They asked about the magic, the Grangers, but they asked about it the way you ask about a country your child has emigrated to, learning its customs so the letters home would land somewhere furnished. It was Mr. Granger who put his finger on the whole summer, unknowingly, over the washing up on the last Sunday before the World Cup. Harry was drying, through the hatch, Hermione was teaching her mother pieces of the star grammar with the cutlery, Bellatrix the fish fork standing over Regulus the teaspoon. She's different this summer, Mr. Granger said to the roasting tin he was scouring. Every other year she's come home wound tighter, top marks and shoulders up round her ears, and we could never work out what school was costing her to be so good at it. This year there's all this, ravens on my surgery sign, a book that writes back, and her shoulders are down. He rinsed and passed and didn't look at Harry, which made it possible to say, Whatever that house of yours is doing, it's the first thing that's ever told her she doesn't have to earn the seat. You'll keep it that way. It was not a question, so Harry didn't answer it like one. She held the door open for me first, he said, years before there was a house. Mr. Granger considered that, nodded once, and handed him the tin, and through the hatch Hermione promoted her mother's teaspoon to ascendant with full honors, laughing, ink from the morning's translation still on her wrist, and Harry dried the roasting tin of a dentist in Crawley, and understood that the house had known exactly what it was doing when it wrote the Sunday clause into itself, and that some wards were made of potatoes. Regulus's room they entered on the 15th of August, because the house unlocked it on the 15th of August, and by then they had learned that the house's timing was itself a sentence in the old grammar, and could be read. It waited until we knew his handwriting, Hermione said at the door. It wanted us to meet him first. The room was a boy's room, kept 11 years under dust like snow. Slytherin green newspaper cuttings about the Dark Lord arranged with a collector's care that curdled into something else near the desk, where the cuttings stopped being admiring and started being annotated, dates circled, casualty lists cross-referenced, one headline about disappearances scored through with a single stroke so hard it had torn the paper. The last cutting was face down. On its back in the spiky disciplined hand, he asked for an elf. He gave back mine half dead and laughing about it. Whatever he guards in that place, he fears it being found. A thing worth that fear is worth my life. R.A.B. Creature stood in the doorway. He had followed them up unasked, and he was looking at the face-down cutting, and his ears had gone flat, and it all came out of him then, at last, in the middle of the dusty room, 11 years of it. The cave, the black lake, the basin of poison Master Regulus made Creature drink him through, the locket swapped for a forgery, the order given with the last of his voice, destroy it, tell no one, go home, and the water, and the hands in the water, and home. And 11 years of failing to destroy a thing that could not be destroyed, failing and failing while the house died around him, and the locket whispered in its drawer like a wasp in a wall. He fetched it without being asked. He came back with the drawer's whole contents wrapped in a pillowcase and would not touch the shape inside, and set it on Regulus's desk and stood back trembling. Harry knew it before the cloth came off. Every warded stone of him knew it. The ring on his hand went cold, and the house, all 5 stories of it, leaned in around that desk like a ring of grown men around a snake, and through the pillowcase's thin cotton he could hear the thing the way he'd heard the snarling corridor, except the corridor had been a splinter and this was a wound that talked. Hermione had gone bone-white, sight fully open, staring at what stood behind the locket's small golden fact. "There's a piece of a person in it," she said. Torn off and stuffed in like, she groped, and refused every tidy word on offer. "Harry, the arrangement of it is wrong the way nothing else in this house is wrong. It's a sentence that should never parse. Something split its own soul and locked the offcut in a box." "Voldemort," Harry said. The scar on his forehead had begun very faintly to sing along, a wasp answering a wasp, and he stood quite still under the knowledge arriving in him sideways and enormous, and put it, deliberately, aside for later. On a shelf he could feel Hermione watching him build. "The house can't destroy it," Sirius said from the doorway, reading the walls the way Harry read them. "Look at the lamps. It's asking us not to try. Not yet." Down they went instead, all 4 of them, a procession behind a pillowcase, to the black stone door with its 2 handprints, and there the house told them what it wanted in the way it always did, pressure and grammar and the patient voice out of the silver grain, not destruction, custody. "The ledger has written this debt already, little leaves. It is not yours and it is not today's. Lay the wound at the threshold and the threshold will hold it, and no whisper will cross this stone, until the day the whole debt is called in the proper order." The step at the door's foot opened like a coin slot for exactly the length of that instruction, silver-grain darkness with cold coming off it, and Creature, given the honor at Harry's word, laid the wrapped locket in with both his long hands steady, the mission of Master Regulus discharged at last into keeping worthy of it. The stone closed seamless. The wasp note in Harry's scar went silent for the first time all summer. Creature stood facing the door with the empty pillowcase held to his chest and pronounced, in his rusted hinge croak, the only benediction he owned, "It is done as Master Regulus ordered. It is done properly." Then with fanatic energy and glistening eyes, Creature will make dinner, a large one. The raven tongue they had been circling all summer, and the circling was mutual. The resident raven plainly understood English and equally plainly considered responding in English beneath everyone involved. And the grammar's chapter on the subject was 1 page long and mostly warnings. The rook-kin are not servants and not beasts. They are colleagues of the house, of older standing than the house, and their tongue is not words. Speak arrangement to them as to everything worth speaking to, and do not lie. They find it hilarious. Hermione went at it her way, 3 days of observation, a chart of head angles and feather states, a working taxonomy of 17 distinct croaks, which the raven, on the 4th day, cheerfully rendered obsolete by producing an 18th while she watched. Harry went at it his way, which was to stop trying. He was carrying the breakfast scraps out to the sill on the 5th morning, thinking about nothing but the weight of the plate, and the raven turned one eye on him, and he felt the look land the way Wardsong landed, position and grammar, a whole sentence in a glance. "You are late, the bacon is cooling, and the owl has been gloating," and he answered it the same way without deciding to. "Sorry, kitchen politics, she likes you better anyway," and the raven made a sound no one had catalogued, the dry double click of a lock enjoying itself, and that was the door opening that simply that sideways. "It's not a language you learn," he tried to explain that evening. "It's a language you stop refusing. You're trying to hear words, there aren't any, there's just. Which thing stands over which, same as everything." Hermione was silent for a moment, then tore her taxonomy in half, which for her was the equivalent of a religious conversion, and by the following week she could hold up her end of a negotiation with the rookery's representative about window access and biscuit tariffs. Later that week came the ravens, and the ravens Harry would remember all his life. The greeting forms were the grammar's last chapter, not an exercise but a courtesy, how the family addresses the rookery. The instructions fit on 1 line: stand where they can see you, say who stands over you, ask nothing on the first visit. The rookery was reached by the short way, through the tapestry shadow, along the silver line to that far glow loud with sleeping wings, and they stepped out together into a round tower open to the sky, older than any castle either of them had seen, standing they never learned exactly where, on a headland above a grey sea, and the whole inner face of it, ledge over ledge, spiraling up to a crown of pale morning, was ravens. Hundreds, 1,000. The rustle of them settling to regard the 2 arrivals was the sound of a library the size of a hill turning 1 page. They stood where the birds could see them. Hermione's hand found Harry's ink-stained fingers between his, and this had stopped being remarkable at some point that summer that neither of them had marked, which was how the important things happened they were both learning, unmarked and then indelible. "The House of Black stands over us," Harry said to the crown of the tower as the grammar prescribed. "Its ledger wrote us on 1 line, we ask nothing." The tower considered them. Then from the topmost ledge, one raven dropped, fell the whole spiral in silence, opened its wings a yard from their heads and landed on the ledge before them. The Raven, theirs, Silkeeper of Grimmauld and Privet Drive, escort of trains and clinics, and it was possible to see now in the rookery's grey light that it was older than the others, and that the others had been waiting to see where it chose to stand. It looked at the two of them, first one eye, then the other. Then it turned its back and faced the tower, which they understood, by now fluent in the only language it used, to mean, "These are mine," and it was as though a treaty had been signed at the level of the sky. Whole spiral of ledges loosed a sound like dark applause, wings and voices together, and ravens fell upward into the morning by the hundred, streaming out over the sea and the land, north and south, to every wind going out, Hermione said quietly, watching them go with the sight wide open and shining like messengers. "It's telling the old properties," she said. "All those far rooms on the Silver Line. It's telling everything the family owns and everything the family knew." Her hand tightened on his. "It's announcing us." That was the fortnight the letters began. Sirius's solicitors, a firm so old its partners were listed by constellation, reported that the Ministry's Department for Magical Child Welfare had opened and been obliged to close an inquiry into the guardianship of one H.J. Potter, the file having been found to concern a charter house and therefore, with respect, not to exist. That a motion touching the regency of dormant noble houses had died in closed session when the Goblin liaison read aloud one clause of one charter. That the chief warlock had twice requested, through channels of impeccable courtesy, a meeting with the heir of House Black and his guardian at any convenient time in any setting entirely informally, and that the firm had replied twice with impeccable courtesy that the house's diary was full for the foreseeable summer. "He stopped pushing at the doors," Hermione said, reading the letters at the kitchen table with her feet up on Harry's chair. "3 refusals and he's gone quiet. That's not retreat. He's a patient man deciding the doors will come to him." She looked up. "Hogwarts. We go back in 3 weeks and we'll be inside his wards 10 months of the year. Whatever conversation we've been declining all summer, we'll be having it at school at a time he picks in a room he owns." "Then we pick the ground first," Harry said. "The cup, Ron's letter, 100,000 people, the whole ministry looking at Bulgaria, nobody watching us learn to be looked at." He caught her expression and shrugged. "You said it yourself. Attention's the weather now. I'd rather practice in a storm that isn't about us." The Quidditch World Cup was everything Ron had promised, and Harry gave himself up to it wholeheartedly for one entire day. The tents, the villa, Crumb flying like a falcon with a grudge, Ron's face when Ireland won and Bulgaria caught the snitch, the argument that lasted, gloriously, 4 hours. For a day they were 14 and 13, and their biggest secret was a house that liked them, and Ron, in his element and hosting them in it, was the best of himself, generous, funny, entirely without side, and if he noticed the matching rings he decided, visibly and once, that it was a thing friends could ask about later, which was its own kind of nobility. The Death Eaters came after midnight. Fire first at the far edge of the camp, and then the screaming came in ahead of any sight of them, and out of the same dark the wave of running people, night clothes and one boot and children under arms, and above the burning tents 4 figures hung twisting in the air like a dreadful slow mobile. The campsite manager, his wife, their little ones, muggles, hoisted and spun for sport by masked marchers whose laughter arrived on the wind ahead of their wands. The Weasley party split by plan, Arthur toward the fighting, the children toward the wood, and in the crush and the smoke Harry and Hermione were separated from Ron between one tentro and the next, and stopped running at the same instant and looked at each other, and had the whole argument in no words at all. Around them the crowd streamed past a knot of stragglers who could not stream, an old wizard with 2 grandchildren, a witch with a baby and a twisted ankle, a muggle-born family, by their night clothes and their bewilderment, whose tent stood between the marchers' line of advance and nothing at all. There was no hearthstone. There was trampled grass and firelight and other people's terror, and Harry had exactly what he had had all summer, which was the whole contents of his chest, and Hermione beside him with the sight open, already reading the ground. "There," she said, pointing at the cold ring of a doused campfire. "Ash and stone, it's been a hearth since this afternoon." "In the old grammar that's not nothing, Harry. Hearth is hearth. The word doesn't care how young the fire is." He was already kneeling, palm flat on the warm ash, and she knelt with him, her hand over his, and between them, silently, they arranged it, position over position, her grammar in his open hand. "This fire stands over this ground. These people stand at this fire. All who stand at a fire of ours stand under the house. All who come to it in bad faith are known." The ward rose in a circle 60 feet across, and it rose visible, which no modern ward was, a low wall of black silver light like the hour after sunset made solid, and the stragglers inside it stopped screaming one by one, not because anyone told them to, but because their bodies understood before their minds did that they were, suddenly, unaccountably, in the one place on the hillside where the night was warm. 3 of the marchers peeled toward the light, because cruelty is curious. They came up the slope laughing behind their masks, wands loose, and hit the circle's edge, and Harry felt each of them arrive in his back teeth and be known, name and history in the sum of their standing arrangements, weighed by something patient that lived in ash and old law. What happened next happened gently, which made every witness's account of it stranger. Their wands went out. Whatever they cast on happened at the boundary, courteous as the kitchen ward confiscating Sirius's jinx, and the light before each mask reshaped itself into a raven the height of a door, black at the root and silver at the tip, that simply looked at them, first with one eye, then the other, the way ravens audit the world, and the laughing stopped, and the three marchers of the resurgent pureblood cause turned from a children's campfire and ran. Later, none of the sheltered families could agree on the details, save that there had been two young people kneeling at the ash with their hands stacked, one dark-haired boy very still, one girl whose lips moved like a scholar's at prayer, and that the warmth had smelled. Several of them insisted independently of iron and snow. The dark mark went up over the wood at 1:30, green and vast, and the camp's fear turned over into a different, older key. Inside the circle, the baby had gone to sleep. Harry knelt in the ashes and watched the skull's green light gutter across Hermione's face, and felt, threading under the panic on the hill like a river under a battlefield, the house's long note running satisfied through ground it had never owned and now, in some small permanent way, did. She turned and met his eyes, singed, soot-striped, incandescent, her hands still stacked on his in the warm ash. "Well," she said, "now Dumbledore's not the only one who knows what we can do." Ministry-hit wizards found the circle at dawn, still faintly warm, and stood around it with instruments that had no setting for what they read, and by the following evening an item in the Prophet noted that the Department of Mysteries had taken custody of 60 feet of scorched hillside, provenance unknown, and that anyone with information regarding an unregistered ward event, category ancestral, was invited to come forward. Nobody came forward. But in a tower office in Scotland, a very old man read the item 3 times, and set the newspaper down beside a 13-year-old entry in his own hand, curious, and looked out the window a long while north, toward the start of term. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The goblets bargain. Hogwarts noticed them the moment the carriages crossed the boundary wards, and what it did about it made Hermione drop her copy of the Prophet. Harry felt it come up through the carriage floor, the castle's vast warm hum, familiar as his own pulse now, pausing the way a crowded room pauses when a name is spoken at the door, and then rearranging, courtesies passing down through bedrock between one ancient weave and another. Away across the lake, for the space of 3 heartbeats, every window in the castle brightened by the width of one silver thread. "It's greeting the house," Hermione said low, under Ron's argument with Seamus about the cup final. "Ward to ward, they know each other, Harry. They must be nearly the same age." The castle's own song had changed for him too, or he had changed for it. Where June's Hogwarts had muttered under its breath, September's spoke up. Staircases arranged themselves a half-second before his need, doors unstuck for Hermione's hand, and the suits of armor Ron observed within a week had developed a habit of coming to attention as the pair of them passed, which Ron found hilarious until the day one of them saluted, after which he found it unnerving and said so often. Ron had taken the summer's disclosures better than either of them had dared hope, and worse than they'd wanted, which is to say, honestly. They told him the shape of it in the Burrows orchard before the cup, rings and house and ledger, minus the will and the locket, and he'd gone quiet for a day and come back with his ears red in one question, which was whether they'd have told him at all if he hadn't invited them to the World Cup, and the honest answer which Harry gave him was yes, but later and probably badly. Ron had kicked a gnome hole for a while and then said, "You're both mental and your house sounds mental," and that had been, in the language of 13-year-old boys, absolution. The rest of the school had no orchard and no absolution. The rings were noticed by the end of the first feast, identified by the end of the first week, the Prophet's genealogy correspondent confirming with poorly concealed hysteria that the ring on Potter's hand was the Black Heir's ring, unseen in public since 1979, and that the Granger girl, Muggle-born, wore a daughter's ring of a design last cut in the 17th century. Slytherins looked at Hermione the way men look at a chessboard that has begun, impossibly, to play itself. Draco Malfoy, whose mother was born a Black, was heard to say nothing at all about it, on what was clearly professional advice from home. And Dumbledore watched, pleasantly at meals, from the high table, with the particular twinkling patience of a man who had decided that the mountain would, given one good school year, come to Mohammed. The new defense professor they met in the second week, and he taught them the unforgivable curses on a Tuesday, in a classroom with the blinds half down, out of a jar of spiders. The lesson itself would be argued about in the staff room for a month, Mad-Eye Moody being Mad-Eye Moody, and the ministry's curriculum being no match for a man with a magical eye and a mandate from Dumbledore. What nobody argued about because nobody else was equipped to see it, was the thing Hermione carried out of that classroom folded very small and did not unfold until she and Harry were alone on the walk to herbology. "He enjoyed it," she said. "He's a mad old Auror. Ron's dad says he's been chasing dark wizards so long he's half dark himself. Bit of relish probably comes with, Harry, I wasn't watching his face." She had her arms around her books tight, and she was pale in the bright September morning. I've been practicing on the teachers all week, reading rooms, it's good exercise, everyone's weave does something when they work magic. McGonagall's goes precise like a loom. Flitwick's sparkles, it's ridiculous, I nearly laughed in charms, and I wanted to see what 30 years of curse scars looks like, so I was open when he cast the Cruciatus on that spider. The greenhouse loomed up, she stopped in the courtyard short of the door out of earshot and finished it. Pain curses are supposed to cost, that's in every book. Dark magic pulls the caster's own arrangement out of true, that's what the scarring is. His didn't pull, it fit. Casting that curse, his whole weave sat down into itself like a man getting into his own armchair. She looked up at him. I checked his file in the library after. Alastor Moody put more Death Eaters in Azkaban than any Auror alive, and half his famous scars come from refusing to use their methods. A man like that doesn't have an armchair shaped like a Cruciatus. They had no grammar yet for what it meant, and September was crowded and the term rolled over it. But she opened a fresh page in the notebook that evening and headed it Moody, and the page did what her pages did all that autumn, filled. Then the goblet of fire spat out 4 names, and the mountain came to him with the 4th still burning in the air. I didn't put my name in. Harry said it once clearly into the antechamber's firelight to the assembled champions and heads and officials, before anyone else could set the terms of the scene. I'm 14, the age line held all week, and I've spent the evening in full view of my house. Someone entered me. I'd like to know who, and so would my house, and I want it minuted, Mr. Crouch, that the House of Black regards the unauthorized binding of its heir to a lethal contract as a hostile act by a hand unknown. It rearranged the room. Watched it happen the way Hermione had taught him all summer to watch arrangements. Karkaroff's bluster dying half-born, Madame Maxim calculating, Crouch's clerk actually writing it down because a formal complaint by a noble house was a category his quill had rules for, Dumbledore pausing one beat on the discovery that the 14-year-old had arrived at the crisis with institutions. The contract is binding, magically binding, Crouch said, gray and precise. He must compete. He'll compete. The voice was Hermione's from the doorway where she had simply walked in past 2 officials who had simply failed to stop her. McGonagall pivoting in protest and then, catching sight of her face, not making it. She crossed to Harry and she was carrying, of all the things in Scotland, a notebook. The House would like it further minuted that its heir competes under protest, that it does not waive investigation, and that it reserves its charter rights, all of them. She looked at Crouch's clerk. You'll want the citation, it's the charter of the House of Black, 3rd item. Gringotts holds the sealed text. And what, said Ludo Bagman, jolly and lost, does the 3rd item say? That the house is not the ministry, said Dumbledore quietly before she could, and his eyes rested on the 2 of them over the half-moon spectacles with an expression Harry spent days afterward failing to name, assessing and troubled, and at the very bottom, in the place the man kept his oldest self, something that looked like a chess player being shown a piece from a set he retired the board of. The champions have had a long evening. Perhaps the minuting can conclude in the morning. It was the sight in the end that turned the night from grievance to intelligence. Hermione had opened it the moment the 4th name flew, and she'd read the goblet across the width of the great hall the way she read everything now, by its arrangements, and in the antechamber's last confusion she stood before the cup itself on its pedestal and looked once, thoroughly, at the agreement between artifact and flame. She told Harry the rest in the common room at 2 in the morning, the fire down to embers, her notebook open between them on the hearthrug like a map of a battle nobody else could see. The goblet's honest, she said, that's the horrible elegance of it. Nobody hexed the cup would notice, it's older than the ministry and it's proud, Harry, artifacts that old are all pride. What someone did was lie to it politely. There's a 4th binding woven in under the 3 schools, and the weave of it is oily, it's been handled. Someone confounded the goblet into believing in a 4th school with 1 student, and the work is, she hunted for the professional word and gave up and used the true one, beautiful, cursebreaker standard, not a student, not a prank. Someone inside these wards, with reason to want you contracted into a tournament where champions die, took their time and did it beautifully. The embers ticked. Harry lay back on the hearthrug and looked at the firelight moving on the ceiling of the tower that had been his first home, inside the wards of a castle that had greeted his house like an old colleague and inventoried calmly the summer's ledger. A hearth that knew every soul who crossed it, a sight that read weaves like print, a rookery, a godfather, a solicitor firm listed by constellation, and her, cross-legged beside him with soot on her cuff and the whole plot already half-read. Last year I'd have spent tonight feeling hunted, he said to the ceiling. I'd have lain here all night wondering who hates me. And this year someone's crept into my family's kind of magic in my castle to aim a tournament at me. He turned his head and found her already looking at him, emberlit, entirely unafraid, and the thing between them, ring to ring, line to line on a raven feather page, hummed with what the house had known when it wrote them together. This year they're the ones who should be doing the wondering will compete and will find the hand. "The house remembers its debts," she said, and it had stopped being a quotation somewhere over the summer. It was just a thing that was true about the two of them now, a fact with a hearth in it. The wand-weighing ceremony was meant to be a photograph opportunity and became a constitutional incident. It was the ring's doing, and the ring, Sharprock had warned them, was not jewelry. When Ollivander finished with the champions, Wands and Rita Skeeter's photographer herded the four of them together, Skeeter's crocodile bag already disgorging its acid green quill. The man reached to reposition Harry with the casual proprietary hand photographers use on children, and the heir's ring declared itself. No flash, no violence. The room simply filled, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with the presence Harry had felt on the tower, patient and total and old as the cold between stars, the unmistakable sensation of standing inside the attention of a house, and every adult in the chamber, 4 officials, 3 heads of schools, 1 wand-maker and 1 journalist, understood in the same wordless instant that the child in front of them was not, in any sense their careers could afford to test, unaccompanied. Ollivander recovered first because Ollivander was the only one who'd felt it before. "Ah," he said, with the satisfaction of a man having a theory confirmed, "the House of Black is in attendance." One had heard, 13.5 inches, walnut and ravenquill core, the last wand my great-grandfather made for that family. If anyone present is curious, they generally did not need them. Skeeter was not deterred because Skeeter's whole genius was undeterrability. The article ran 3 days later, and it was a masterpiece of its kind, tragic orphan or cuckoo in the tomb. 4 columns insinuating that the boy who lived, unbalanced by fame and grief, had crawled into the empty shell of a dark family for its gold, dragging a muggle-born schoolgirl into pureblood cosplay with an escaped mass murderer pulling the strings from his hiding place, and it named Hermione, and it printed the Grangers' profession and town. Harry's response would have been fury. It never got the chance to happen because Hermione's response was procedure, and procedure in a charter house had teeth the modern world had forgotten it ever grew. "Libel against a noble house isn't a lawsuit, it's a right," she said, laying the relevant page of the charter's commentary on the breakfast table between them like a dueler's glove. Her voice had the bright, terrible mildness it acquired around threats to her parents. The old law of standing. A house formally names a statement false and injurious and stakes its honor on the naming. The claimant then has 3 choices: prove the statement, retract it, or maintain it, and let the magic weigh the 2 honors against each other. Guess what happens to a professional liar's byline when her own quill is magically obliged to weigh its honor? "You've already sent it. Sirius sent it at dawn, by Raven." She buttered her toast with the serenity of an artillery officer observing fall of shot. 3 ravens, actually, 1 to Skeeter, 1 to the editor, 1 to the Prophet's board, because the right attaches to everyone who maintains the statement. The solicitors say nobody s invoked it since 1922. The board's counsel will spend today discovering why nobody's dared print a provable lie about a charter house since 1922. The retraction ran on page 2, boxed in the largest apology font the Prophet possessed, and the acid green quill, readers noticed, went conspicuously quiet on the subject of House Black thereafter, though Skeeter herself took to watching the pair of them across the grounds with the fixed loathing of a foiled specialist, which Hermione noted in her notebook under a heading of her own devising, unresolved, RS, how does she listen where she cannot be? Dumbledore made his approach in the 2nd week of November, and he made it, Harry had to concede, expertly. Not a summons to the tower office, no password, no phoenix, but a walk along the lake shore that happened to intersect theirs, on a gray afternoon with the first snow riding the wind, so that the conversation could be a coincidence between people who wished each other well. "I owe you an account," he said without preamble, which from him was a tactic and a courtesy at once, "of why I have watched you both so closely since June. You will have noticed, you notice most things now, I think. You're worried about the old magic," Hermione said. "You said so at the door." "I am frightened of the old magic," Dumbledore corrected mildly, and let the word stand there in the snow light, deliberately spent. "Let me be exact, since exactness is the coin your house trades in. I have spent a long life studying power and what it does to those it chooses. Wand magic is a tool, it lies in the hand. The old family magics are not tools, they are parties to the relationship, they have preferences, they act, as you have both seen, unasked, and there is no examiner, no court, no countercharm, no colleague of mine anywhere on earth, who can audit what such a magic intends toward 2 children it has, for its own reasons, adopted." The blue eyes were not twinkling now. This was the man underneath, and he was formidable, and he was showing them that on purpose too. "I have made grave mistakes in my life by trusting my own judgment above all other checks. I try nowadays to distrust anything that cannot be checked. Your inheritance cannot be checked, hence an old man's fear." It was honest, Harry thought. Every word of it probably honest and arranged, position over position, like a text in the star tongue. Fear standing over care, care standing over duty, and underneath the whole constellation unmentioned, a sealed will, an untried godfather, a doorstep in Surrey, a boy filed under necessary. The grammar of Albus Dumbledore. Hermione had taught him to read, and he was never going to be able to stop. You could have checked on me, Harry said, any year, any summer. There was a ward on that house, sir. Yours, I think. It never once looked inside. The snow came down between them for a moment unhurried. No, Dumbledore said at last, it never did. That is a fair entry in the ledger, and I will not argue with it. He looked from Harry to Hermione and back, old and bareheaded in the falling gray, and made his bid, the real one, the one the whole walk had existed to deliver. I ask only this. When it asks something of you, the house, and it will, something that feels grand and old and utterly right, come and tell me of it. Not for permission, for a second pair of eyes. Even a compromised pair sees some things. They gave him no promise, and he walked back alone along the shore, and Hermione watched him go with her sight open and reported, quietly, that the man's own weave was the strangest she'd ever read. Knots over knots, whole regions dimmed by grief gone structural, and everywhere, threaded through everything, a black line she couldn't parse that tasted of a debt he was paying to somebody dead. He believes every word he says, she said. That's what makes him dangerous. Skeeter lies and knows it. He arranges truths and calls the arrangement necessity, and the will, filed under necessity. She turned up her collar against the wind. We watch him with everything else, Harry. He's not the hand that fed the goblet, but he'll try to be the hand that steers what comes out of it. What came out of it on the 24th of November was dragons. They'd known for days, Hagrid's midnight invitation having shown Harry 4 nesting mothers in a roaring paddock, and the knowing had reorganized the house's whole strategy, because Harry had stood in the trees above that paddock with his ward sense wide open, and made a discovery that none of Charlie Weasley's handlers, wands out, shields humming, seemed anywhere near. Dragons warded. Not as wizards did, nothing cast, nothing built. It was in them, native as heat. Each nesting mother sat at the center of her own arrangement, a fierce tight weave thrown over clutch and ground. All who approach are known, and the weave's grammar, old and simple and absolutely without pity, was the same grammar as the kitchen arch at Grimmauld. Hearthlaw. The original Hermione breathed when he described it, the wild form, older than houses, what hearth warding was domesticated from, and then she had gone silent with the enormity of where the logic went, and Harry had finished the walk himself, because it was his art now in his neck. You didn't fight a warded hearth. You presented yourself at it. The first task before 3,000 spectators therefore ran as follows. Cedric Diggory transfigured a dog and lost half his face to a Swedish short-snout's temper. Fleur de Lacquer charmed her dragon to sleep and lost her skirt to its snoring flame. Victor Crumb blinded his with a conjunctivitis curse and lost points to a crushed clutch of real eggs. And Harry Potter, fourth and last, on whom the Horntail had been saved, walked out into the roaring stone bowl with his wand holstered, stopped at the exact boundary where the dragon's weave met the churned sand, a line no instrument in the stadium could see, and bowed. The crowd's noise fell into a vast communal frowning. He stayed down, eyes up, the way you bow to a hippogriff, the way you bow to anything old enough to deserve the truth, and along his own arrangement, ring and hearth and house, in the wild first grammar that needed no words because it predated the need, he presented himself at her fire. I am the heir of a hearth. I keep it for my family. I have not come for your eggs. Your ward has weighed every soul in this bowl. Weigh me. The Horntail's head came down out of the smoke, slow as a drawbridge, and the yellow eye, a foot from his face, held him for the longest 11 seconds ever clocked by a commentating Ludo bagman, and what moved between them in those seconds no one in the stands would ever hear. The vast, irritable, exhausted fury of a mother staked in sand before a shrieking crowd, her clutch handled by men with burns for hands, and among her own true eggs one cold thing, one wrong thing, one golden lie planted at dawn by the same species now baying at the fences. And her ward had known it from the first minute, and her whole body ached to be rid of it, and here at last, at the rim of her stolen hearth, stood one small creature of the shrieking species whose arrangement she could actually read. Keeper of a fire, come honestly asking leave. She took the golden egg from among her own with a surgeon's delicacy, in jaws that could shear a horse, and rolled it across the sand to his feet. Then she looked at the judge's box and roared once with everything in her, a sound that relieved several hundred people of their hats, and the meaning of it needed no grammar at all. Get out of my nursery. Harry picked up the egg, bowed again, and walked off the sand into a silence so complete he could hear the snitch flutter of Rita Skeeter's quill dying of frustration, followed by the loudest noise 3,000 people had ever produced in Scotland. The judges, having conferred invisible disorder, awarded him first place by a margin that made Karkaroff spit, Bagman bellowing over the stands that in 40 years of magical sport he had never, that the boy hadn't cast a single, that unless his eyes deceived him the dragon had apologized, and high in the teachers' rows, unnoticed by almost everyone, Albus Dumbledore did not cheer. He sat with his fingers steepled at his lips, watching the small figure and the settling dragon with an expression from very far away, and Hermione, watching him from the student's side with the sight cracked open, saw the black unparsable thread through his weave pull taut as a mooring rope in a tide. She wrote in the notebook on the moody page which had been accumulating entries all term, flask again at task, drinks on the hour every hour. And below it the terms true mystery, underlined twice. His eye can see through everything, so why does his weave look like a door held shut from inside? The aftermath of the task ran for a week, and it ran on 3 tracks at once, which was the shape of their lives now. There was the school track, Gryffindor Tower ankle deep in cake, Fred and George composing a ballad titled The Bow that had 4 verses by midnight and legal problems by Tuesday, and Hermione leaning over during Ron's 4th staged retelling to murmur, "Let them have it. They're not cheering the house, you know, they're cheering you," which was, as usual, the part that mattered. There was the professional track, which was a letter from Charlie Weasley that Ron delivered with his eyebrows already at his hairline, 4 pages of Dragon Handler's shop in a scrawl that got faster as it went, that the Horntail had eaten better and slept sounder since the task than any transported nesting mother he'd ever logged, that she'd stopped flaming the handlers on the boundary side where Harry had stood. That the Romanian sanctuary's oldest keeper, a woman nobody argued with, had watched the prophet's picture of the bow for a long time, and then said something in Romanian that Charlie translated cautiously, as the old courtesy has come back, and had then gone through the sanctuary's archive and sent, enclosed, a copy of a woodcut 3 centuries old. A figure at the edge of a nest circle, head bowed, hand open, and around the nest, unmistakable even in crude ink, a boundary line drawn in tiny stitched marks. "She says our lot warded nests," Charlie wrote. "Says the Handlers' Guild grew out of it and forgot. Says, and I quote, 'Ask the boy whose family kept the grammar to come and see us when there isn't a circus on. Harry, mate, what are you?'" "A neighbor," said Hermione, reading over his shoulder with satisfaction, and made a copy of the woodcut for the notebook. And there was the 3rd track, the quiet one, which was Cedric Diggory waiting for him outside the greenhouses 2 days after, shifting his weight and finally getting it out. "Everyone asking what spell it was," Cedric said. "I keep telling them it obviously wasn't one, and they look at me like I've lost it. It wasn't a trick, was it? You actually asked her." He shook his head slowly. 3 schools of us in there armed to the teeth, and the winning move was manners. I'm going to be thinking about that for years. He put out his hand, and that was the beginning of the only uncomplicated friendship the tournament ever produced, and of a handshake that would be offered again on the castle steps in June before the weather closed in. The Yule Ball nearly undid them, and it was Ron, of all the season's hazards, who did the damage and the mending both. He asked Hermione late, badly, and as a last resort in front of half the common room, on the visible logic that she was a girl and available. And Hermione, who had by then refused 2 7th-year purebloods with genealogical motives and 1 extremely polite Durmstrang boy with none, went up to the dormitory white around the mouth and did not come down. And Harry, who had been going to ask her all week and had kept not asking because asking had begun, that autumn, to weigh more than a school friend's question should weigh, followed Ron out to the greenhouses and had at the age of 14 the first fully adult argument of his life on a frozen path with his best friend. "You don't get to treat her as furniture," he said. "Not you. The whole school has spent all term deciding what she is because of a ring. You're the one who's supposed to know better." Like you know better, Ron's ears had gone past red into the color that meant the truth was coming out sideways, hurt first. "You 2 live in a world now. You've got a house and a ledger and a Raven post office. You talk in looks across the breakfast table, and I get the guided tour on Sundays if I'm lucky. I asked her like she was furniture because I've spent 4 months feeling like furniture, mate. At least I said something. You were just going to let the whole ball happen around the pair of you and call it protecting her." The greenhouse glass ticked in the cold. Harry stood in the ruin of his own righteousness and found, with some effort, the honest floor of it. "You're right," he said, "about me, not about how you asked her." "Yeah," Ron kicked the path, "I know." He apologized to her that night, publicly in the common room, ears incandescent, with a formality so unlike him that the room went quiet on its own. Sorry for how he'd asked, sorrier for why, and she was worth asking first, always had been. Everyone knew it but the 2 thickest blokes in Gryffindor. Then he took himself off to ask Padma Paddle with what dignity remained and left the field deliberately, conspicuously, kindly, in the manner of Ron Weasley making a move that cost him in calling it strategy. So Harry asked her. On the stairs that same night, with no speech prepared, holding the moment out between them the way you hold something at a hearth. "Come to the ball with me, not for the house, for me." "Took you 4 months, said Hermione. "I'm told I'm the thickest bloke in Gryffindor." Second thickest, it was a formal ranking. But her hand had found the banister as though the stairs had moved, and the silver line between them rang, ring to ring, 1 clean bright note that the castle's wards picked up and carried, gently, the length of the tower, and neither of them mentioned that, then or for years. They went as friends because they were 14 and were friends, and it was, both would insist for the rest of their lives, the best evening of that whole gaudy, dangerous year. She wore blue with her grandmother's silver comb. He'd learned to dance from Sirius by miracle in 3 catastrophic evenings. They danced twice, ate too much, laughed at the same 17 things without needing to point at any of them, and were photographed once by the prophet's man in the instant of laughing, a photograph that would be reprinted for decades over captions neither of them ever authorized. Crumb asked her for a dance and got one and was courteous, and watched her walk back to Harry afterward with the expression of a seeker marking where the snitch nests. The castle, sentimental as every old building, kept one candelabra lit above their table long after the halls others had guttered. It was on the walk back, 1 in the morning, castle quiet, her shoes in her hand, that the year turned. They took the long way because neither of them proposed the short one, up the west stairs where the windows held the black lake and the winter stars, and they were arguing lazily about the egg, which still screamed like a sawmill whenever opened, when Hermione stopped on the landing mid-word, and every line of her went hunting, still. Moody was crossing the entrance hall below, alone, late, limping toward the stairs to his office, and she had looked down at him with the sight half open and the ball's ease still in her, unguarded, and so she finally saw it, the thing the held-shut door in his weave had been hiding all term, visible only now, only at this angle, only in the seconds when the man believed himself unwatched and let the enormous effort sag. A second arrangement underneath the first. 2 weaves in one flesh, the outer one worn like a coat, the inner one knotted to it at flask, at eye, at leg, at every point a polyjuice potion has to anchor. Harry, her voice came out in the register she kept for parseless things. There are 2 people in Professor Moody, and one of them is wearing the other. They did not sleep that night. They took the discovery to the one room in the castle they had swept themselves, an abandoned classroom off the 4th-floor gallery, whose walls Harry had spent an October evening persuading into a light hearth arrangement. Nothing grand, all who enter are known stitched into old stone that remembered being warded once and had missed it. And there, with the mirror propped against a stack of desks and Sirius's face in it sharp with the hour, they held the house's first council of war. "Say the weave part again," Sirius said, slowly, 2 arrangements in one body. Hermione had her notes out, of course. She'd written them on the walk-up in the dark, legibly. "The outer one is Moody. I want to be precise. It is actually Moody, his pattern, his history. The eye and the leg are real and they're his. But it's worn, Sirius, it's a coat. The knots holding it to the body underneath renew on the hour and they anchor at the flask. Polyjuice doesn't just change your face, it drapes the other person's arrangement over yours, and if you keep it up for months the drape starts to felt like wool, the 2 weaves matting together. That's what I saw, 4 months of felting. Underneath there's a second pattern, younger, and she chose the word with tongs, devoted. The inner weave points at something the way compass needles point. I've only ever read one arrangement that pointed like that, and it was the thing we put under the door." The mirror was silent for a moment. When Sirius spoke again, the flippancy was gone so completely it was hard to remember his face wore it at all. "A marked man wearing Alastor Moody inside Hogwarts teaching you curses 4 months, and Moody himself, alive, or the coat would rot. Polyjuice needs the donor living. Which means he's kept somewhere close, somewhere the wearer can reach for fresh." Hermione stopped and finished the sentence as a black would positionally. "Somewhere in the wearer's own arrangement, his office. He'd keep the real one in his own office. It's the trunk, Harry. The 7-lock trunk he keeps his dark detectors on. The whole room is a lie built over its own evidence." "Then we take it to Dumbledore," Sirius said, "tonight." And it was a mark of how the year had gone that both children in the mirror light looked back at him with the same expression, and that he sighed and rubbed his face and said, "Go on, give me the arithmetic." Harry gave it. He'd been assembling it since the entrance hall, the way he assembled everything now, arrangement over arrangement, and it came out with a coldness that would have alarmed him in June, and was simply the house's grammar in his mouth by Christmas. "What's our proof? A sight nobody else has, reading weaves nobody else can check. Dumbledore told us himself, that's his whole fear about us, that we can't be audited. If we accuse a war hero on Hermione's word, one of 3 things happens. He believes us, moves on the office, and whoever's under the coat dies of the mark before anyone asks him a question, because devoted things don't get taken alive, and we lose the only thread that leads back to whoever fed my name to the goblet. Or he doesn't believe us, and we've taught the whole staff table what Hermione's eyes can do, which is currently the only weapon we own that nobody knows exists. Or the one I actually lose sleep over. He already knows something's wrong with Moody, has known for months, and is running his own line into it, in which case walking into his office with this hands him our entire hand and we go back to being pieces." He looked at the mirror. "The imposter's job is the tournament. The tournament runs to June. He can't strike early without unraveling 4 months of beautiful work, so the coat protects us exactly as long as we let it think it's working. We watch, we learn what it's for, and we make sure that whatever is planned for the 3rd task happens to people who have had 6 months to get ready on ground we've had 6 months to prepare." "Merlin," Sirius said quietly, "you sound like my grandfather. Is that a warning? It's a compliment." Sirius Black kept this family alive through 2 Dark Lords by knowing exactly when not to tell Albus Dumbledore things. The mirror image glanced at something off frame, the way he did when he was checking the ledger, and came back. "Conditions, though, or I'm coming up there in dog form to chaperone. The Raven watches his window from tonight. That's the Rookery's business, and no ward will read a bird. Neither of you is ever alone with him." And if the inner weave so much as twitches toward either of you, the house stops being subtle. Those are a guardian's terms. Yes, yes, they said together. The raven took up its post on the ledge above the defense office window the next morning, and became, over the following weeks, such a fixture that the impostor himself was heard to grumble about Scottish crows, at which the raven, who held opinions about being called a crow, began reporting his hourly flask schedule to the rookery out of what Hermione could only describe as spite. The egg they solved in January, and the solving of it became, briefly, legend in Gryffindor Tower because they did it at breakfast. Harry had brought the golden egg down on a dare of Ron and opened it one final time to prove the awfulness to Seamus, and the shriek emptied half the table as usual. Hermione, who had been buttering toast with the sight idling half open the way other people hum, looked at the shriek. Then she put down her knife, said Element, in the tone of a woman remembering where she left her keys, took the screaming egg out of Harry's hands and dunked it in Ron's water jug. The mermish came up through the water sweet and clear as struck glass, an hour past noon, looked to the lake. We've taken what you'll sorely miss, audible the length of the table, and she narrated her own reasoning over it to a rapt audience because that would always be her one genuine vanity. It's not a scream, it's a song arranged for the wrong element. Position grammar. Air stands over water, so in air it reads as agony. Put water over air and the same arrangement reads as, she lifted the jug slightly, letting the song swell, an invitation. Everything in this tournament is the house's kind of problem, honestly. I don't know why they bother with wands. Because we're not all secret medieval royalty, said Ron, mopping his goblet off his lap, but he said it grinning, and he was the one who leaned over the jug afterward, listening to the whole verse twice and went pale on their behalf when the words sank in. We've taken what you'll sorely miss. They take something of yours, down there, under the lake in February in Scotland. He looked up. Mate, what do you even own? Harry, who was watching Hermione recork her ink bottle with the egg's water still shining on her wrists, heard the question land somewhere the whole table couldn't see, and said, nothing they'd know to take, and was wrong, and part of him knew it even then, the part that had been listening all year to a line of silver ring between two rings like a wire in the wind. February assembled itself around the task with the particular bureaucratic momentum of the ministry doing spectacle. Platforms on the lake, delegations, boats repositioned, bagmen everywhere, booming. Harry trained for the water the house's way and the school's way both. Gillyweed sourced through Neville's kindness and Dobby's genius as insurance. But the real preparation happened in the abandoned classroom, evening after evening, where he learned from a book of the Fenn's house, couriered up by Raven Relay in 3 parts, the art the family called deep-keeping. The extension of hearth law into dark water, which the blacks of the 17th century had used to ward their ill fisheries and their smuggling coves, all who swim here are known. It was cold art, Fenn cold, older feeling than the kitchen arch, and the lake, when he practiced the first arrangements off the boathouse jetty at dusk, answered with an eagerness the book's own author had never recorded. Hogwarts's water had been warded once, long ago, by whoever cut the castle's first stones, and the old lines were all still down there in the silt, unfed for centuries, and they rose to his hand like pond fish who remember bread. The whole lake, he reported to Hermione, walking back up in the blue dark, still lit with it, waterlight running off his ward scents in rings. Every rock of it remembers being kept. The merpeople sing to the old lines. They've kept them half alive from their side. They'll know the second I feed the weave. It's their hearth, too. I'm not going down there as a champion. I'm going down as he hunted for it. As a neighbor, she said, calling on family business. As a neighbor. He glanced at her sidelong in the last of the light. Whatever they take from me, I'll have the whole water on my side getting it back. I know, she said. I've read your homework. You'll be insufferable and it will be magnificent. And she knocked her shoulder against his, ink-stained, entirely unafraid, 4 days before the morning she wasn't at breakfast. It went the way such things go, quietly, officially in the night, with a summons from McGonagall that Hermione, being Hermione, obeyed, leaving her notebook squared on her bedside table with her wand laid across it like a paperweight, because you don't take contraband to a professor's office. The staff would say afterward, all of them, that the enchanted sleep was painless, was standard, was consented to by her head of house and loco parentis, was, in Bagman's cheerful phrase at the champion's briefing, all part of the show. Harry woke at 3 in the morning with the silver line pulled taut through the middle of him, humming a note it had never made, distance and depth and cold, and lay still for exactly 4 seconds, reading it the way the house had spent 9 months teaching him to read everything. Then he got up and dressed and stood at the tower window. The lake lay black under black hills. Somewhere under it, in the keeping of people who had decided, without asking either of them, that she was a thing of his that could be borrowed for sport, Hermione slept at the end of the one line in the world he could follow blind. On the ledge outside, the raven turned its back to the wind, on watch. All part of the show, Harry said to the glass, in a voice that any black on the tapestry would have recognized, and went awake the water. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The black and the bright, the morning of the second task came up iron gray, with a wind off the mountains that turned the lake's surface to hammered lead, and 3,000 spectators in scarves discovered, filing onto the floating platforms, that the water around the pilings lay unnaturally, mirror-perfectly still. The judges noticed too. Nobody said anything because there was nothing in the rules about the lake's mood. Harry stood at the platform's edge in the champions' row and heard Bagman's patter roll past him unattended. 60 seconds to the cannon, gillyweed a soft bitter wad in his cheek, unswallowed, insurance he already knew he wouldn't need, because he had been down at the boathouse since 4 in the morning, and the lake and he had concluded their business before the first official arrived. It had not been a negotiation. That was what none of them would ever understand, the judges, the papers, the delegations. There had been nothing to negotiate. He had walked out onto the jetty in the black end of night with the silver line pulling taut through his chest toward the deep middle water where she lay sleeping, and he had knelt and put both hands flat on the water as though it were stone, which for him by hearth law, by the old lines in the silt that had been keeping this water since the castle's first stones were cut, it was, and he had fed the whole drowned weave of it in the wild first grammar, and said what a keeper says. One of mine lies in your dark. She was taken sleeping without her yes by people who mean it kindly and never asked. That is done, I'll settle it above in my own way. But hear the arrangement, old neighbor, and pass it down. Nothing in this water stands between me and her this morning. Nothing. Down in the deep, ancient courses of ward light had turned over in the silt like eels waking and lit one by one a road. The cannon went. Cedric, Fleur, and Crumb hit the water in 3 fine sprays of athletic commitment. Harry stepped off the platform and did not splash. He went down through the gray world walking, or something the eye recorded as walking. The water made way ahead of him and closed behind, a moving room of air and silver light descending the lake's long dark stairs, and the crowd on the platforms went from roaring to murmuring to a silence you could have anchored ships in, because the giant squid had risen alongside him like an honor guard, and the road he walked was visible from the surface. Seam of pale light running down into the black, old as the castle, lit for one morning only. The merpeople met him at the bounds of their city with spears grounded, which their oldest song said was how you met the water's keeper, and their chief sang the formal grief of hosts who have been made party to a discourtesy. The hostages given under the surface people's seal, the sleep laid on them by the surface people's chief, no harm meant, all part, the song said with a distaste that survived translation of the show. She hung tethered by the ankle to a stone pillar between 3 other sleepers, hair moving with the water like the weed at the road's edge, notebook hand curled loose against the current, and the cold that came off Harry then had nothing to do with the lake. Every merperson in the plaza recorded it and remembered it generations, the small keeper's face when he saw the tether. He did not cut her loose first. He turned to the chief and asked, in signs and hearth grammar, one question: did any of the 4 consent? The chief sang that the little ones had been asleep before the water touched them, all 4, sleeping when given like pledges, like objects. Then the arrangement is this, Harry said, and the water carried his voice to every ear it needed to reach, above and below, because the lake was his this morning and he meant it to be minuted. All 4 go up, not mine first because she's mine, all 4 together now because none of them said yes. The tournament can time us however it likes. The House of Black does not race for hostages, the lake did it. Not Harry, the lake, the old kept water, moving under all 4 sleepers at once with a gentleness that made the merchief ground his spear in salute. 4 columns of silverlit water rising through the gray like slow fountains. Cedric and Crumb and Fleur intercepted mid-swim, bewildered, escorted upward with their hostages beside them by a current that declined all argument, and the crowd on the platforms came apart entirely as the surface bloomed and delivered up every child at once, 11 minutes into a 2-hour task, in a circle of sudden warmth where the iron wind, for 100 feet in any direction, had simply stopped being cold. Hermione woke in the air and the light held by the water at the exact temperature of a held hand, and the first thing in the world her eyes found working was Harry's face a yard away, wet-haired, blazing calm, and the second was the tether's cut end still looped at her ankle, and she read the whole morning off those 2 facts in about a second and a half because she was the brightest witch of her age. You warded the lake, she said. Bit of it was already warded, I just fed it. You fed the lake. Her ankle came free, she trod water in the impossible warmth, delegates shrieking, bagman howling numbers into the enchanted megaphone somewhere above, and she began, helplessly, furiously, to laugh. The task said retrieve your hostage, and you audited the ethics, requisitioned a body of water, and unionized the merpeople. The house doesn't race for hostages. No. The laughter stilled into something that lived very close under it, and her hand found his under the water, ring to ring. The silver line between them slacked now, singing at rest, and 3,000 people watched 2 14-year-olds float in a circle of warm lake under an iron sky, and had no idea what they were looking at. No, it doesn't. Get me to the platform, keeper. I want to be dry and vertical when I explain consent law to a panel of international judges. The judging collapsed twice, once when the merchief surfaced, unprecedented in tournament history, to sing testimony crediting Champion Potter with the correct keeping of the water and the honorable settlement of all 4 pledges. And once when Karkaroff attempted to award 0 on grounds of wholesale interference with the task environment, and was asked by Madame Maxime in a carrying voice whether the environment had lodged a complaint. They gave him first again in the end, jointly with Cedric, an arithmetic everyone understood to be diplomatic and nobody understood less than the 2 boys, who shook on it laughing. But the photograph that ran on every front page in magical Europe the next morning was not of the judging. It was of the lake itself, taken from the north stands at the moment the 4 columns rose. The leaden water alight down its middle with a seam of silver, old as anything in Britain, and walking up out of it, unhurried, a boy with a sleeping girl's hand in his, at the head of a procession of every stolen child, under a headline that ran, in the prophet's largest available type, "The lake knows its lord." "The lake knows its neighbor," Harry said irritably at breakfast, to general incomprehension, and Hermione clipped the headline for the notebook anyway, because primary sources were primary sources even when they were wrong. Sirius mirror called 2 nights after the task, and he called with the mirror propped somewhere new. The drawing room at Grimmauld, angled so that the frame held not his face but the tapestry wall, silver tree on black cloth, lamplit. "Before I say anything," his voice came from off frame, "I want it on record that I went into dust. Creature's territory, I know, but he was busy enshrining the newspaper photograph of the lake. We've had words about it. There's a doily involved. Look at the low branch, your branch." They looked, heads together, over the mirror in the abandoned classroom. On the great tapestry every line of descent ran vertical, parent to child, marriage to issue, 10 centuries of the family's grammar written downward in dutiful silver. Every line but one. Between Harry James and Hermione Jean, stitched horizontally, joining them not as spouses were joined on that wall, nor as siblings, nor as anything else the tapestry had a convention for, ran a single thread of silver brighter than all the rest of the tree, and the thread was not straight. It was woven over and under itself, a cord of 2 strands. It appeared the night of the task, Sirius said, coming around into frame, and his face was doing several things at once, none of them simple. "I've been through every genealogical text in this library. There's no precedent for a horizontal line. Marriage gets a bracket, blood gets a vertical, and this gets a new stitch nobody's seen before, so this afternoon I gave up on books and asked Creature, who looked at it for a long time and then looked at me like I was the last idiot of a proud line which is fair, and said, 'It is not a marriage line or a blood line, it is a load-bearing line,' and then he went back to his doily." Sirius rubbed his face. "Load-bearing, the tapestry thinks you 2 are holding something up." "The house," Hermione said quietly, "were the 2 handprints it's been telling us since the door." "Yeah, well," Sirius looked from one to the other of them, and the several things his face was doing resolved into the main one, which was the fierce, untidy tenderness of a man who'd been given, late and against all odds, people to be responsible for. "House's lane is all I'm saying. Mind your footing, both of you. And come home at Easter. Creature's begun cooking for it already. It's February, we can't stop him." The school, meanwhile, had gone quietly mad around them, because the school had watched a lake stand up for a 14-year-old, and the lake had been the last straw for a certain kind of observer. The pureblood letters home tripled. 2 separate ministry owls invited Harry, with mounting politeness, to informational teas he declined through the solicitors. A Ravenclaw 6th year was caught attempting to photograph Hermione's notebook, and was discovered, before any staff arrived, to be dangling by his own hem from a statue of Boris, the bewildered that nobody had ever previously seen move. And Victor Crumb, world-class at exactly one thing besides flying, which was recognizing professionals, took to training his morning laps around the lake at whatever hour Harry walked its shore, until the walking and the flying fell in together, and a strange, taciturn half-friendship assembled itself out of shared silences and a mutual refusal to discuss the prophet. It was Crumb, in the end, who said the thing the whole school was circling. He said it in March, leaning on the boathouse rail, watching Hermione cross the far lawn with her bag of library plunder, and he said it without preamble or embroidery, in the manner of a man reporting a match statistic. "I asked her to visit me in Bulgaria in the summer. She said no." He rolled his shoulders, philosophical. "I ask why. She thinks, and then she says her summers are load-bearing. I have no idea what this means. But I look at her and I look at you, and I know what a bonded pair looks like when I see one fly." He pushed off the rail, collected his broom, and delivered, as he went, the only piece of advice Victor Crumb ever gave anyone at Hogwarts. "Whatever league you 2 are in, don't let them make you play in theirs." Ron heard about the tapestry line the same week from them directly, because the orchard rule had held all year. He got things before the world did, or the world got an earful. He turned the mirror photograph Sirius had sent over in his hands, the woven silver cord bright between their 2 names, and was quiet long enough that both of them braced, and then he said, "Load-bearing," and snorted and handed it back. "That's the least romantic thing I've ever heard. Trust your mental house." He stretched out his legs toward the common room fire, hands behind his head, 14 months of adjustment arriving somewhere solid. Bill curse breaks for Gringotts, you know. He says the old places, the really old ones, never waste thread. If it's woven double, it's because one strand alone would have snapped by now. He closed his eyes, entirely comfortable, the best of him out where they could see it. Tell your house from me. About time somebody put it in writing. The summons to the headmaster's office came 9 days after the task, and it came correctly, which told them everything about how seriously the far side was taking it. Not a note down a prefect's hand, but a formal card by School Owl, naming a time, naming both of them, and closing in a fine slanted hand with the sentence that pulled the pin. I have taken the liberty of consulting certain instruments regarding the connection between you, and believe we should discuss what they report. AD instruments, Hermione said, in the voice other people used for slurs. Office received them with all its silver engines whirring, Fawkes drowsing on his perch, the portraits of 40 headmasters arranged in attitudes of theatrical sleep, and among them, wide awake, making no pretense otherwise, the sardonic dark gaze of Phineas Nigellus Black following the two of them from frame to frame as they crossed the room, one eyebrow at an altitude that in the family grammar meant, "Children, you are observed, comport yourselves." Dumbledore did them the courtesy of no tea and no preamble. When Miss Granger was taken to the lake, he said, you woke at the moment of her taking from a dead sleep 3 towers away. You located her through 1,000 yards of dark water without a searching charm. I have spent 9 days confirming what I suspected in June and set aside as impossible. There is a bond between you of a category that has not been documented in these islands in 4 centuries, and I must tell you plainly, the last documented cases ended in tragedy, all of them. Soul-adjacent bindings between children were banned as familial magic in 1622, not out of prudishness, but because the histories are unanimous. 2 minds grown together do not survive separation, and life, my young friends, is separation, distance, quarrel, imprisonment, death. What the House of Black has written between you is beautiful, and it is a hostage arrangement with the whole of fate, and you are 14. He set his half-moon spectacles on the desk, which aged him a decade, and made the bid Harry had felt coming down the lakeshore path since November. I have found in the literature 3 procedures for the gentling of such bonds: loosening, not severance, a slackening of the weave, reversible in adulthood. If grown and informed you chose it again, I would perform none of them without your full consent. But I ask you to consider giving it, because no one has ever loved such a bond and been glad of it at the graveside, and I would spare you what I—" and there he stopped himself, one word too late, an old man's grief surfacing whole for a single second before the deep pulled it back under. The office ticked. Fawkes had opened one eye. Hermione spoke first, and she spoke gently, which Harry knew by now was her at her most absolute. "Headmaster, I've read the 1622 literature. Margrave's compendium, both appendices and the Wisengamot transcripts of the band debate. The library here has them, filed under family law, which should have been the first clue. You're right that the documented cases ended terribly, all 11 of them." She let the number arrive. 11 cases in 400 years, everyone a bond forced by parents, for alliance on children who had no say and grew up strangers chained at the soul. The compendium's own conclusion, Appendix 2, page 9, is that the deaths were caused by the forcing, not the binding, and Margrave recommended regulation, not prohibition. The Wisengamot banned instead because 1622 was the year the new ministry was breaking the charter houses, and familial magic that couldn't be audited was politically inconvenient, which is, if you'll forgive me, a sentence with a certain resonance this afternoon. She folded her hands. Our bond wasn't forced. It was written after the fact, describing something we'd already done freely. The house didn't chain us together, sir, it noticed. And, said Harry, we brought you a document too. He laid the goblin-sealed copy of his parents' will on the desk, face up, turned so the reader would meet Lily's capitals right way round, and watched Albus Dumbledore, who had survived Grindelwald and Voldemort in a century of Wisengamot politics, read 4 lines and become, for the length of them, an old man alone in a tower with something he had buried. The silence went on for some time. Phineas Nigellus in his frame had gone very still, all sardonicism suspended. "You have known since summer," Dumbledore said at last, "since the 2nd day. And you said nothing all year while I—" He stopped and folded his hands, and Harry watched him take the blow properly, decline every one of the exits his own eloquence would have built him, the war, the blood wards, the greater good, each one visibly considered and visibly set down. What was left, when he finally spoke, was smaller and truer than any speech. "I told myself the seal was mercy, yours, Petunia's, mine. A boy should not grow up knowing his mother's family was forbidden him and given him anyway. That is what I told myself, and I have had 13 years of practice at believing what I tell myself, and the proof is on my desk." He looked up, and the blue eyes held neither twinkle nor tears, only at long last the thing they'd been owed all year, full price. "You did not come today to hear me say I am sorry, though I am. You came to show me why you will not hand this school your bond for gentling." "We came," Hermione said, "to establish the terms. You asked us in November to bring the house's askings to you for a second pair of eyes. All right, here's the first asking we're bringing. The house asks us to trust it, and we do, and we're not submitting the one piece of magic that's never lied to either of us to procedures out of a literature written by its enemies. She stood, and Harry stood with her unrehearsed in one movement, which was itself the argument. The bond is family business. The tournament, the false name in the goblet, whoever's hunting Harry, that's common cause, and you'll find us allies, real ones. But the wall between those two things is a charter wall, headmaster. We didn't build it. Your Wisengamot did in 1622. We're just the first people in 4 centuries standing on the old side of it. They were at the door when he spoke again, and the question, they agreed afterward, was the truest thing the office had produced all afternoon. It was the sound of the actual man, calculation and care fused past separating, asking the thing the instruments couldn't. Does it frighten you, what you are to each other? They looked at each other. The line between them sat slack and warm, an old rope on a summer dock, 4 years of divided toast and finished sentences and libraries and lake water, and the honest answer was so large that Harry gave the small, true corner of it that fit through a doorway. Being alone frightened us, he said. We tried it first. Good afternoon, Professor. Phineas Nigellus waited until the door had closed and the children's footsteps had died down the spiral stair before he strolled to the front of his frame, examined the man at the desk with 200 years of family judgment, and delivered the portrait's verdict. The black and the bright, he said. It's on the tapestry in silver, Albus. I've been to look. In my great-grandmother's day, they'd have rung the bells for a week. He tucked his painted hands behind his back. You sealed a will against that boy and proposed scissors for that bond, and they gave you law, precedent, and mercy and left you standing. I begin to think the house knew exactly what it was doing. A pause, and the old malice gentled into something rarer. You'd have taken their offer, you know, the second pair of eyes. 50 years ago you'd have wept for an offer like that. I know, said Albus Dumbledore to the will on the desk. Kindly fetch me the ministry file on the 1622 ban, Phineas. If I am to be an ally behind a charter wall, I had better learn the masonry. Easter they went home, because the house sent for them. It did it with perfect manners and no ambiguity. On the first morning of the holidays, a raven delivered to each of them a single silver leaf, real, cool as coin, veined with fine dark script, and the script, when Hermione parsed it, was one word long in the tongue of stars, arranged in the imperative of invitation, the form, her grammar noted, used by the house itself perhaps a dozen times a millennium. Come. Sirius met them in the hall at Grimmauld, and one look at his face told them the leaves hadn't gone out alone. The whole house has been rearranging for 3 days, he said. Creatures polish things I can't identify. The lamps keep processing down the kitchen stairs and waiting at the bottom like ushers. Whatever you two decided this term, he searched their faces, found it, and something in his own settled, pride and fright and family all at once. It's decided back. The black stone door stood as it had stood for a year, silver-grained, patient, 2 handprints inlaid flush. They had stood before it as newly written children, and it had weighed them and said, not yet, learn the tongue first and be sure of what you are. A year of tongue, a lake, a dragon, a liar in a coat, a will on a desk, and an office where they had stood up in one movement and named themselves aloud. The bond is family business. We're the first people in 4 centuries standing on the old side of the wall. They were sure, they had been sure, Harry thought, since a tower in June. The year had merely been the house waiting, courteous as winter, for them to catch up to their own signatures. Palm to print, hers to the smaller, his to the larger. The door did not open. The door unwas the whole slab of quarried night, dissolving upward into the dark grain of itself like ink returning to water, and the undercroft breathed out at them a century of kept cold. And the cold was clean, cellar clean, the cold of a place that had never once been profaned. And down the revealed stair, one by one, in order, blue silver lamps were lighting. And beneath everything, no longer muffled by rock, the river note rose up around them at last unmuted, and it was not a note. It was a chord. They went down together, Sirius one respectful step behind, Creature at the rear bearing, unasked, the oldest lamp in the house. The undercroft was one room, and it was vast, vaster than the house above could account for, its ceiling lost, its floor a single sheet of the black star-grained stone, and it was not a treasury. That was the first great surprise, that after a year of the world assuming vaults and weapons, the family's holiest room held almost nothing. A ring of standing stones the size of chairs, a stone table bearing one book whose cover matched the ledger's raven feather black, and filling the far wall entire, the thing the cord was coming from. It was an arch. Wide as a church door and tall in proportion, cut from stone older than the room, and within it hung a veil that was not cloth. A fall of gray-silver twilight, moving gently in a wind from nowhere, and through the movement, if you stood still, you could hear what Harry had been hearing under everything for a year, the long deep river running in the dark, and it was voices. Not frightening. That was the impossible thing, the thing no ministry would ever believe of any room belonging to the House of Black. The arch stood at the bottom of the family's house like a hearth stands at the center of a kitchen, and what came off it was not menace but patience, the patience of a door kept, tended, swept, watched, honored for 1,000 years. There's one like it in the Department of Mysteries, Sirius said, very low. They keep it in a pit and study it like a specimen. Unspeakables lose colleagues to it. He stared up the gray fall of it. Merlin, theirs is feral, this one's kept. This one has keepers, said the room. The voice came from the ring of standing stones, and with it, out of the star-grained floor, the remembrance rose. Not ghosts, not portraits, nothing so crude, but arrangements of silver light in the forms of the dead, seated and standing around the ring the way family arranges itself in a kitchen, dozens of them, then more, rank behind rank into the upward dark, and every one of them wore the face of a name from the tapestry, and at their front, closest to the arch, stood a woman. She was old and young in the way the tree in the dream was old and young. Her hair was black, her eyes were the gray the whole family recycled down its centuries, and her form burned steadier than all the ranked others together, the way the first writing of a word stands under all its copies, and Hermione knew her instantly, because Hermione had spent a year reading the family's oldest texts and the same hand had cut them all. Vega, she said, Vega Black, you wrote the grammar. I wrote the house, daughter. The remembrance's voice was the river note given consonants, immense and unhurried and kind the way winter is kind, without softness, with absolute reliability. Stone above, tongue within, ledger to keep the accounts, and the keeping at the bottom of it all as it must always be at the bottom. Sit. The dead have waited a long time to explain themselves, and the living have a war arriving, and there's exactly one story that makes sense of both. It is short. We were never a family at the start. We were a garrison. The lamps settled. The rank dead stilled. Creature sat down on the bottom stair with the oldest lamp in his lap like a child at a hearthside, tears already moving down the grooves of his face, hearing at the end of his long service the house speak. Death has doors, said Vega Black. The world wears thin in places as cloth wears at the elbows of the world where too much grief has rubbed. What is on the other side is not evil, it is the other side. But a thin place untended frays, and through a frayed place things pass that should wait in both directions. The dead called back to dance for necromancers, the living pushed through early in job lots by men who discover that an open door makes a magnificent weapon. The first blacks were the family that said, no one owns the doors, therefore someone must keep them. We found this one raw and screaming in a fen. We built the first house over it not to hide it but to warm it, because a kept door, child, a door with a hearth beside it and a family around it and names spoken at it, seals itself. Grief passes properly through a kept door. Nothing passes wrongly. That is the whole art. That was Tauger's purr before the fools, the purpose kept unmixed. Keep the doors of death against all users forever. Nothing else, nothing else. And the house fell, Hermione said softly, when the cord had held a while, because keeping is invisible. A garrison that succeeds for 300 years looks from inside like a rich family with a cellar. The daughter reads. Vega's regard came to rest on her with the whole weight of the rank dead behind it, and it was the tower's attention again, the ledger keeper's, patient and total, and this time it was warm clean through. Yes, peace unmade us as war never could. The purpose needs two, always two, the keeper and the anchor, the one who watches the door and the one who holds the watcher to the warm world, blood and deed, black and bright. And when the house forgot its purpose, it kept breeding keepers and stopped making anchors. Power with nothing arranged over it, my whole line curdling down the centuries into wardens of nothing, worshipping the only word of the motto they could still read. Bellatrix is what a keeper is when the door she was born to keep is a rumor, and the discipline meant for it is loose in the world with a wand. And us, Harry said, it came out level. Below everything, at the bottom of his chest, a year of inexplicable things was sliding into place with the soft, ordered thunder of a lock the size of a life. June, the tower, it wasn't gratitude, you were hiring. We were recognizing. No apology anywhere in the voice, and no tyranny either. The house did not deal in either currency. The rite your godfather spoke was a courtesy, and had been only a courtesy for 200 years, because for 200 years no two had stood inside it who fit the old arrangement. Then a boy who walks toward the dark to guard others stood palm to palm with a girl who turns back time itself to hold him to the world, joined by deed, sealed by their own free choosing of each other, and the house, which had been listening at that courtesy for 8 generations like a widow listening at a door, heard its own grammar spoken alive again. Vega Black leaned toward them, and all the ranked silver dead leaned with her, one movement, one family, one long-held purpose bending at last over its 2 young heirs. We did not make you what you are. Nothing in this room could make what you are. We found you already written in each other's lines, and we did what a ledger does with a true entry. We witnessed. The cord from the arch swelled and pulled back, the whole room breathing once, and in the quiet after, Vega told them the rest. The war arriving, which the dead could feel through the door's own weather, a wrongness abroad in the world's weave, a man who had made himself the exact opposite of everything this room was, not a keeper of death's doors but a burglar of them, who had torn his own soul into deadbolts and jammed them into stolen locks, one of which had lain wrapped in a pillowcase at this room's threshold since August, its whisper held mute by the doors kept cold. The ledger has carried his debt since before your births, Vega said. Blood of this house spilled and unanswered. Regulus, who found the burglar's first lock and died reaching for it. Marley McKinnon of black blood by her grandmother, Doria's line, hunted. Your mother and father heir at the end of a wand guided there by the burglar's own hand. Entry upon entry, and a debt of blood in the old law does not age, does not lapse, and cannot be discharged by anyone but the debtor. He owes this house a reckoning the size of his whole arrangement. One day, and the dead believe it will be soon, he will be fool enough to add to the column with his own hand. The gray eyes, in which the silver grain of the room's every stone moved like slow script, rested on Harry with what a garrison keeps in place of tenderness, which is trust. When he does, the whole account falls due at once, and this house, Little Leaves, has never once in 1,000 years failed to collect. It was Hermione, in the end, hand in Harry's in the Ring of Silver dead, who asked the only question left, the practical one, the anchor's question, and her voice was steady in the vast room. What do you need us to do? What you have already been doing since June, daughter, without being asked, which is why you are standing where you stand. For the first and only time that night, something crossed the ancient voice that a living woman might have called a smile. Keep each other. All keeping starts there. The rest is homework. They came up out of the Undercroft past midnight, all four, into the warm kitchen where the black-silver fire stood up in the hearth to meet them, and nobody said very much, because there are nights that close over words like water. Creature made cocoa with a reverence previously reserved for state occasions. Sirius sat turning his mug in his hands, watching his godson and the girl the ledger wrote unasked argue in fierce whispers over whose notebook the evening belonged in, and over their heads on the wall where no tapestry hung. The house quietly lit 2 lamps and left every other light in London to fend for itself. They went back to school changed in a way that had no outside, which is the way the deepest changes prefer to travel. No one at Hogwarts learned what stood in the cellar of a house in London, but the castle knew something. The suits of armor stopped saluting and began, disconcertingly, bowing, until Harry stood in an empty corridor and formally asked them not to. The staircases developed a tendency to deliver the pair of them, wherever they were going, by routes that passed no one at all. And the sorting hat which Hermione consulted one April evening on a scholarly pretext neither of them believed, listened to 3 sentences of her carefully anonymized question about hypothetical old family magics, was silent for a moment, and then said from its shelf in a voice 1,000 years thicker than the one it sang in, "Keep the door, keeper's girl, and give my regards to the garrison," and would not say one word more. The watch on the impostor tightened as the third task grew a date, because the impostor's own weave was tightening. Hermione read him now in careful slices, never longer than a glance, twice a week, from the far end of the staff table's sightline, and her notebook charted the change like a barometer charting a front. The inner arrangement, devoted pointing, had begun to point harder. Knots were being tied in it, new ones, fresh work laid over the old devotion, the pattern of a man assembling something on a deadline. He's building toward the task, she said in the abandoned classroom in May. Whatever the plan was all year, the third task is the delivery date, and there's something else, and I want to say it carefully because it frightens me, and I refuse to be imprecise about frightening things. She turned the notebook to face Harry and Sirius in the mirror both. The thing his devotion points at. In September it pointed the way a compass points, at something far away. The last month the alignment's changed. Whatever he's devoted to, it's not far away anymore. It's getting nearer, or it's getting stronger, or both, and his weave can feel it, and it's— She chose the word with tongs again and used it anyway, rejoicing. The mirror was quiet, then Sirius said, "Contingencies, again." From the top, and for an hour the 3 of them, with Creature's croak occasionally arriving from off-frame with corrections, walked the whole architecture one more time. The Raven Watch and its signals, the classroom hearth keyed to both their hands, the portkey question, because Hermione had flagged in April that a tournament full of officials was a forest of authorized portkeys, and the easiest place in Britain to hide one unauthorized one. The deepest line, drilled until it was reflex, that if anything went wrong at the task they went to ground and to each other, and to no adult until the weave of the adult had been read. "And if it's him," Harry said at the end into the lamplight. It was the sentence they had spent a year not saying in full, and it arrived now with the calm of a thing rehearsed in private for months. "If the compass is pointing at what we think it's pointing at, if he manages it." The classroom hearth ticked. In the mirror Sirius had gone still, and behind his stillness stood 12 years of knowing exactly what the worst outcome looked like from inside. "Then he'll do it with a ritual," Hermione said, steady, laying it out, the anchor's voice holding the room to the warm world precisely by refusing to flinch. "The old restorations all need the same 3 things, the books agree: bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. And if he spent a year aiming a whole tournament at one particular enemy, then he doesn't just want blood, Harry, he wants yours, specifically, ceremonially, which means every road his servant is building runs to a place where you're bled with intent." She looked up from the notebook, and the firelight found her steady all the way down. so we make sure that if that blood is ever taken, it's the most expensive blood in the history of these islands. Vega said it herself, the house has carried his debt for 20 years, and one day he'll be fool enough to add to the column with his own hand. Her finger came down on the page like a judge's gavel, gently. Blood of the enemy forcibly taken from the heir of the House of Black, at his own altar, by his own order, in front of his own people. If he does that, he isn't resurrecting himself, he's signing. The fire stood up a little in the grate, black at the root, silver at the tip, though no one had built it that color. The house remembers its debts, said Sirius softly from the mirror, and for once it sounded less like a family's old saying than like a sentence being loaded. June came in green and gold. The maze rose on the Quidditch pitch hedge by hedge, 20 feet high and growing, and Bagman herded the 4 champions to its mouth one evening to explain the rules of the final task in a voice that bounced off the darkening stands. The cup at the center, the enchantments between, first to touch it takes the tournament. Cedric walked back up to the castle with Harry afterward, the two of them trading guesses about what the ministry considered appropriate to put in a hedge, and stopped at the entrance steps and said, with the straightforwardness that made him impossible to dislike, "The lake should have been yours outright, everyone knows it. So whatever happens in there, no ghosts between us after, agreed." And put out his hand, and Harry shook it, and would remember the warmth of that handshake later, the way you remember the last landmark before weather closes a mountain. That night on the ledge outside the defense office window, the raven that had kept its post since Christmas watched the lamp within burn until 4 in the morning, and watched the shape of a man neither drink nor sleep but stand at his desk over an unrolled map of the maze, tracing one route through it over and over and over from the mouth to the center, with a finger that trembled at the end of each tracing, in a way no soldier's finger trembles. The rookery received the report before dawn, and passed it down the line to London, where in a warm kitchen a black-silver fire read it, and for the first time in 1,000 years of keeping, began, very quietly, to bank itself high. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, The Debt of Blood. The third task began at dusk on the 24th of June, 1 year to the week since a tower, a hippogriff, and 3 joined hands, and the maze swallowed the 4 champions to a brass band send-off under a sky the color of cooling iron. Inside, the hedges ate the band first, then the crowd, then the light. Harry moved through the green corridors with his wand out and his other sense wider open than it had ever been, and what it read made his skin prickle worse than any blast-ended scrute. The maze was a weave, of course, everything was. Ministry enchantment laid over enchantment, sphinx here, mist there, a boggart sweating in a dead end, but through the whole official fabric, faint as a hair in a loaf, ran one thread that did not belong. It was all black, it was beautiful work. And it ran, patient as a fuse, from the maze's mouth to its heart. The same hand that fed my name to the goblet, he thought. The route the trembling finger traced. The whole year braided down to one thread, and it ends at the cup. He could have turned around. That was the strange cold freedom of the evening, the thing he'd hold on to afterwards. The house had taught him enough to see the trap hole, and he stood in the green dusk for a moment with the choice actually in his hands. Walked back out of the maze's mouth. Refused the delivery, live. And the thread would be relayed next season, next year, at a train platform or a Quidditch match or a Sunday table in Crawley, by the same patient hand, pointing at the same 2 words, blood of the enemy. Some traps you do not evade, some traps you walk into on your own feet with the ledger loaded and make them spring on schedule on ground you've read, because the alternative is living the rest of your life inside someone else's aiming. If that blood is ever taken, Hermione's voice said in his chest, steady as a hearth, it's the most expensive blood in the history of these islands. He went inward, he went fast. He found Crumb first, wandarm rigid, eyes fogged, standing over a downed and smoking Fleur with the cruciatus half formed on his lips, and the wrongness of the boy's weave was legible at 20 feet. A leash of that same old black work jerked tight around a mind that would never have cast that curse sober. Harry didn't duel him. He put his palm to the turf and fed the ground under Crumb's feet one sentence of hearth law, all who stand here are known, and the maze's grass, which had been Hogwarts's grass for 1,000 years before it was a maze, knew Victor Crumb, and knew the leash was not Victor Crumb, and declined the leash. The imperious broke like a rotten rope. Crumb sat down hard, retching apologies in 3 languages. Harry sent up red sparks over Fleur, squeezed Crumb's shoulder as he passed, and ran on, following the black thread, while somewhere behind him rescuers crashed toward the sparks. Cedric he met at the last turning, both of them skidding into the same corridor as the hedges groaned and began to close, and the cup stood ahead on its plinth in a clearing full of grey light, glowing its ordinary friendly gold, and the old black thread ran up the plinth and into it like a wick into a candle. Together, Cedric gasped, loping beside him, generous to the marrow of his bones, meaning it, no ghosts between us after. Both of us. Hogwarts wins either way, take it together. There was no time to explain a year. There was time for exactly one arrangement, and Harry made it at a dead run, left hand out catching Cedric's sleeve and threw the sleeve into the fabric in the arm and the man, the whole force of the house's grammar in the wild first form, one sentence, sealed with everything the handshake on the castle steps had meant. You stood at my fire. Whatever ground we land on, you stand under my keeping. It's a portkey, he said aloud. It's a trap. It was always a trap. Don't let go of me and do exactly what I say. Cedric Diggory had a quarter of a second to decide what he believed in. He was Cedric Diggory. He tightened his grip on Harry's arm, and together, on a 3 count, because taking it was the only way out through the trap's own throat, they touched the cup. The world went hook, color, and howl, and then a graveyard. It assembled around them out of dark and yew trees. Leaning stones, a church spire black against the last light, a hillside village's windows very far away and no use to anyone, and Harry knew 3 things before their feet had properly landed. That the ground was old, kept ground, church ground, dense with 1,000 years of proper grief and proper burial, Hearthlaw's oldest cousin sleeping under the turf. That the old black thread ended here, in a smoking cauldron the size of a cattle trough, tended by a short balding figure whose weave he'd seen before in a rat in another life, and that the bundle in the figure's arms, swaddled like an infant and wrong like nothing on earth, was what a soul looked like when it had spent 13 years refusing its own door. Kill the spare, said the bundle. The wand was already rising in Wormtail's silver-toed grip, green light gathering, and Harry did the thing he had crossed the maze rehearsing. He shouted DOWN and slapped his palm against the nearest headstone and called the churchyard up. It came. Ground that has received the dead with honor for a millennium does not love the killing curse. It holds the largest possible opinion on the subject of stolen life, and it had been waiting a very long time for anyone to address it in the old grammar. The turf between Cedric and the wand shrugged upward into a rampart of root and bone-dry earth, and 800 years of yew root woven denser than shield charms, and the green bolt hit consecrated dirt and discharged into it like lightning into a mountain. Cedric, the circle, stay in it. The keeping Harry had tied through the boy's sleeve flared visible for a heartbeat, a ring of black-silver ward light around the Hufflepuff's crouched body, 60 feet of borrowed hearth roaring up around a stranger's son, because the heir of the House of Black had said under my keeping, and the ground had heard him say it. Whatever you see, whatever you hear, it cannot cross to you, do not step out. Then ropes of conjured cord took Harry from behind, wand kicked from his hand and hauled him against cold marble, and the night's real business began. He was bound to the headstone of Tom Riddle while the Rat Man worked, and he made himself watch all of it, because Hermione's voice in his chest said watch, testify, every detail is evidence and every second is intelligence, and because the house's colder voice underneath said, witness the signing, bone of the father unknowingly given. The grave under the headstone tore itself open with a sound like a gasp and yielded a fistful of dust to the cauldron. Flesh of the servant willingly given. Harry shut his eyes for that. There are things a 15th summer is allowed to decline. The scream told him everything anyway. Blood of the enemy. Wormtail came at him with the dagger, whimpering, cradling his stump, and Harry looked past him at the cauldron's poison glow and spoke clearly in English, because the words were not for Wormtail. They were for the record. They were for the ground and the yews and the 1,000 years of proper dead, and the ledger that he could feel attending, distant and total, the way it had attended on a tower. My name is Harry James Potter, heir of the noble and most ancient House of Black. This blood is taken from me by force for the unmaking of death's law. I do not give it. The dagger bit his arm above the elbow, and he finished it through the pain, every syllable in order, nailing the account open. Let it be written. Somewhere under the world, something the size of winter turned a page. Wormtail carried the blood to the cauldron on a trembling blade and dripped it in, and the potion turned a white that hurt to look at, and out of the drowning light rose the shape the whole year had been pregnant with. Tall, thin as a whip, white as grave grubs, red-eyed, new-made, steam coming off him like a foal, Lord Voldemort born again into a body built from a dead man's dust, a coward's hand and stolen blood. He stood admiring his own fingers in the cauldron light, flexing them, and it was there, in the first minute of his second life, before the robe, before the wand, before the summoning of his circle, that Lord Voldemort frowned for the first time at the back of his new right hand. Where the blood had gone in, a mark was rising through the fresh white skin. It was not the dark mark. It was fine and silver and precise, 3 ravens about a single star, pressed into flesh like a notary's stamp into wax, and it did not hurt him, which disturbed the newborn Dark Lord more than pain would have, because he probed it with magic and with will and with the parcel-tongue words of unbinding, and it did not acknowledge him at all. It was not, whatever else it was, addressed to him. It was addressed to whoever holds the account. What, said Lord Voldemort softly to the graveyard at large, is this? Bound to the headstone, bleeding, 14 years old, the heir of the House of Black looked at the receipt stamped into his enemy's brand-new hand, and laughed. He couldn't help it, and he didn't try, and of everything that happened in Little Hangleton that night, the survivors of the inner circle would whisper longest about that that the boy on the marble laughed once, short and cold, an auditor's laugh, and said, in a voice none of them recognized from any newspaper's idea of him, "You signed." The Death Eaters came to the summons like moths with apologies, and Voldemort walked his circle in the cauldron light, naming names, pressing thumbs into old gilt, magnificent and theatrical and word perfect, and Harry, bound to the marble, watched the performance with two sets of eyes at once. The boy's eyes saw the nightmare, masks, bows, the high cold voice rehearsing its own resurrection. And the heir's eyes, trained all year at a kitchen table by the brightest witch of her age, read the weave, and the weave told a different story. A new-built body threaded through with borrowed arrangements, a soul so torn and retorn that its pattern hung together like a flag after grape shot, and there in the right hand, anchored deeper than the flesh, deeper than the magic, in the place where the ledger writes, a debt older than this evening with tonight's entry glowing freshly upon it, compounding. He owes this house a reckoning the size of his whole arrangement, Vega Black had said, and this house has never once failed to collect. You are wondering, Voldemort said, arriving before him at last, red eyes level with his, why you are alive, Harry Potter. You are alive because your death must be public in its meaning and mine in its authorship. They tell stories about you, tonight the stories end. You will be given your wand and a bow and a duel, and then 13 years of myth will lie in the grass while my friends carry the news. The white face leaned close, curious at the utter absence of what it fed on. You are not afraid. Why are you not afraid? You wouldn't understand the grammar, Harry said. The duel, such as it was, lasted 90 seconds, and no one who saw it ever agreed afterward on what they had seen. The Death Eaters saw their lord's killing curse meet the boy's disarming charm, gold light erupt between the wands, a dome of woven song, shapes walking out of Voldemort's wand tip. An old man, a woman named Bertha, and then two figures the inner circle had reasons to remember, a man with untidy hair, a woman with green eyes, and their lord's arms shaking as though the wand were trying to leave him. Harry, inside the gold, heard his mother's voice. Not the echo's whisper, though the echo whispered too, hold on, sweetheart, hold the connection, when it breaks, run. Under it, through it, rising up the silver line that ran from his chest away south to a girl, standing rigid on a Quidditch stand scaffold with her sight torn wide, and her hand crushing Ron Weasley's, another voice entirely, arriving along the bond in words no distance could blunt. The wands are cousins, the connection won't hold, Harry, listen. The graveyard's kept ground, and your blood is in HIM now. Blood of the house taken by force, that gives you claim of passage, the shadow of your own blood. It's the family's oldest road, Regulus's margin, Chapter 9, Walk IT, the gold dome burst. The echoes charged down the wandlight at Voldemort like grief-given teeth, and Harry moved, not toward the cup, which was 40 feet of open crucifier away, but toward the one shadow in the churchyard no one was guarding because no one alive but two children and one portrait knew it was a road. The shadow of Lord Voldemort himself, thrown long and black across the consecrated grass by his own cauldron's light, with Harry's stolen blood beating through every inch of it. Blood of mine stands in that body, he told the ground, the U's, the ledger, and the wild first grammar at a dead run. The body is his, the blood is the house's. I claim passage through what is ours. The world's oldest bookkeeping considered the claim for the length of one stride and found it good, and the shadow opened, cold, the between. One heartbeat of the original dark, the line of silver, the far-lit windows of everywhere he had rite, and there among them, blazing, unmissable, two new rooms. The warded circle 60 feet wide with Cedric crouched at its center, and the triwizard cup on its plinth of kept ground, both his, because a keeper had claimed one and a champion had half won the other, and the house's law ran to the exact edge of everything that was theirs. He stepped out of the shadow of a gravestone inside Cedric's circle, took double fistfuls of the boy's robes, said, "Now we go home," and shadow stepped both of them, one more heartbeat of Starcold with a Hufflepuff's yell trailing through it, into arm's reach of the cup, and grabbed it. The last thing little Hangleton's churchyard held of them was the sound of two boys taken by a portkey, and a Dark Lord's scream of rage cracking across his own resurrection party, and then the U's and the proper dead and the open grave of Tom Riddle Sr. settled back into their 1,000-year patience, keeping, as such ground keeps everything, the receipt. They came down on the grass at the maze's mouth in a tangle of limbs and trophy, into torchlight and band noise and 3,000 people's roar arriving a half-second before the roar died in 3,000 throats, because the boys were bloodied, and one of them was up on his feet in the same movement as the landing, standing over the other, wand out, turning a slow circle against all comers, and the first words out of him carried to the top rows in a voice that closed the band down instrument by instrument. He's back, Voldemort's back. He's in Little Hangleton churchyard with 30 Death Eaters, and he has a body again. Cedric's alive, we're both alive, and I want Amelia Bones, the minister, and my godfather's solicitor in that order, and nobody. The wand tracked across the running officials like a compass needle, and found, unerringly, one lurching figure with a hip flask. Nobody drinks anything. Afterwards, the night broke into pieces that fit together only in the retelling. There was the piece where Fudge arrived shrilling about tall tales and glory hunting, and met, instead of a hysterical boy, the heir of a charter house flanked by a daughter who had already, in the 11 minutes since the portkey landed, dispatched 3 ravens. One to Amelia Bones's home address, one to the solicitors, one to a profit board member who owed the house a retraction's worth of goodwill. There was the piece where Cedric Diggory, wrapped in a blanket with his parents' arms around him, gave the assembled staff an account so clear, so unhysterical, so Hufflepuff in its plain fatal honesty, that Fudge's tale of a disturbed boy died before midnight of 2 credible witnesses. And there was the piece with the flask. They took the impostor in his own office, before the man could hear which way the night had broken. Dumbledore, McGonagall, and Snape on the outside of the door, at Harry's word, and the door itself at Hermione's, because she had spent 7 months reading the room through the Raven's eyes and knew where every trap and trick sat woven. The stunners took him mid-swig. The polyjuice ran out on the office floor in slow, horrible ripples, Moody's scarred bulk melting down into a slighter, younger man with straw-colored hair and a face that made Snape's go the color of old candle wax, and the 7-locked trunk yielded up from its bottommost pit, the true Alastor Moody, one-legged, starved, alive, and incandescent, whose first words on being levitated out were a professional's furious respect. 7 months. 7 months the whelp kept my rotation, my flask discipline, my limp. Who marked him? Somebody in this room read him. I want to know what school of eyes does that. Nobody answered him because the sight was family business, and Dumbledore, who knew it, met Hermione's glance across the office and inclined his head a fraction. Your wall, I'm learning the masonry. Under Veritaserum, before Amelia Bones herself, with a ministry scribe and the memory of Barty Crouch Sr.'s fate laid out in cold order, Bartemius Crouch Jr. told everything. The rescue from Azkaban, the year under the Imperius, the Quidditch World Cup, the escape, the Master's plan built patient as coral around a tournament and a cup and a boy's obligatory blood, and the confession minuted, sealed, and witnessed by the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement meant one thing above all the rest. The ministry now held in writing testimony that Voldemort lived, an hour before the minister had settled on his story that the boy was lying. It won't be enough, Hermione said at 3 a.m. in the hospital wing on the edge of Harry's bed with her list of the night's filings between them, and she said it without despair as a measurement. She'd repaired his arm herself while Madame Pomfrey handled Cedric Dittany and Murtlap and a preserving jar into which, at her instruction, the bloodied sleeve had gone entire, evidence, sealed, witnessed. Fudge has 11 months until re-election and a donor list full of the same surnames Cedric heard answering the roll in that graveyard. He'll bury the confession in review. Paper can be buried, it's what the modern ministry is for. She looked up from the list, and in her eyes, exhausted, singed, blazing, he watched the next move arrive whole. So we don't fight him on paper. The house has something older than paper. Vega mentioned it, the grammar indexes it, Sharprock confirmed it exists this evening by return Raven. Her finger tapped the list's final line, beside which she had drawn in her precise hand a small 5-pointed star. Nobody else invoked it before the full Wisengamot since 1709. The speaking stone, the right of the witnessed word. What does it do? It makes truth load-bearing. She permitted herself at 3 a.m. at the end of the longest day of both their lives, one entire grin, fierce as her 11-year-old self and twice as dangerous. You're going to stand on your family's oldest rock in front of every lord, lady, and time-server in Britain and say what you saw. And while you stand on it, Harry, no one in that chamber, not the minister, not the prophet, not the whole massed weight of wishful thinking in the room, will be able to pretend they don't know it's true. The stone doesn't compel belief, it removes the comfort of doubt. Let Fudge bury that. Amos Diggory came to the hospital wing at dawn, and what he did there ran through the school by lunchtime and through the wizarding world by the weekend. He stood at the foot of Harry's bed, a ministry man of the middling sort, self-important on his best days, and none of that had survived the night because his son had come back to him out of a graveyard alive, and Amos Diggory had spent the hours since hearing exactly why in his boy's plain telling. The sleeve caught at a dead run, you stand under my keeping, the ring of black-silver light that green death itself had broken against. They tell me, he said, and stopped and started again, husband to a wife who kept bees and father to one child. They tell me the old houses used to have a word for it, when a family owes another family a life. His hands worked at the brim of his hat. We're nobody, the Diggorys, Hufflepuff stock, 4 generations of the Portkey office. But you'll find, Mr. Potter, Miss Granger, that nobody stock remembers debts longer than anybody. It's the one thing we've always been allowed to own, and I am telling you in front of witnesses, whatever the House of Black ever needs of mine, it needs only ask. He put his hat on crooked and said the last of it in the doorway with his back half turned, because some things can only be said sideways. He's my only one. There's no sighs of thank you. I know you were on that stone bound and bleeding for your own reasons, lad. Cedric's alive because in the middle of all that, your first thought was somebody else's boy. The other visit came at midnight on wooden leg and staff, discharging itself from St. Mungo's against loud medical advice, and pulled up a chair between their beds uninvited, and sat down with the mad blue eye whirring, and looked at the pair of them for a long minute like a drill sergeant inspecting a rumor. 7 months in my own trunk, said the real Alistair Moody. Fed once a day by a Death Eater wearing my face, and the only thing kept me sane was working the problem, who'd catch him. Not Albus. Albus sees plots the way I do, everywhere, which is the same as nowhere. I got as far as nobody catches him, and then I'm hauled out of my own luggage by the two of you and a story about weaves. The eye stopped whirring and fixed on Hermione, and the scarred slab of his face did something it had visibly not done in some years. Approved. Girl, whatever school of eyes you keep, don't tell me about it, don't tell anyone about it, and never put it on a ministry form. But when you leave that school of yours, if you want work catching what nobody catches, you come and find old Mad-Eye. The eye swiveled to Harry. And you, the lake, the dragon, the churchyard, constant vigilance, they'll tell you I say. You're the first student in 50 years came by it honest. He stood, planted the staff, and delivered his benediction from the door with the delicacy of a thrown axe. The pair of you are the most dangerous thing in this castle, and this castle contains me. Sleep well. I like him, said Hermione into the dark after some while. You like him because he called your site a school of eyes and told you never to register it. I like him, she said with dignity, for a range of reasons. The Grangers arrived the next day, because Hogwarts had firecalled the parents of every hostage and champion, and Hermione's parents were not the kind who received a call like that and finished the working week. McGonagall walked them up from the gates herself, and the Granger composure lasted until the hospital wing doors, where Mrs. Granger crossed the ward at a speed that would have embarrassed her at the practice and gathered her daughter in, case notes and all, and over Hermione's protests that she hadn't even been in the graveyard, Mum honestly said, You were in the lake in February and the paper in March and the graveyard's best friend in June. Sit still. And Hermione sat still. It was Mr. Granger who crossed to Harry's bed. He stood over it for a moment, looking at the bandaged arm, the preserving jar on the side table with its terrible sleeve, the boy who had come with a bird and a letter to their clinic 2 years before and turned all their lives into this, and Harry braced with a tiredness deeper than the potions for the arithmetic any sane father would do. She is 14, and this is the second time in 5 months, and it will never stop, and the exits are that way. Meredith and I had a long talk in the car, Mr. Granger said, all the way up. 11 hours we did the thing properly. Whether to pull her out, it's the conversation you have, so we had it. He drew the visitor's chair over and sat, unhurried, a man delivering findings. And somewhere around Carlisle we worked out that we were asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether her world is dangerous, it's whether she faces it accompanied. And every single time it's come for her or for you, there you both are already standing together before any adult in any world has got their boots on. He looked at the bandaged arm and then at Harry over the top of glasses exactly the way his daughter did it. You bled rather than let it touch anyone else's child, I hear. So no, we're not pulling her out. We're having you both to Sunday dinner every week the war allows. We are feeding you until you stop looking like that. And I am telling you what I told her mother at a service station outside Penrith. The house got there before us, that's all. We're just ratifying. He stood, patted Harry's shoulder with a dentist's precise gentleness twice, and went to inspect his daughter's ward charts, leaving Harry to stare at the ceiling with his eyes stinging, richer by one more thing no vault had ever held. Far to the south, in a manor house lent by a family that was already regretting the honor, Lord Voldemort sat with his new right hand open in the candlelight, and probed for the 40th hour the mark that would not answer. He had tried pain. The mark declined to convey it. He had tried Parseltongue and the deep alterations and a borrowed wand when his own behaved strangely near the thing. He had, in the small hours, tried cutting it out, and the knife had passed through the silver lines as through the reflection of lines in water, leaving the flesh unmarked and the mark unmoved. It was not a curse. Curses argued. It was not a brand. Brands proclaimed ownership, and this claimed nothing, demanded nothing, did nothing at all but keep, with the serene fixity of an entry in a book he could not find, let alone burn. He was Lord Voldemort. He had gone further than any wizard living into the architecture of death, and further than any wizard ever into the arithmetic of survival, and he knew old magic when it sat in his own hand refusing to know him back, and what moved in him as he studied it was a thing he had not felt since an orphanage, since a cave, since a wardrobe told him what he was. The sensation of standing before a power that had already finished judging him, and had not troubled to announce the verdict. Lucius Malfoy's report from the Wisengamot did not improve the evening. The stone, the charter, the names, his own among them, dropped one by one into witness silence, the goblins standing courteous and immovable behind their ancient contract, the black seat filled, the black vaults woken, the black wards, his informants confirmed, now 7 skins deep over a house no map would hold still. And threaded through every account, twinned in every witness's telling, the boy and the mudblood girl written, if the genealogical hysterics in the prophet were to be believed, on one line of a ledger older than the ministry. My lord, Lucius finished, gray around the mouth, there is a word the old families are using, for what has come back. They do not say the Potter boy, they say the house. A pause, the length of a man deciding whether information or flattery was likelier to keep him alive. My wife was born a black, my lord. Her grandmother's generation spoke of magics the family retired, rights of debt. She says, my lord, that her grandmother used one phrase of the old tongue as a curse, the worst in her vocabulary, and it translates, the ledger has your name. Silence in the borrowed hall, the candles laned. And Lord Voldemort looked down at his own right hand, at 3 silver ravens about a silver star, patient as winter in his new-made flesh, and made the first strategic decision of his second war, and it was, though no one in the hall dared name it, a flinch dressed as a plan. Then we will not wait for the house to remember us, he said. Bella, my faithful, come here. Tell me everything a daughter of the Blacks was taught about what sleeps under that family, and then tell me how we take it. The Wisengamot convened in emergency session on the last day of June, and the House of Black came up from the ministry atrium in strength. The heir and the daughter in formal black, Sirius Black beside them in the robes of a lord attending under charter right, his exoneration papers, rushed through a suddenly cooperative department of magical law enforcement by Amelia Bones in 72 hours of cold fury, folded in his breast pocket like a rose. The chamber had not seen a black take the family seat since 1979. The chamber, it was generally agreed afterwards, had forgotten what it was like. The speaking stone arrived by goblin escort under the charter, in a case of black iron that took 4 of Gringotts, largest to carry, and 1 word of Sharprocks to open. The stone itself was, until unwrapped, disappointing to look at. A rough dark boulder the size of an anvil, unworked, uninscribed, quarried, the keeper announced to the chamber with relish, from beneath the family's first house before wizards in these islands had a parliament to lie to, and the moment its wrappings came off, every enchanted quill in the chamber stopped writing. Every whisper died into the walls, and the vast round room full of the most practiced talkers in Britain discovered what a silence with weight in it felt like. The rite is simple, Sharprock told them, enjoying every syllable. It predates cross-examination, veritaserum, and if the chamber will forgive the observation, most of the chamber's procedures for agreeing on convenient versions of events. One stands upon the stone and speaks. While the speaker speaks, the stone weighs the words against the speaker's own knowing. If he speaks what he knows to be false, the stone rejects him. The last man rejected in 1709 was thrown the width of the old chamber and through a door that was closed at the time. If he speaks what he knows to be true, the stone bears him up, and every soul within its hearing knows in their marrow, past all comfortable argument, that the word is witnessed. The stone does not make truth, it makes truth heavy. He stepped back and gestured, courteous as a headsman. The heir of the House of Black petitions to be heard upon it. The charter guarantees the right. The chamber's opinion has been noted in advance and filed under the relevant heading. Fudge was on his feet with objections, lime-green bowler mangled in both hands, minors, irregularity, ancient magics unsanctioned in a modern proceeding. Amelia Bones's monocle turned on him like the mouth of a small cannon. The chair notes the minister's concern for procedure, she said, and reminds the minister that the last time this chamber heard testimony it disliked, 3 days ago, the minister's response was to propose that no one had given it. The stone is admitted, Mr. Potter. Harry stepped up onto his family's first rock, in the well of the hostile heart of wizarding Britain, 14 years old, and the stone took his weight the way the lake had taken his first step off the platform, like something that had been expecting him. He spoke for 11 minutes. No oratory Hermione had coached him, and he needed no reminding. He had been practicing plain truth on a stone-hearted world since a cupboard in Surrey. The maze, the thread. The cup, the graveyard, the cauldron, dust and hand and dagger. His own voice reciting the taking of his blood, and let it be written. The thing that rose, the naming of the Death Eaters in the circle, name after name after name, each one dropping into the witness silence like a coin into a well. Lucius Malfoy, Macnair, Avery, Knott, Crabbe, Goyle, the duel, the escape. Through all of it the stone under his feet held steady as a kept hearth, and its weight went out through the chamber row by row, and the room's faces did what faces do when the comfort of doubt is removed at the root. Some wept, some grayed, and some, in the high seats where certain surnames had sat for centuries, went very carefully to stone themselves, calculating like drowning men what could still be salvaged, whom they'd been seen with, and how fast an estate can be moved. He stepped down into a chamber with no argument left in it, only aftermath. Fudge Grey-Green in his seat with his bowler mangled past repair, done, though the obituary of his career would take months to typeset. Bones already issuing orders, the press benches writing as though their quills were on fire. And Albus Dumbledore from the Chief Warlock's high seat, watching the boy return to the girl who had built the day. the two dark heads bending together over her list, and feeling, by his own later account given only once to a portrait, the precise sensation of a man who has spent 13 years holding a fortress alone and has just watched the relief column arrive flying a banner he'd been taught his whole life to fear. Sirius's exoneration was gazetted on the 2nd of July, and he did the thing he had been promising the kitchen fire for a year. He walked out of the front door of number 12 at noon, in July sunlight, down the steps, across the square, bareheaded at a stroll, the two of them one on each side and Creature watching from the doorstep with the air of a valet releasing a restored heirloom into traffic. He bought a newspaper with his own face on it and overtipped grandly, and stood a while at the gardens, railing in the sun with his eyes shut, doing nothing, which for a man who had done 12 years of nothing in the cold was a different act entirely when you chose it. Below the fold of that newspaper, smaller than the headline, sat the item Hermione read twice: 3 members of the Wisengamot's Old Guard petitioning urgently for a commission of inquiry into the revival of unregulated ancestral magics, 2 of the names being names Cedric had spoken in the hospital wing. "That's the other half of the war," she said, folding the paper with unnecessary precision. "Voldemort wants you dead, but that lot wants the house back in its box, and they'll still be filing motions whoever wins." Sirius read the petition, laughed like a drain, and said, "Grandfather kept a drawer marked motions. I'll have Creature find it." The Order of the Phoenix reconvened that same week, and Dumbledore came to Grimmauld Place to ask for it, which everyone understood was the actual negotiation. He came to the kitchen this time, invited, past wards that read him thoroughly and admitted him on the house's terms, and he sat at the scrubbed table with tea in front of him and the black-silver fire at his back, and he asked plainly, the old crowd regathering, a war to run in the shadows a second time, and no headquarters in Britain safer than the Fidelius and far older skins of this house. He asked as a man asks who's already counted the answer's cost. "No," said Sirius Lord Black in his own kitchen without heat. "No," Harry agreed. And Hermione laid out the counteroffer, the 3 of them, for with Creature's croaked amendments from the stove, had built across 2 evenings, not headquarters, alliance. The house would fight openly under its own name, a thing the Order had never once had, a charter house in declared opposition, with its vaults, its solicitors, its ravens, its seat in the Wisengamot, and its arts. The Order could have liaison, intelligence shared both ways at a warded table twice weekly, sanctuary under hearthrite for any member burned or hunted, no questions, no conditions. What it could not have was the house itself, not its roof for headquarters. Dumbledore would inevitably come to command, not its heir for a soldier, not its daughter for an asset, not one line of its old law submitted for the Order's oversight. Allies, Hermione finished, not assets. The wall stands where it stood in March. Both sides build doors in it. Nobody builds a gate. Dumbledore looked around the warm kitchen, at the elf glaring proprietorially from the stove, at the escaped convict exonerated and lordly with his boots on the table's stretcher. At the 2 children, no, he corrected himself visibly in real time, at the 2 young keepers who had in a single year unsealed a will, outlawyered a libel, tamed a dragon by courtesy, requisitioned a lake, unmasked his own defense appointment where the great Mad Eye's oldest friends had failed. Walked into a resurrection and out again with both boys breathing, and toppled a minister's cover-up with a rock, and he began quietly at the head of somebody else's table to laugh. An old man's laughter, rusty at the start, at himself above all, at 13 years of curious entries resolving into an account he could finally read. "Allies," he agreed, and raised the teacup to the room's 2 youngest diplomats. "You know, I spent a year fearing what the old magic wanted with you both. I find myself unable to improve on its judgment." "To the wall," said Sirius, raising his own cup entirely straight-faced, "and to the doors in it. The house spent that summer arming, and arming for a house whose deepest law was keeping, looked like nothing the arriving war expected. The wards of Grimmauld deepened ring by ring until the Fidelius was the least of 7 skins, and Bill Weasley, invited once to inspect the outermost as a professional courtesy, came out after an hour asking, slightly hoarse, who the contractor had been, and being told, "The kitchen fire." The Fenn's house was woken, aired, and warded, the Welsh box, 2 properties in Ireland the Ministry's registries had never heard of, and at each hearth in turn, Harry knelt with his palm to the stone and keyed the old law to the new age. All who come in good faith are safe at this fire, and the ravens went out from the rookery by the 100, quartering Britain, carrying to every old ally, every cadet line, every debtor and creditor in the ledger's long columns, the same message under the same seal, 3 ravens about a silver star. The House of Black is risen. It remembers its purpose. It remembers its debts. Its doors are open, and its doors are kept. And on the last night of that summer, before the train, before 5th year, before everything that was coming, 2 14-year-olds, nearly 15, one born to the blood and one written and unasked, sat on the roof of number 12 with their backs against a warm chimney, watching ravens cross the moon, not talking much, in the manner of people who no longer needed to, while below them, floor by floor, the old dark house stood awake and lit around its door of gray twilight. Garrison at last to two keepers who knew exactly what they kept. "Fifth year," Hermione said at last to the London sky. "Owls, there's a war on. There is always," she said with immense dignity, "time for revision," and the chimney at their backs chuckled once, warm as a hearth, and if either of them noticed the way their shoulders had settled together, neither of them remarked on it, and the remark they didn't make went where everything that mattered now went, onto one line in silver, load-bearing. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Towger's The war that followed was 3 years long, and it was not the war anyone had planned because one of the armies refused to fight it as a war. Voldemort built his campaign the way he had built everything: terror as architecture, spectacle as mortar, dark marks over market towns, the disappearances, the werewolf packs, the giants coming down out of the mountains like weather. He expected, because his whole life had taught him to expect it, that the other side would do what other sides did: gather, march, meet him at last on some final field where power could be measured against power, and his was greater. The House of Black kept. That was the whole of its strategy, and it took the Ministry 2 years and the Death Eaters nearly 3 to understand that it was a strategy, and by then it had already won the part of the war that decides wars. While the Order fought its shadow skirmishes and the Aurors bled to hold the visible world, the House went through Britain quietly lighting fires. A hearth in a safe house in Leeds, keyed by the heir's own hand. All who come in good faith are safe at this fire. A hearth in a cellar in Cork, over a chandlery in Aberdeen. In the back room of a Muggle laundrette in Bethnal Green, whose owner never understood why her premises felt, to certain hunted passers-by, like coming in from snow. Muggle-born families moved along the Raven roads from fire to fire and slept, whole, inside 60 feet of the oldest law in the islands, while the wands hunting them circled outside like wasps at a window. By the second winter there were 40 hearths. By the third there were 100, and the Death Eaters had learned, at documented cost, what happened to those who came to kept fire in bad faith. Nothing, which was the terror of it, nothing at all, except that they were known, utterly name and deed in standing arrangement, and the knowing went into the ledger, and the ledger did not forget, and every man of them now slept badly, feeling in the dark the particular sensation of a finger moving down a column toward his name. "He cannot fight it," Snape reported at the warded table, in the flat voice he saved for the things that most unsettled his other master. "There is no army to break, no headquarters to burn. He rages at maps. Every safe house he takes is empty. Every fire he douses relights, and his own followers have begun to flinch from silver. He calls it cowardice, this war of yours." A pause, the drop of dry poison he permitted himself weakly. "He has started wearing gloves." Alliance held and the wall held, and the doors in the wall saw more traffic than either builder had guessed. Dumbledore brought the prophecy to the kitchen table himself, in the first autumn unasked, laid the memory of Sybil Trelawney's rasping words before the whole council. Neither can live while the other survives, and sat back to let them weigh it, and it was creature of all the table who rendered the house's verdict, croaking from the stove with the assurance of a sexton citing scripture. Prophecies is weather. The ledger is law, the debt does not care which of them is fated, the debt will be paid by the debtor. Dumbledore considered the elf for a long moment, and then inclined his head as one does to a colleague, and crossed prophecy, visibly, off the list of things he was carrying alone. It was the Horcruxes that taught the two sides of the wall to trust each other, because neither could take them without the other. Dumbledore brought the knowledge, the diary destroyed in a 12-year-old's hand, the theory built across decades, Slughorn's shame extracted at last, whole and horrifying, 6 anchors, perhaps 7. The house brought the finding, and the house's finding was not detective work, it was grievance. Every torn-off deadbolt of Tom Riddle's soul was an offense against the door, a lock stolen from Death's own keeping, and the arch in the Undercroft could smell them, Hermione said, the way a lighthouse keeper smells wrong weather. The sight, trained now, adult in its discipline, could follow that scent down a map like a hound, a ring in a ruined shack under a hinge of ancient curses, a cup in the deepest vault of a family whose Voltoth's Gringotts, presented with charter evidence that the cup was stolen, death was ancestrally delighted to void, a diadem in a castle full of lost things, the snake coiled at the debtor's own heel. And the locket, first found, already 10 years in custody at the threshold, its whisper long since starved silent in the kept cold. They were not destroyed. That was the house's one absolute term, delivered by Vega Black herself to Albus Dumbledore, who came down to the Undercroft once by invitation, and stood before the ranked remembrance in the arch of grey twilight with his hat in his hands like a first year. Fiend fur and basilisk fangs unmake the vessel and scatter the fragment, and a scattered fragment is litter, and the door does not permit litter. Each anchor was carried instead, under escorts of raven and goblin iron, to the threshold, and laid in the coin slot dark at the door's foot, and held 5 stolen locks in Death's own keeping, waiting, the way evidence waits. It was also Vega who stopped Dumbledore's hand over the ring. He had known the stone in it for what it was the moment the sight's report reached him. They saw it happen, across the kitchen table, the century of longing come up in him like water rising in a lock, his sister's name moving behind his eyes. He had volunteered too quickly to courier that one anchor personally, and Harry had looked at Hermione, and Hermione had looked at the fire, and the fire had apparently filed a report, because when the old man came down to the undercroft with the ring in its warded casket, Vega Black was waiting for him at the foot of the stair. What she said to him, none of the living heard in full. They heard the shape of it standing back among the standing stones, that the stone in the ring was not a door but a keyhole with the door long walled up, that what it raised was neither the dead nor a lie, but grief given a chair and told to sit, which is crueler than either. That the dead of his account, and she named them Ariana, Kendra, the friend across the sea gone crooked, were through the door and properly kept, and none of them, not one, held anything against him that the door's ledger had not already weighed lighter than he weighed it himself, and that a keeper's family did not permit guests to open wounds on its threshold, however beautifully the wound sang. Albus Dumbledore came up from the undercroft an hour later with his beard wet and his spine straighter than any of them had ever seen it, and handed the casket to Creature of all doorkeepers to carry the last 10 steps, and said nothing about it then or ever except once, years later, to Harry 4 words apropos of a garden: "Your cellar saved my life." The ministry did not fall. It sagged, it bled, it disgraced itself in committee. Fudge's successor was better and exhausted and better again. But it did not fall, because the fall Voldemort had scripted required terror to run ahead of him unopposed, softening, isolating, and terror kept arriving in towns where the house's fires were already lit and finding the population inconveniently unafraid. Hogwarts stayed open and stayed Dumbledore's. The Prophet, its board thoroughly seated with the house's goodwill, and its newsroom with the house's raven-fed scoops, printed the war instead of the ministry's weather reports about it. And the two of them grew up inside all of it, which was the part no strategy had planned for. Owls sat in a castle with watch ravens on every sill. A 17th birthday marked at 100 hearths at once, every fire in the network flaring black and silver for 1 minute at midnight, unasked, to Creature's weeping satisfaction. Newts, because there is always time for revision. Ron beside them throughout, keeper by then of the whole Raven Road logistics, having discovered in himself, to nobody's surprise but his own, his father's genius for the unglamorous machinery that keeps other people alive. And between the heir and the daughter on the tapestry and off it, the woven line doing the only thing it had ever done, which was hold, while its two ends turned 15 and 16 and 17 and stopped being children by the usual method, which is bearing things together that are too heavy to bear alone. Of the 100 hearths, history keeps the numbers. The two of them kept the nights, and one night can stand for the war. It was the 2nd February, a Friday, the laundrette in Bethnal Green. They took turns at the network's fires through every school holiday over Sirius's protests and with his secret fierce approval, because a Hearthlaw ward burned brighter for a season after its keeper sat at it in person, and because, Hermione said, a sanctuary run entirely by Raven was a bank, and they were not running banks. So a back room smelling of soap and cheap coal, rain on the high window, Harry with his palm resting on the hearthstone renewing the old sentence thread by thread, Hermione at the table with the network ledgers, and at 10 past midnight the raven on the gutter outside knocked twice, and the fire stood up silver at the roots, and the door opened on a family of 5 who had been running since Tuesday. The Creevies. Colin, 16, now gaunt, holding the ward token a raven had dropped on their windowsill in Surrey 3 nights before. Dennis with a sprained wrist and his fists still balled. The parents, a milkman and a milkman's wife, 4 days into learning that the world their sons had gone away to loved letters and hated their blood. And a grandmother in a dressing gown who had refused to be left, holding a biscuit tin with the family photographs in it, because you save what's yours. What Harry remembered afterwards was not the wards taking them in, though the wards took them the way the old law always took the hunted, instantly, the room going warm to the exact temperature of safe. It was the hour after. It was Hermione with the mother at the table, tea and the ledgers pushed aside, writing the family into the house's keeping in her own hand and explaining, in the calm voice of a girl whose parents drilled teeth in Crawley, that Muggle didn't mean helpless here, that the network ran on postmen and landladies and one bus conductor in Leeds, that there was work in the sanctuary line for a man who knew every doorstep on a morning round. And watching the milkman's spine come back vertebra by vertebra as he stopped being cargo and started being garrison. It was Colin who had once photographed everything Harry did with a devotion that made him wince, sitting silent at the fire a long while and then saying, not to Harry exactly, to the flames, "You know what's mad? At school they said you'd gone dark. Old family, old magic, secret cellar." The Prophet had diagrams. He looked around the soap-smelling back room of a laundrette at the edge of everything, at his brother asleep in a nest of clean towels, at his grandmother's biscuit tin standing on the mantel under formal guard of one raven who had appointed itself. This is the dark, is it? Warmest dark I've ever been in. It's the oldest complaint about the family, Hermione said from the table, not looking up from her entries. Everything the House of Black does, it does in the dark. We've stopped arguing with it. We just changed what the dark is for. Toward 3, the ward spoke once, low, a bell under the floor, a knot of hunters, quartering the wandlet, checking premises against a list. The Creevy's name was on such lists now. The milkman's wife came awake all at once with her arms full of Dennis. The grandmother's hand closed on the biscuit tin, and Harry, sitting on the hearthstone with his back to a fire that had been waiting all night to be asked, said, "It's all right, watch if you want." It helps to see at once. They watched. There was nothing to see, and that was the thing to see. Bootsteps in the street outside, slowing. A wand light swinging across the steamed shopfront glass and finding a laundrette, shut, ordinary, exactly as interesting as a closed laundrette is. A pause, the particular pause of men whose instruments have just declined to notice anything, all of whom were known in that instant to the marrow, name and deed, weighed by something patient that lived in a hearth 60 feet away, and every one of whom, though none of them could have said why, discovered they preferred the far side of the road. The bootsteps faded toward the high street. Somewhere above, wings crossed the rain. "That's it," Dennis whispered, scandalized. They just leave, Harry said. "There's no fight because there's no target. That's the whole art, Dennis. Every ward that has to flare is a ward that got the arrangement wrong." He said it lightly, and the fire at his back moved silver, and the grandmother, who had not spoken since the door, looked at him for a while over her tin and delivered the network's finest review. "Better than a merchief's salute, better than headlines. You'd have got on with my reg," she said. "Air Raid Warden, Bethnal Green, the whole blitz. Never once let the light show. Same trade as you, love, same trade exactly." In the morning they moved the family up the Raven Road to the Fenn's house, to schooling for Dennis and ward-line work for Colin, and in time, a sanctuary round of his own for the milkman, and the war rolled on, and the knight joined the 100 Knights, but Hermione kept the page. Years later, drafting the familial magics bill that would end the 1622 ban, sat before a Wisengamot committee that wanted definitions. She would take out a leaf of old letter paper and read them her own entry from that Friday, the Creevy's names in a 17-year-old's handwriting, and beneath it the note she'd added at dawn while the family slept and Harry banked the fire, which said in full, "This is what the old magic is for. It was never power. It was never blood. It is the largest possible answer to the smallest possible question, who may come to the fire, and the house's answer, the answer that made them write us on one line, is everyone who comes in good faith forever, and we will sit up nights to keep it so. That is the whole statute I want," she told the committee, putting the page away. "The rest is drafting. They gave it to her in the end, clause for clause, but that came after, that came in the piece. There was a war to finish first, and it finished the way the dead had always said it would, with the debtor at the door adding to the column with his own hand. Bellatrix came in the 3rd winter, and she came by right of blood, which was the terrible cleverness of it, and the reason it nearly worked. Every skin of Grimald's warding, old and new, was built on the same root law: the house knows its own. Bellatrix Lestrange had been born Bellatrix Black. Her name stood on the tapestry, restored by the house's own mending, mine to judge. Her blood answered the ward's first question with the one password that had never needed inventing. She had spent 2 years, she and her lord together, studying what a daughter's blood rite could open. And on the last night of January, while the heir and the daughter sat their mid-year examinations in Scotland and Lord Black dined at the warded table of the order, Bellatrix Lestrange walked up the front steps of number 12, Grimald Place, laid her hand upon the door, and said, in the old tongue her grandmother had beaten into her as a cursed vocabulary, "I am a daughter of this house, and it is mine. And I require it to open." The door opened. She crossed the threshold with her wand low and her lord's orders bright in her. The cellar, the old door, the sleeping power, the deed that would lay the house's whole arsenal at the dark lord's feet. She made it 11 steps. The accounts differ on small things, creatures account, the portraits. The house's own is read from its weave afterward by the only 2 people who could, but they agree on the essentials, and the essentials are these. The lamps did not go out. They turned, every flame in the hall swung to face her, and the house was suddenly nothing but attention, floor and wall and stair. The total regard she had banked on being recognized by, and it did recognize her, that was the point, that was the trap her cleverness had built for itself. The ward's first question was, "Who are you?" and her blood had answered it truly. And the house's second question, the one the old law had never once waived in 1,000 years, was not about blood at all. "In what faith do you come to this fire?" She stood 11 steps into the hall of her grandmother's with her answer written in every line of her standing arrangement, plain to a weave reading as a confession nailed to her chest. Come to steal the keeping, come to hand the door of death to a burglar of doors, come with her own lines oldest treason in her mouth, and the House of Black, which had resilvered her name on its tapestry precisely so that this judgment would be its to make, made it. There was no battle. That was what broke her, the survivors of her mind agreed, the healers at St. Mungo's secure ward and the aurors who took her unresisting from the front steps where the house had set her down, gently like an emptied cup, outside its threshold in the snow. No duel, no cursifier, nothing her genius for violence could bite on. There was only the hall going long, the door behind her further away with every backward glance and the cellar stair never any nearer, and the lamp's silver light rising around her like a tide of exact memory, and out of the light in the voice her grandmother had used for the family's worst word, the house itself, reading to a daughter alone in that shining hall the full text of her own entry, every deed, every name. The Longbottoms screaming under her wand while she laughed, the cousins hunted, the McKinnon girl, the children over the years who had been in the wrong houses when she came calling, each one written in the unhurried silver hand, each one read aloud in the old tongue with dates, and at the end of the reading the house's sentence, which was not death. The house did not deal in death, it dealt in keeping, and so it kept. It recalled its magic from her. The old vigor that ran in every Black, the family inheritance below the name, below the vaults, the thing that had made her the most feared witch of her age. The house called the Lone Dew, and out of her it went, like tide out of a rock pool, like silver ink running back off a page, and Bellatrix Lestrange, née Black, sat down on the floor of her grandmother's hall, a woman of ordinary power, with a wand that no longer answered her temper and a war name that was now only a name, and began terribly to weep for her lord, who would have no use for her at all. On the tapestry her name did not burn. Burning was her mother's crudity, temper editing memory. Her silver went dark, tarnished in one instant from thread bright to lead, mine to judge, judged, and beneath it the house stitched, in small formal letters of the old tongue, the completed entry, paid in the coin she valued. Voldemort learned of it within the day, and the lesson he took was the lesson of his whole life, the only lesson he had ever been able to hear, that the power under that house was real, was vast, was judging, and therefore must be taken before it judged him, taken at the root, taken whole, and that every month he waited the 2 young keepers of it grew less young. His seers told him what his own hand told him, the silver mark he now kept gloved even alone, the account was moving towards settlement. His response had the geometry of everything he built, strike the ledger before the audit, take the door, unmake the debt by unmaking the house that held it, he gathered everything. That was how they knew it was the end, when it came. The watch-ravens over Britain went up all at once on the last night of April like a black dawn, and every report ran the same way, the packs moving south, the giants, the dementors pouring off Azkaban like smoke off a fire, the whole gathered weight of the Second War converging, not on Hogwarts, not on the Ministry, on a square in Islington that no Muggle map had ever held quite steady, where a tall dark house stood behind 7 skins of warding with a door of grey twilight in its cellar. "He's bringing all of it," Ron reported from the Raven tables, steady, grey-faced, 18 years old and running the logistics of Apocalypse. Every mark, every creature. Albus is moving the order to the square's edges, the Ministry's Aurors are actually coming, Bones is leading them herself, and Hogwarts, he laughed unsteadily at his own dispatch, Hogwarts is sending the suits of armor. McGonagall animated the lot and marched them into the flue. "Mate, there's a castle's worth of armor coming out of your kitchen fireplace. Let them hold the square," Harry said. "None of it crosses the threshold, that part was never going to be theirs." He said it in the kitchen, in the house's warm heart, with the black-silver fire standing at his back like a third combatant, and around the scrub table sat the whole strange family the ledger had assembled. Sirius, lord of the house, 40 and restored, war-grim and steady, creature in a tea-towel laundered for the occasion, the Grangers who had refused evacuation with a dentist's firmness and were organizing the field hospital in the drawing-room, Sunday dinner having scaled over 4 years to this. Ron at his message boards, and opposite Harry, across the table they'd shared since they were 13, Hermione. They were 18 and 17. They had sat their last examination 3 weeks before because there is always time for revision, and they had known for 3 years, since a vast cold room and a woman made of silver light, how this night would have to run, the debtor at the door adding to the column with his own hand. "He'll breach the skins," Hermione said to the table in the anchor's voice, laying the night out one last time so that everyone's fear would have rails. "Let him. 6 skins are wards, and wards can be broken by that much power. The 7th isn't a ward. The 7th is the house, and the house will let him through because the house and the dead and the door and the 2 of us are all in agreement, and have been for 3 years, that this debt gets settled at the hearth in the old law in person." She looked across the table, and the woven line between them lay quiet and bright as it had lain since a tower in June, 4 years of load borne and holding, and she finished the plan with the only sentence it had ever really consisted of. "Together, together," Harry said. Upstairs, through the parlor window, the first skin of the wards lit the whole sky over Islington silver and began, magnificently, to fall. The Battle of Grimmauld Square was fought by everyone except the 2 people it was about, and history, which loves a paradox, has never quite forgiven them for it. Outside, in the streets and gardens, the war's whole gathered violence met the war's whole gathered defiance. Orders and order and armor out of a kitchen fireplace, Bones's voice cracking orders down the terraces, Dumbledore dueling in the square's center like a storm that had taken a side, Sirius and the werewolf packs, Ron's raven stitching the defense together message by message through smoke. 6 skins of warding came down over 4 hours, each fall a silver dawn over London, each buying the defenders' lines another regrouping, and the accounts of that night fill books, and none of the books can agree on numbers, and all of them agree on the ending. At the greyest hour before dawn, Lord Voldemort walked out of the wreck of his own vanguard alone, because the 7th skin would admit no one else, and found the front door of number 12 standing open. Lit, warm, and open. He came up the steps with his wand loose in his gloved right hand, and crossed the threshold of the House of Black, and the house let him, every lamp in the hall turning to face him. All who enter are known, and what the knowing found in him it had known for 20 years. The burglar of doors, the debtor entire, 7 entries under one name. The hall did not lengthen for him as it had for Bellatrix. It led him courteously lamp by lamp, the whole procession of the house bowing him inward and downward like ushers at a state occasion. Past the drawing-room where a tapestry's 1,000 years of silver stood witness, down the kitchen stairs, past a hearth burning black and silver and utterly unafraid, to the arch and the stair, and the quarried night below, where the last of the old families kept the thing his entire existence was a crime against. They were waiting for him at the door of grey twilight, the two of them, side by side in the vast cold room, ringed by the standing stones and the risen ranks of the silver dead. The heir of blood and the daughter of deed, wands sheathed, hands at their sides, the woven line between them burning now plain to any eye, and behind them the arch poured its patient cord into the dark, and at their feet, laid out on the black floor in a precise row like exhibits at trial, were 5 objects he knew better than his own face. Diary's ruin, a ring, a locket, a cup, a diadem. Lord Voldemort stopped on the last stair, and for the only recorded moment of his second life entirely was still. "You feel it," Hermione said, not taunting, clinical, the anchor's voice keeping even this to the rails. "You felt it since the graveyard, under the wards, under the wars, a finger moving down a column." "The snake died an hour ago," Harry said. "Neville Longbottom, the sword of Gryffindor in the square in front of everyone." "Your last deadbolt but one," he nodded at the row on the floor. "These we kept for you. The door doesn't permit litter." "Kept." The high voice came down the stair ahead of its owner, silk over the first hairline crack the world had ever heard in it. "Kept. You child of accidents. Do you imagine I came to be judged? I came for the door. I am the only wizard in 1,000 years with the vision to use it, and when I hold it, death is not a debt, death is a servant, and ledgers burn." The wand came up, and the whole gathered will of the greatest dark wizard of the age gathered at its tip, and he did the thing that he had come to do, the thing the house and the dead and the door and 2 young keepers had known for 3 years he must, being who he was, inevitably do. He stepped off the last stair, crossed death's own threshold uninvited, and reached out his gloved right hand to seize the keeping of the door. The glove burned away first, not in fire, in audit. And the mark beneath, 3 silver ravens about a silver star, patient in his stolen flesh for 4 years, opened like an eye. What happened then, the official histories call the fall, and the survivors upstairs experienced as a silence so total that the battle stopped of itself. Wands lowering all over the square, and what actually happened in the last room of the House of Black, before the door of grey twilight, was smaller and larger than any history has dared print. The account was called. The ledger did not strike him. Ledgers do not strike. It simply at long last, with the whole authority of the oldest law in the islands and the freely given consent of the 2 living hands that held it, balanced. The blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, recalled, and with it everything built upon it, the body of dust and hand and theft unraveling not into wounds but into arithmetic, borrowed flesh returning to its lenders, dust to a father's grave, blood to the house. The stolen locks, reclaimed, 5 vessels on the black floor opening all together like shells in warm water, and the fragments within, those starved, shrieking, tattered remainders of a man who had chosen, at every single fork of a long life, the locked door over the open one, drawn gently, inexorably out of their hiding and toward the arch and through, litter at last swept. And the remainder, the 7th share, the wraith-thin resident of the collapsing body, the actual and original Tom, was held one moment at the threshold, upright before the grey fall of twilight, while the cord out of the arch resolved, for the only time in the house's 1,000 years, into something like a voice, and the voice was not wrathful, which was the most dreadful thing about it, and it said what it had said at the bottom of everything since the first Black built the first house over the first raw door. And would say forever, everything is kept, even you, come in. He went through, not hurled, received. The door of the dead took Tom Riddle the way rivers take rain, and the arch's cord settled back into its long patience, and where the greatest terror of the age had stood there was nothing at all except a black floor, 5 empty vessels, and drifting down through the lamplight, settling on the stones with no more weight than a signature, 1 glove. In the ring of standing stones, the silver dead bowed their heads once, garrisoned to keepers, and went back into the floor. And Harry and Hermione stood alone in the vast, quiet, hand-finding hand, 2 people who had just watched the war of their lifetimes end as an entry in a book, and found that the only thing either of them could think to say, they said together in the house's oldest formula, which had been true the whole time: the house remembers its debts. Upstairs, dawn was arriving over a saved city, and somebody who sounded like Ron was crying and laughing on the front steps, and a black-silver fire in a warm kitchen banked itself, at last, down to embers. Dumbledore came to the garden on the last morning of July, 3 months after, by invitation, for a birthday. The garden of number 12 had spent a century as a bramble ruin and one summer becoming what the house had always meant it to be, because Creature had views about gardens and the Grangers had a greenhouse habit, and under the pear tree a long table stood laid for the afternoon's party. Weasleys expected by the dozen, Diggories, Longbottoms, half the order, Moody who would check the punch for poison and be right about the twins twice. For now it was quiet, bees and morning, and the old man and the young one walked the path together while, at the table, Hermione and Sirius argued amiably over seating charts in the way of people who have decided that today nothing shall be heavy. 18, Dumbledore said, and the war 3 months buried, and the Wisengamot eating out of Miss Granger's hand on the familial magic's bill, and the prophet calling you what was Tuesday's effort, the keeper of the peace. He chuckled honestly. How you must loathe it, the lake knew its neighbor, Harry said obscurely and let it go. They walked. At the path's turn where the pear shade ended he stopped because it was time and the two of them had one account left open and both of them knew it. You never asked us afterwards what it was like down there at the end, everyone else asked. I have spent 2 years being taught by a seller the difference between what I need to know and what I merely long to, said Albus Dumbledore. He looked older in the garden light and easier. The Mendied sit differently than the Never Broken. But since it is your birthday and since you are offering, I will confess the one question I still keep. The blue eyes came around and there was no twinkle in them, only the thing that had been under the twinkle all along, wearing it like a coat all those years. An old man who had loved carefully all his life because carelessly had cost him everything, asking to be told the sum. I planned you, Harry. I do not flatter myself it was worse than that, and I know now it was not better. The doorstep, the seal, the silence, the careful waits on every scale of your childhood. And out of all my planning came a boy I had made lonely enough to be manageable. And then a girl I never planned sat next to you on a train, and a house I feared wrote the two of you on one line, and everything that saved us, saved her, saved you, saved, if we are honest, me, came from precisely the things I did not arrange. So. The question I keep, he stopped on the path and asked it plainly, the last accounting of Albus Dumbledore, if I had never sealed that will, if you had grown up loved at Sirius's table with nothing to be rescued from, do you believe the two of you would still have, and being after everything careful, he gestured not at Harry but back down the garden at the table under the pear tree at her. Harry followed the gesture. Hermione had won the seating argument, was laughing at Sirius's rearguard action, ink on her hand even here, even today, some list somewhere always half-made, and she felt the look, the way she had felt it since a tower, and glanced up and gave him across a whole garden the fraction of a nod. All's well, get on with your walk, the seating chart is safe. You're asking if you get credit, Harry said, for the cupboard. I am asking if I get pardon. No, Harry said without heat, and watched the old man take it the way he'd taken the will on his desk, full price, eyes open. Not pardon, but you get the entry read fairly, which is what this house does instead, so here it is. You built me lonely, and lonely nearly broke me, and none of what saved me was yours. But you asked us once in the snow to bring you the house's askings for a second pair of eyes, and when we finally brought you everything, you did the one thing almost no one in your position in the history of the world has ever done. He put out his hand, 18 years old, keeper of the door his parents, murder had died refusing to walk through, to the man who had planned his childhood and spent 3 years earning the right to be at its birthday parties. You changed. The ledger weighs deeds, sir, not designs. On deeds since June of my 4th year, you're in credit. Albus Dumbledore shook the offered hand with great care, and if his eyes were wet, the garden's official account, kept by the bees, records only that the two of them stood a while in the sun. The party ran long, as the best ones do. It was evening before the last Weasley was extracted from the pudding table, night before the garden emptied, and nearly midnight when Harry found her, because the house, matchmaking to the last, had quietly locked the library, disappeared every armchair but 2, and lit precisely 1 lamp, at the drawing-room's end in front of the tapestry, where 1,000 years of silver names climbed away into shadow, and one horizontal line burned brighter than all of it together. She was looking up at their names. 18 and 18, as of 11 that morning, the house which had waited 4 years with the patience of a thing that thinks in centuries had waited for even that. The lines changed, Hermione said as he came to stand beside her. Her voice was doing something it almost never did, running a half-step behind her eyes. Look, this morning it was the woven cord, 2 strands, now there's a 3rd thread through it, finer, new. It's not attached to anything yet, it's just offered. I checked the grammar an hour ago. The lamplight found her and she turned from the wall to face him, and the last of the scholar's cover slid off the sentence, leaving it bare. It's the betrothal stitch, Harry. Nobody wove it. The tapestry's not telling us anything, it's asking. It's the house asking at last in its own tongue, and it will wait for the answer forever. The grammar's absolutely clear about that. It's the one stitch the house never adds itself because some things can't be inherited, Harry said. They have to be given. 4 years, a tower, a train, a lake, a ledger. ink-stained fingers on a rope above a hippogriff's wings, every Sunday table and every hospital bed and every dawn watch of a long war, 10,000 pieces of divided toast and not one of them ever needing to be asked for. He had faced a dark lord at the door of death with steadier hands than he had now, and it was correct, he thought. From somewhere far away it was proportionate, because that had only been the war and this was the treaty, the whole of it, the house's true succession, and it did not run through blood after all, or through deed, or through anything the ministry had a form for. It ran through this one question at the foot of a wall of names between the black and the bright: Hermione. Her name had always been the whole speech. He was his father's son and his godfather's boy, and eloquence was not the family art, keeping was. He took her hands, both of them ink and all, palm to palm, the way a rite had joined them on a tower when the world and they were young. Not for the house, for me. Took you 4 years, said Hermione Granger, daughter of the house by deed, brightest witch of her age, on the eve of everything, with her eyes shining and her hands closing hard around his. I'm told I'm the second thickest bloke in Gryffindor. You've been first for years, she said. It was a formal ranking. I re-ranked you, and she was laughing as he kissed her, or he was laughing as she kissed him. The accounts differ. The way the accounts of that family always differed on small things and agreed on the essentials, and on the wall above them, unhurried in silver before the 2 oldest lamps in the house and the whole assembled memory of 1,000 years, the House of Black drew the 3rd thread home, and wrote, beneath the 2 names it had bound on one line long before it asked them to be one thing. The word it had been keeping, unmixed, undivided, single-hearted since the beginning, Towgers. Always the door kept and the fire lit, and the 2 of them together on their own terms at the hearth of the house that wanted them both. Always. Chapter 7 End.